Hello. Welcome to the Fanfic Majesty. If you want more content, you can follow me on Patreon. I will be uploading more content on there that will be exclusive. The link is in the description. Please support me.
3 Centiliters. Chapter 14. The small band of pirates were gathered around each other on the deck of the Going Merry. But what really grabbed everyone's attention was the fact that another man, at least they thought it was a man, was there with them. Dripping wet and gasping for breath, he was a very tall, male ballerina with heavy makeup, and a pair of swan heads on the back of his pink coat. The crew had literally picked the man up during their attempts at fishing while using Karu as bait. The man, whose name was Bon Clay, gasping out, "I thought I was going to die there for a minute." He looked up to the Straw Hats and said, gratitude in his voice, "Hey. You saved me, thanks. I never imagined that my life would be saved by a group of complete strangers. Thanks again." He bowed his head several times. "I'll never forget your kindness, but could I trouble you for a cup of warm soup? Chicken noodle will do." Unfortunately for the man, Luffy, Usopp, Chopper, and Karoo had eaten all the food that Sanji had carefully laid out for them all to last until they reached Alabasta. "No way." The Straw Hats all screamed at Bon Clay. "We can't even feed ourselves," Zoro yelled, all of them looking dangerous at the reminder that they were starving. Bon Clay flirted with Vivi and began to show off his abilities to them. They learned here that Bon Clay had the powers of the clone fruit, which allowed him to become a flawless copy of someone he touched with his right hand, in both face and body. His antics immediately amused them, and Luffy, Usopp, and Chopper fell head over heels for his ability. To Nami's dismay, he once transformed into her and allowed them all to view her breasts. In retaliation, Nami punched out Bon Clay and clobbered the males of the ship for the free peep show. Bon Clay, however, recovered from that quickly as he began changing faces for Luffy, Usopp, and Chopper's amusement. Soon they were dancing and looking ready for another good party when Bon Clay's ship showed up and he had to leave. But as he did, his crew called him by his Baroque Works codename Mr. 2, surprising all of the Straw Hats. Even Vivi did not know who he was, despite being told about what he looked like. But what really upset Vivi was the fact that one of the faces that they saw turned out to be her father, the King of Alabasta. "That's not good," Zoro said with concern in his tone. "If he can mimic the face of a king that easily, Mr. 2 has the potential to cause a lot of trouble." "Looks like we let a really bad guy get away today, huh?" Usopp asked, and Chopper looked surprised as he asked if he really was a bad guy. "Seems so," Nami said anxiously. "Walking around and having him on the other side is not a good thing. If Mr. 2 realizes that we're the ones that Baroque Works is after, then he can use the memories from earlier to transform into any one of us. We won't even be able to trust our own friends." She then got annoyed at Luffy, who didn't seem to know what the problem was. Zoro stepped in. "No, hold on a sec." He clapped a hand on Luffy's shoulder as a wicked smirk appeared on his face. "Luffy's slow, but he's also right not to be scared. Just hear me out on this one, and I think you'll agree. It's actually a good thing that we ran into Mr. 2 when we did, because now we can prepare and then beat him at his own game." Soon, everyone was tying bandages around their arms. Zoro finished wrapping his own arm up and said, "Just make sure you tie it tight. I don't want anyone fooled by the enemy's disguises." "What a good plan," Vivi said, as she finished tying one on Nami's arm. "We'll always know who our friends are," Nami said firmly. "Just look for the bandage on their arm." "This clone fruit guy," Sanji said, the bandage in his mouth as he finished tying his own on. "Does he really look that similar when he turns into someone else?" "You have no idea. It's the same, not just similar," Usopp said. "It was crazy. Really, you should have seen it, Sanji. He changed into every one of us, even Nami, and we got to dance with him." But Sanji said that he wasn't the least bit interested in dancing with a male ballerina. "We know that someone with his powers is somewhere among the enemy," Zoro said, holding up his arm, "so we need to be really careful to be on our guard at all times." Chopper came forward and asked Usopp. "So," he said in a determined voice, "what should I do to help against this guy?" "Just do whatever it is you can do," Usopp said firmly. "You're not expected to do anything more, Chopper, and if you get overwhelmed, then just run." "Sounds like the pep talk he always gives himself," Sanji said, and Usopp shot Sanji furious looks. "Whatever it is I can do," Chopper said softly to himself before he looked up. "I got it," he declared, and they then heard Luffy from the front of a ship call that he could see the island. Looking up, the Straw Hats glanced up to see an island covered in sand and brick houses that could only be a town in the distance. Zoro unwrapped the bandage on his arm so that they could see the black X put underneath, so that if there was even the slightest suspicion that something was wrong, they were to take off the bandage and show them the mark. If they couldn't do that, then that would prove that they were an imposter. Sanji stated that it wasn't like Zoro to come up with something like this and stated that he must be an imposter. But when Zoro yelled that he was going to kill him, it cleared up any suspicions that Luffy and Usopp had. Luffy stood up and making a speech for them all as he held out his arm to see the bandage. "Okay, no matter what happens on that island, remember, this thing on all our arms." Just then, everyone moved in to hold out their arms as well, even Vivi and Karoo, and they formed a circle as Luffy finished yelling out, "As a sign of our friendship, now, let's land, okay?" Soon, the Straw Hats found themselves in a desert town. They could see the heat waves coming out of the ground and see the burning sun above them. On either side of them were booths filled with vendors, all trying to get people to come in close to buy something from them. Most of them were now dressed in assortment of clothes that covered them up and were clearly made for crossing the desert. Only Luffy remained in his usual clothes, and the women were dressed in outfits consisted of a blue and purple halter top with a pink shroud and a long white skirt with the top part blue and showed a lot of skin, largely thanks to Sanji's excellent taste. However, what was really attention-grabbing was that they were all running, and it soon became clear why. Smoker was there with a whole crowd of Marines right behind him. Smoker threw out a fist of smoke towards them. A wall of fire appeared out of nowhere and blocked the attack. From within the smoke, a figure appeared. He wore a bright orange hat, a dark purple tattoo on his back, messy black hair falling over a face full of freckles and a wide grin. "You again," Smoker sneered at the man. The stranger just smirked right back. "Just give it up," he called as the flames burned around his body, dispelling the smoke. "While you may have the power of smoke, mine is fire." A fight between the two of us would be pointless, it'd probably go on forever. The Straw Hats were all frozen where they stood, staring back at him. Even Zoro looked deeply unnerved by this as he'd met the stranger earlier looking for his captain. He proclaimed, "Alright, it looks like the mystery man has devil fruit powers." Usopp cried out if any of them knew who he was and why he was helping them. Luffy stepped forward, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He called out, "That you, Ace?" The now named Ace smirked even wider as he turned to look back at him. "You haven't changed a bit, Luffy." "It is you, really?" Luffy cried, his face still registering shock. "Wow, did you eat a devil fruit or something?" "Yeah, the flame fruit," he said, but he kept his eyes on the Marines as they started to organize themselves. "Anyway, now's probably not the time for chatting. You guys get out of here. I'll catch up, don't worry about these guys, I got 'em, go on." Smiling, a look of understanding came over his face. Luffy nodded at once as he turned and called for them all to follow him. "But, Luffy," Nami cried in surprise. "Who is that guy back there?" Sanji added. They ran on with each one of them asking who it was who just helped them, asking if they had knew him from somewhere. It was then that he finally came out and told them the truth. "Yeah, he's my big brother." "Brother," they all shrieked when suddenly they saw it. A tower of smoke and flames spinning rapidly like a tornado in the distance was rising up from behind the buildings, and that got everyone's attention. They all stopped running to look at it in wonder. The people around them were all staring at it as well, and muttered worriedly to what was going on. They all talked about the power that Ace had before Nami turned back to Luffy and asked if he really was his older brother. "Yep," he said proudly, his eyes never once leaving the Tower of Flames. "His name's Ace." "Look, I'm not surprised to hear you have a brother, Luffy," Zoro said impatiently, "but what's he doing here on the Grand Line?" "Ace is a pirate just like I am. He left home 3 years before I did to search for the One Piece," he explained, smiling the whole time. They all stared at him, but the fireball was slowly growing bigger and Nami reminded them all that it was time that they just kept going. The fireball suddenly billowed out and almost like an explosion as went back to running. "Wow, I never thought I'd run into my big brother in a place like this," Luffy said happily. He was running backwards so that he could keep his eyes up on the action in the sky here. Chopper had to nod his head to that as he changed to his walk point so that he could have an easier time keeping up with them all. As they ran, Nami cried for them to turn left, which Luffy did, but since he was backwards, he ended up going his left instead of their left and went down a different street. Luffy eventually realized that he was lost and was looking around the alleyway that he was now in, clearly not understanding what happened here. He set down the barrel of water that he was carrying and sat up on it as he stared around. "What the? Oh, that's weird," Luffy muttered, folding his legs and arms. "I could have sworn they were right here. Now they're all gone. Where'd they go?" Suddenly a shadow appeared above him and that good-natured voice, with a hint of fondness in it, suddenly spoke. "Well, guess giving you a chance to escape was pointless?" He looked up and there Ace was. "Hey," Ace called from the rooftop. "Hiya, Ace," Luffy exclaimed happily, grinning widely as he jumped down to his little brother. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" he said brightly, looking at him up and down. "You could say that," Luffy said, his eyes lighting up brightly so that he looked even more childlike than usual as Ace laughed. Luffy jumped from the barrel and suddenly the two began to arm wrestle with each other. "How many years has it been?" Luffy asked as he began pushing hard on his brother's arm. I don't know," Ace answered honestly as he kept his arm steady, "but you haven't changed that much in that time. You're a little taller but you pretty much look the same." Luffy tried harder to push Ace's arm down. "So do you. Aside from those powers you got from eating a devil fruit, you haven't changed a bit." Just as he was starting to push the arm down, he went on. "Remember when you used to sneak into the fields, eat 100 watermelons, spit the seeds out like a Gatling gun and run away?" "No, that wasn't me," Ace said as he straightened his arm. "That was you. The farmers would chase you and you'd scream like a girl," Luffy went on. "That was you too," Ace countered. "They were now dead even in their arm wrestling match. I watched and laughed." Both brothers' faces were red in the face as they kept attempting to win, and it was a wonder who would give out first. In the end, it was the barrel. It broke apart underneath them and the water splashed out everywhere. "I guess we're still the same," Luffy concluded, both still holding on to each hands before they gave the other a high five. Just like old times, Luffy finished grinning. "Wait," Ace said suddenly as he reached into his bag and pulled out a canteen of water. "Wasn't your crew looking for you a few minutes ago?" "Yeah," Luffy said as he watched Ace drink before he asked him what he was doing here in Alabasta in the first place. Ace looked surprised at the question and said, "I take it you never received the message I left for you back on Drum Island?" Luffy asked him what he was talking about. Ace waved his hand dismissively. "Well, guess that's a no, don't worry, it's no big deal. It was to let you know that I would be in Alabasta for a few days. I'm in these waters on some business." "Business, huh?" Luffy asked curiously as Ace wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and tossed the canteen at him as he explained that he was now with the Whitebeard Pirates. "The Whitebeard Pirates?" Luffy repeated in surprise as he drank some of the water. Ace turned around to show Luffy the tattoo of the purple mark of the Whitebeard Pirates on his back. "See this tattoo? That's our mark, and it's my pride." Luffy continued to drink before Ace asked a question that they didn't see coming. "So Luffy, why don't you and your friends come join us? Come on, it'll be fun, what do you say?" "No thanks," Luffy answered bluntly, not even had to think about it. Ace was laughing. "I had a feeling you'd say that," he admitted. "That's too bad cause you see Whitebeard's the greatest pirate I've ever met. That's why I'm gonna help him become king of the pirates, and not you Luffy, sorry." Luffy didn't seem like he minded. He just smiled back and added as Ace just beamed at him, "That's fine, so I guess we'll just have to fight then, because I'm gonna be king of the pirates." Ace didn't seem at all disappointed that Luffy turned down the offer, however. He probably knew the answer even before he asked the question. He picked up his bag and soon the two were talking with each other as they headed down the alleyway, fighting over the water. "Wow, I never thought that I'd run into you here," Luffy said happily as Ace finally pulled his canteen away from him. "Well, I did promise you after you got your first bounty that I'd drop in and say hi, didn't I?" Ace asked as he put the flask away, but pulled out Luffy's wanted poster. "Just what kind of trouble did you get yourself in while I was gone?" "Oh, that," Luffy laughed as Ace put it away as well. "Well, it's kinda a funny story how it all happened. I'll just bet it is, Ace said in amusement. He then began telling him everything that had been going on since Ace had left home. Ace looked interested in it all as Luffy then went on to explain when he left home and the crazy things that he'd been getting into since he did. Ace laughed a few times before he finally said that they should hurry up and find his friends before the Marines did. He asked if he had any idea to where they were, and Luffy answered that they were probably back at their ship. Well, that's a start. Where's it docked at? Ace asked him as Luffy admitted he didn't know. Ace sighed, as if he had expected Luffy to know better than this. Oh geez, you know Luffy, pirate ship captains usually remember where they leave their ships. Luffy laughed and admitted that he was hungry and he forgot all about it. You haven't changed at all, Ace sighed, looking more disappointed than annoyed, but it soon passed as he went and asked, so, tell me about your crew. What are they like? Who are they? Luffy beamed at that. He then began to count down on his fingers, counting them all off. Well, first there's a tough guy who carries around 3 swords. Wants to be the greatest swordsman in the world. Then there's a navigator who likes maps and tangerines and money, Luffy went on. There's also a cook that makes really yummy food. There's a liar too, oh, and we just got a doctor who happens to be a reindeer, Luffy concluded proudly. Ace listened in without saying a word for a moment before he smirked. Really, you don't say, he said in amusement, sounds like you got a pretty motley crew there. Luffy also added, we also have a princess and her giant duck. Ace hummed. Everyone in my crew is so interesting, Luffy added animatedly. Sure sounds like it, Ace said with a smile, but I'd wager you're the most interesting one of all. But still, only a handful of people for a pirate crew, that's just like you, Ace commented, sounding like he was going to laugh. Luffy just looked ahead with excitement, I'm still looking for a musician though. Stop right there, fire fist, someone yelled and they all stopped to see that a group of people were stepping out from all over. From alleyways, both in front of and behind, as well as several standing on the roofs, smirking down at them like how a cat would when it cornered a particular juicy-looking mouse. You got no place to run, Ace, the biggest man of the group, who had a long and reddish nose, declared directly in front of them. Your head is mine, it's my ticket to a promotion, prepare to die. It's our lucky day boys, the red-nosed man said smugly, as if promised a real treat, this'll be easier than shooting fish in a barrel. Just then, someone recognized Luffy and pointed him out which got their attention, remarking about his bounty and they were practically drooling at that. But Luffy and Ace didn't seem to be the slightest bit intimidated as they walked right past them without batting an eye. Anyway, let's go find your ship, Ace said nonchalantly. We'll start at the shore, then maybe we can use that nose of yours to sniff them out. "'Kay," Luffy said without any problems. That ticked them all off and soon they were charging at them. The fight didn't last long at all. Though they were outnumbered, they were clearly having so much fun fighting together and showing off what they had learned in their time apart that it was like watching a show. It was to show how outclassed they were that neither brother had to use their devil fruit powers. When they finished enjoying themselves, and scared the remaining Baroque Works agents, they continued on their way as if nothing happened. After a long time searching, with Luffy finally able to find them by turning himself into a bloodhound, they were all back on the deck of the Mary once again, each one of them having fun. Luffy, Usopp, and Chopper were toasting everything they could think of and laughing their heads off before Luffy turned to Ace and asked, Ace, you sure you don't want to join us? I'll be fun, I promise. I can't right now, I'm chasing someone, he answered, though it was clear from his voice that he had no intention of joining anyway. He gulped down his drink. He's a pirate named Blackbeard. Blackbeard? Usopp repeated, his eyes wide in realization. I've heard of him, Vivi said suddenly, he's the one who attacked Drum Kingdom. Ace leaned comfortably on the barrel and informed them, you see, Blackbeard used to be part of the 2nd Division of the Whitebeard Pirates. He was one of my own men, but he committed the most unforgivable sin a pirate could. He killed one of his fellow crew members and then jumped ship. As commander of the 2nd Division, it's my responsibility to take care of him. So that's why you're after him, Usopp said in hushed tones. I came here cause I heard that Blackbeard was seen in Alabasta, Ace went on, in a place called Yuba, so that's where I'm heading. Hey, Nami said, looking to Vivi, that's our destination too, right? Vivi confirmed Yuba by pulling out a map and showing them. The town they had just left was called Nanohana, and they were now heading to a small city called Aramalu where they were going to dock the ship. After that they decided that they would travel up through the desert to a small oasis which was Yuba. She explained that was where the leader of the rebel army was and they were going to head there to try and talk to them about what was really going on and stop any more fighting. You don't say, Ace said interestedly, mind if I tag along? Nami, Vivi, I'll follow you anywhere, just tell me where to go, Sanji swooned. Hopefully it's right off a cliff, Zoro said. What did you say, Zoro? Sanji yelled and Nami snapped at them to shut up. She sighed before she turned back to Ace and added, well, it looks like you'll be with us a little while, Ace. Usopp laughed, we're all real happy to have you aboard. Luffy confirmed that by the thrilled look on his face, even if it was only briefly, he and his brother would be sailing together on the seas as pirates. As he laughed joyfully, holding his tankard out, this'll be fun, to Ace. And suddenly they all toasted. Cheers. Later, the small group of people was now trooping across the desert. Luffy, Ace, Nami, and Vivi were all wearing robes to cover themselves up as they waked on, staring ahead of them at what looked like old ruins. The city they had come to look to be crumbling away as they watched, as if it had been abandoned for the last few decades. Everything was half buried in sand and the remaining plant life were nothing more than dried husks. Vivi spoke, this is Aramalu. It was known far and wide as the City of Green. The group was silent for a moment before Luffy said, it was green? Vivi looked back to them. Take a good look around everyone, she said in despair. This is what Baroque Works has been doing to my country. Her eyes became miserable. The people of Alabasta, this is what they had to go through. It was indeed hard to believe that it had once been a flourishing city as they looked at the dried up trees and dead plants. This entire town looked like it had been left to die years ago. Wow, there's nothing here at all anymore, Luffy said quietly. No, Vivi agreed, it's nothing but a ghost town now, but up until a few short years ago it was a thriving town full of gardens and palm trees and lush greenery. This place, Zoro asked skeptically, kicking in a dead tree so that it crumbled. Rain was always scarce here, Vivi went on, but by saving every last drop of water and using it wisely, the city was able to make the foliage flourish. Unfortunately, that stopped when the rain died. There hasn't been a single drop of water in this country for the last 3 years now. But wait, Zoro said suddenly, and they looked back to him. Even without rain, there's still the river as another water source. And it's close, Usopp added, jerking his thumb back to where the river must have been. Why couldn't they have just piped the river in from over there? Well, the answer to that is just up ahead, Vivi answered darkly. As they walked on, Vivi explained that when the rain stopped, the capital, where the king's palace was, rained there for days and days without stopping, and it was apparently due to the work of dance powder. It was then they heard about how dance powder was created long ago by a country that had no rain. When burnt, it would emit a mist like vapor that would speed up the process of premature rain clouds and create rain on the spot. The original creators of this powder thus called it dance powder because it would make them dance with joy with all the rain that it created. But there was one downside to this. Despite the rain it brought, the powder unfortunately caused long periods of drought in other countries. The controversy that this powder brought eventually started a war. The lives lost in this war was so great that the world government prohibited the manufacturing and possession of dance powder worldwide. It was then that they found out that Baroque Works staged an accident in Alubarna 3 years ago where some delivery men brought a large shipment of dance powder. The cart that they were carrying broke apart and the dance powder was spilled out for everyone to see. The agents then lied that the king had ordered for the powder to be delivered to Alubarna, the city where it rained the most. A large scandal then arose around Cobra as suspicions that he had been stealing all of the country's rain. As a result, the people of Alabasta blamed the king for the drought. As towns dried up and people starved, a rebellion was stirred up. This was only proven when Vivi soon led them to what they thought was a dried-up road at first, but she explained that this had once been the canal. Somehow, it had been destroyed and the people had no choice but to abandon the city when they ran out of water. The wind suddenly blew and they could hear a loud wailing sound, like ghosts crying out from beyond the grave. As the wind continued to blow, the Straw Hats looking around expecting a fight, but Ace stated that it was nothing for them to be concerned about. But it sounds like a voice, right? Luffy asked him. Oh man, it's coming around from all sides, Usopp cried out in panic, this isn't good. There's no danger, Ace said firmly, it's just the wind blowing around town, echoing and bouncing off the empty buildings. But Vivi was now looking heartbroken. It's like the city of Aramalu is wailing over what's happened to it, she gasped out, sounding close to tears as her hood was blown off her head and her long hair was blowing around her face. The crying continued just as a mini sand tornado came flying right at them from the middle of the town. Hey, wait, Usopp yelled, pulling his goggles down as the sand hit them. What's that? What's what? Nami cried, but her voice died as she realized what he was talking about. Luffy, who was the one standing out front, his animal sharp eyes squinting through the sand, could see it as well. The sand and wind had collected together for a fraction of a second to make out the ghostly form of a human hand. What's that? Chopper yelled in panic. The wind came wiping past them all and Luffy spun around to see the shadowy form of what looked like a striped cape disappearing into the wind. After it passed they were starting to get their bearings straight, asking what was going on. But suddenly Luffy was running ahead, looking at what appeared to be someone lying in the sand up ahead. Someone's collapsed, Nami cried out behind them. You mean there's still people living in this city? Vivi cried in astonishment as she went running after Luffy as well, but they needn't have bothered, for when they got there, laying there was nothing more than a dried up skeleton. After the startling revelation, they were walking through the hot desert. Each one of them was moaning and groaning about the heat and the hot sun that was bearing down on them all. Vivi had sent Karoo on ahead to take a letter to her father, warning him about Crocodile's plan. After a while, Luffy got his once in a blue moon good ideas and turned himself into a camel. The downside to this was that Nami basically forced the shape-shifting boy to be the girl's ride through the desert. Zoro, meanwhile, was dragging Chopper behind him on a makeshift sled. Can't go on, Chopper said, his tongue rolling out of his mouth. Can't take hot weather. I'm fine in cold weather. Usopp, who was leaning on another walking stick, looked to Chopper and said with his own tongue out, it's because of all that fur, why don't you take off that stupid reindeer costume? This ticked Chopper off as he sat up at once and got big. What did you just say to me, big nose? He towered over Usopp. Don't make fun of reindeers. Monster, Usopp screamed back as Zoro kept trying to pull the sled. Zoro snapped at Chopper to shrink or he was going to quit pulling him. Chopper ignored Zoro as he and Usopp began fighting with each other so that he had to walk over and shove Chopper's head down so hard that he shrunk. As they all argued, they noticed Ace walking by them all with a very strange look on his face. He was looking at them all with a slight frown on his face and a very critical eye. They continued on, barely saying anything for a short time before Usopp asked what was with all these hills. He had expected the desert to be more flat, and Vivi confessed that this desert was very old, that some of these dunes could easily reach around 900 feet tall. As they all groaned out, Luffy was starting an annoying chant of, "Are we there yet?" And soon it was a fistfight with the others, the whole time Ace was watching them. Later that night they were standing around a fire with the sun having long since gone and the clear sky was full of stars. The Straw Hats, Vivi, and Ace were gathered around the fire, under the cover of some large boulders. I'm so hungry, Luffy groaned out as he reached for some of the food that was roasting over the fire. Don't be such a greedy pig, it's still raw, Sanji told him, but Luffy went straight for the meat which caused the cook to hit him furiously over the head yelling, don't eat that. Once he was done with him, he then turned back to the two women and said lovingly that their food would be done soon. The desert is truly a harsh environment, Nami sighed as they watched. It was funny to watch as they continued to argue like they would usually do on the ship. Whether it was over the food, the cold, or in Chopper's case it was admiring all the stars, they were talking and complaining about everything. Couldn't you see the stars on your home island? Usopp asked, shivering next to him as Chopper's eyes lit up in wonder as he stared up at the twinkling lights above him. The skies of the winter islands are almost always covered by heavy snow clouds, so I've never been able to see this many before, he answered happily. Usopp muttering that he was way too cold to enjoy the stars at the moment. Chopper reminded him that the cold didn't bother him as Usopp was cuddling him like a teddy bear. That's because you wear such a nice fur coat, he said, hugging him tightly. Chopper told him to back off, and soon it turned into a fight that mirrored one earlier. Chopper, Zoro snapped at him once he had grown and was towering over Usopp again. Don't turn big, we gotta huddle for warmth. Luffy suddenly turned into a desert jackrabbit before jumping over, and soon Chopper was small again and they were all cuddling up, packing on top of each other like puppies in a litter. The two fur-covered crew members providing heat to the less animalistic members. Ace, who was sitting right beside the flames, who watching the group suddenly start to fight and wrestle with each other, trying to get comfortable. I suppose you're surprised, aren't you? Said Vivi's voice, and they all looked up in time to see her walk over to him. He glanced up at her politely as she went on. I mean by Luffy, that is. I have to admit I was a little surprised too at first. Vivi looked up to the boys all still fighting before they all finally started to drift off. After all, he doesn't seem like much of a pirate captain, does he? I mean, normal pirate captains are respected or feared by their crews. Just this afternoon a simple drink of water led to that big fight. Well, I think that's just the way Luffy does things, Vivi finally finished. Took me a while to understand that. Ace only smiled, his eyes hidden by the rim of his hat as he confessed. He's been like that as long as I can remember. Vivi looked down at him in surprise as he went on, not sounding the least bit taken back by anything she said. He hasn't changed a bit since he was a kid, he went on, both of them watching Luffy. He seems like a fool, but people have always gathered around him. He may be my little brother, but he has this mysterious charm about him. I guess I wasn't telling you anything you didn't already know, Vivi said, relief in her tone as Ace chuckled slightly to himself. He and I do go way back, you know, he said, but he smiled a little wider and looked up at her. I appreciate it. He looked back to the sleeping pack of straw hats as he finished. You thought I was worried about him, didn't you? Yes, but I guess my concern was a little misguided, Vivi stated as she bent down near the fire and added a few more sticks to it before Ace went on. He won't always behave like this, he said, and they all looked to him as he leaned back comfortably. Give him time and he'll mature. Although, I highly doubt that he'll ever stop acting goofy like this. You really think that? Vivi asked curiously as he laughed a little. Of course, he's my kid brother, he answered with a shrug. This is who he is. Well, I'm glad that there's nothing to worry about, Vivi said, smiling at him. I wouldn't go that far, Ace corrected. You always have to keep an eye on him. Ever since we were kids he's been making me worry about him. That child mind of his has always been getting him into trouble. He's not very bright, but he's got a good heart, Ace went on. He'll fall for every trap you lay out in front of him, but he's just so innocent that you just can't be angry with him for long. On top of all that, he's looking for something a little more specific than most people. He is? Vivi asked in surprise. You mean he wants to be the pirate king? Nah, Ace stated as he reached into his coat to pull out his canteen of water and took a long sip from it. That is his dream, but he's looking for something else. What's that? Vivi said interestedly. This whole time he's talked about becoming the king of the pirates, but he's never. Oh, I doubt that even he's aware of it, Ace said, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand. But I know him well enough to know. He's looking for something greater than himself. Greater than himself? Vivi repeated in bafflement. That's right, Ace admitted, putting the canteen away. He's looking for something you don't see every day, something grand, something spectacular, something that he can barely comprehend. I think that's why he loves the idea of adventures so much. He wants to be the king of the pirates, but what he wants more than that is to live life to the very fullest. He smirked again as he leaned back against the rock as Vivi turned back to the fire with a very thoughtful expression on her face. Morning appeared and the straw hats were still in the middle of the desert, but now the sky was lit almost on fire to the setting sun behind them. The air was as hot as ever, but a cool breeze was gently giving feathery touches to the sun-kissed skin of the pirates, light falling like liquid amber and soaking them all with its rich color. The whole crowd was watching Ace as he finished packing his things into his bag and got up. Well then. You're not really gonna leave us, Ace? Chopper asked sadly, are you? As it turned out, a man named Scorpion lured him to Alabasta with rumors that he beat Blackbeard. He was a bounty hunter after Ace, but the crew ran into his two sons and helped them to talk some sense into their dad to go home. Yep, Ace confirmed, looking back at them all. Since it's been confirmed that Blackbeard isn't in Alabasta, I have no reason to stick around. You sure? Luffy asked, looking a little sad that they had to say goodbye again after such a short time. Any idea where you'll be headed to next? Sanji asked suddenly. I have a lead to Blackbeard's whereabouts. Scorpion heard about a man who saw him out west. Guess we'll see, Ace said as he reached into the coat and pulled out a carefully folded up piece of paper. Luffy, he called as he threw it at him and caught it. Hey, do yourself a favor and hang on to that, always. But why? It's just a scrap of paper, Luffy said as he unfolded it. That scrap of paper will reunite us someday, Ace said as Luffy opened the paper to show that there wasn't anything written on it. You don't want it? He teased when he saw Luffy's baffled face. No, I'll keep it, Luffy answered quickly. Ace smiled at them all. It's perfectly natural for a guy to worry about his bundling kid brother, right? He asked as he looked over the straw hats, as if he knew something that they didn't. He then bowed his head politely and said directly to all of them, he might be a bit much for all of you to handle, but take good care of him for me. Ace slowly raised his head, looking at each one of them in turn, as if making sure they understood what he wanted, but a look of relief seemed to come over his face as he looked back to his little brother. Luffy, when next we meet, we'll both be top pirates. Right, Luffy exclaimed happily. The top, you and me, Ace encouraged, beaming wider than ever. They all waved goodbye to him before they all headed on their way. After much walking, with Luffy once more playing pack mule, camel to the girls, they were suddenly standing in the middle of a town in the dead of night, at least, what was left of it. Vivi gasped at what she was seeing. The wind and sand blew around them, reminding them greatly of Eremalu. Zoro noticed it as well and pointed out to them, but Vivi seemed to be in shock as she stared around them. Sanji asked Vivi what happened here and her only answer was that it had all dried up, the place once being the oasis of Yuba. They suddenly heard the sounds of a shovel and when they went a little further, they spotted a very old, dried up man who was almost bone thin. He looked ready to drop from overwork at any second, but he kept on digging through the thick levels of sand without stopping. Without looking at any of them the man said, I'm assuming that you're travelers. You must be exhausted from all that time spent in that heat. Sorry, but this town is a bit dried up too. It doesn't have that much relief to offer. He looked at them to see his thin face, but still, you're free to rest here a while. Vivi covered her face so that he could see her as the old man went back to digging. He said that they didn't have too much water to spare, but there were plenty of inns that they were welcome to stay in. But when Vivi told them that they came here in hopes to find the rebel army, the old man's eyes turned hateful, throwing whatever he could find at them, telling them to just leave and that they couldn't find the rebels here anyway. The constant sandstorms dried up the town and the rebels soon ran out of supplies and moved on to another city called Katoria. Katoria. Vivi gasped in horror. Where's that? Luffy asked. Is Katoria close to here, Vivi? It's near Nanohana, back the way we came from, she told him as the old man stopped digging at the sound of Vivi's name. The old man croaked out Vivi's name. They all looked down at him slowly walking out of the ditch, his eyes never leaving Vivi. Wait, your name's Vivi? Luffy only made things worse by crying out, hold it, she's definitely not a princess, which caused Zoro to hit him over the head to shut up him. Princess Vivi, is that really you? The old man gasped, coming towards her, his hands on her shoulders as he stared at her. You're alive, I can't believe it, thank goodness. It's me, Vivi, the old man pleaded, don't you recognize me? I look different, I lost some weight I suppose. Vivi suddenly gasped. Toto, is it, really you? Tears appeared in Toto's eyes as he nodded. Toto was the father of a young man named Koza, who was the rebel leader and Vivi's friend. Toto told her that no matter what, he still had faith in her and the king. That he truly believed that he was a good man and that he would never betray his own people before he fell to his knees and cried. He explained that believed that this whole rebellion was ridiculous, that the rebels were all just a bunch of faithless fools. He had tried to stop them many times, and that most of the country still has faith in the king as well, but the rebels won't listen to anything. Their strength, men, and supplies have reached their limit and they were now attempting to finish it all with one last attack, and were prepared to die if that's what it took. Toto finally gasped out pleadingly, please Vivi, you have to stop these fools from tearing our country apart. After a few moments of silence, Vivi just held out a handkerchief and told him that it would be alright, that they would stop it no matter what. Tears fell once again from Toto's eyes, but tears of renewed hope this time. After the group had turned in for the night, Luffy and Toto were the only ones still outside, with Luffy watching him continue to dig. Hey old guy, there's still no water, Luffy said grumpily, my throat's drying up. How can you stand to live here? It's horrible. The water will come, Toto said without a shred of doubt. The Yuba oasis still has life in it yet. The dream of Yuba cannot be beaten by a bunch of lousy sand. The king left this land in my hands and I will keep it alive. I'll dig out the sand as many times it takes. Perhaps Luffy could feel that level of willpower because he declared that he would help, and so he turned into a dog, much to Toto's initial shock, but he quickly got over it as two of the royal guards were Zoan devil fruit users, and began digging in a random place like he was looking for a bone. And though he was able to dig at a much faster pace than Toto was, the sand that he was throwing out was landing in the hole that the old man was digging in. Toto began yelling at him to stop filling his hole with sand. Luffy looked back at him with a blank look, not getting what the problem was. I'll never get done with you filling my holes, Toto exclaimed in annoyance. But I'm digging just like you old guy, Luffy said innocently. No, I'm digging holes and you're filling them up, the sand that you're digging is going into the hole I'm digging. In other words, you aren't helping, Toto yelled, waving his arms around as he tried to explain it to him. Luffy blinked at that, before he said, a mystery hole, huh? And then he went back to digging like before and Toto irritably gave up. Luffy continued to dig down and down into the ground, the hole looking more like a well with every second. But Luffy kept going till he fell asleep in mid-day. Morning came to the desert in the bright daylight. Toto was there, sending them off. I'm so sorry I didn't have more to offer you Princess Vivi, he told her regretfully. Vivi telling him that he didn't need to worry about it, and thanked him for what he had done. But as they turned to leave, Toto quickly remembered something and pulled out a tiny barrel of water that could be worn around the neck, and gave it to Luffy. Oh water, Luffy and Usopp cried happily. You found some then? Luffy asked happily. Yes, it was last night a bit after you fell asleep digging that huge hole of yours, he answered with a smile. I finally reached a moist layer underneath all the dry stuff. That water there is the moisture I was able to extract from the damp sand. Whoa, that sounds pretty complicated, but thank you, Luffy answered. That right there is genuine Yuba water, Toto finished. It's not much, but it was all I was able to get. Right, Luffy said firmly, then I'll drink it with care. They waved off to Toto and continued walking through the desert, heading back the way they came. After a few minutes of walking however, Luffy suddenly flopped down up against a dead tree and sat there, not moving a muscle. The others didn't notice at first until Usopp finally realizes it and yells at him to get up and move. Luffy just sat there with a pout on his face as they turned back and asked just what was going on. He looked them all in the eye and said, I quit. Huh, they all asked. What's that mean? Vivi asked, quit what, Luffy? Oh come on, Usopp said, we don't have time to put up with every weird little mood you have right now, Luffy. Let's go. Yeah, shouldn't we get going? Chopper added. Yes, we should and fast, Sanji said. If we don't get back to that Katoria place where we came and stop the rebellion that's about to begin, then a million Alabasta citizens are gonna start fighting and things are gonna get real ugly real quick. We're doing this for Vivi. Sanji walked forward and grabbed him by his front and tried to get him to move, but surprisingly, Luffy grabbed him by the arm and threw him aside. What is wrong with you? Sanji roared out, looking dangerous as he got back to his feet. Luffy glared at them all before he looked right to Vivi. Vivi? Yes, she asked softly, clearly wondering what he was going to say. Right now all I wanna do is beat up Crocodile, you understand? He demanded, and for the first time he looked really angry and they were all taken aback by that. Maybe we can keep the people from starting a rebellion. That won't stop Crocodile, Luffy said firmly, in a serious voice that was nearly unheard of from him. Besides, we won't be able to accomplish anything in Katoria. Everyone stared at him as he explained, we're pirates. Everyone knows that things are better off without us around. You got to admit he has a way of getting straight to the point when he really wants to, Sanji admitted grudgingly, folding his arms. Well, yeah, Usopp admitted, but not often. Vivi tried to counter this by telling him that it wasn't true. You wanted it to work out so that nobody dies in this fight, Luffy went on, isn't that right, Vivi? None of the citizens, and none of us either. We're up against one of the 7 warlords of the sea and a million of your own people on top of that. And you still want everyone to end up all safe and sound. He looked up at her, you'll never win that way. Nami was telling Luffy off, asking if he could at least try showing Vivi some sympathy, but surprisingly, Sanji held out his arm and told her to stop. For what? She demanded. Because I think that Vivi needed to face up to the truth too, Sanji admitted, she was in denial the whole time. About what? Chopper asked in confusion. There's nothing wrong with not wanting people to die, Zoro said, however. But Vivi stepped forward, she was shaking from head to foot, her face contorted with rage as she pulled her hood down, finally shouting, and what's wrong with that, huh? What's so wrong with not wanting to see people to die or get hurt? Luffy looked at her and said coldly, cause people die, that's why. Vivi snapped. She went right up to him and slapped him so hard that he went flying from the tree and suddenly she was screaming to the heavens, stop talking like that, I won't listen to it. Taking deep breaths she yelled, say that again and I will really hurt you. That's the whole point of what we're doing here, don't you understand? No one here in ALABISTA, not the rebel army, not the royal army, not any of the CIITZENS is to blame for this. None of them have done anything wrong. Why should any of them have to pay for what's happened, when every last bit of it is Crocodile's fault? Zoro's eyes softened in sympathy, but only a little bit because she was the one who didn't understand. She had lived a very sheltered life up till now, not fully understanding what a war meant. There has never been a war where no one got hurt, and someone had to slap her awake. What she wanted was nothing but fantasy. Luffy got back to his feet and to everyone's astonishment, Luffy punched her so hard that he knocked her to the ground before he screamed out, so you're saying it's only alright for you to die? The Straw Hats were all stunned that he had gone and hurt her. No, Luffy, you've gone too far, Usopp screamed as Chopper gaped at him, with Sanji rolling up his sleeves looking ready to take him out for hitting a woman. But Vivi was far from over, with a wild scream she tackled him to the ground. Just being in this country one day and taking a look around, even I can tell, Luffy yelled as Vivi began to punch and hit him as hard as she could muster. They knew that it couldn't have really hurt him, but Luffy just kept talking, letting her take out all of her anger on him. Tell what? Vivi screamed, and for a moment she no longer looked like herself. It was then they realized that she looked a great deal like how Nami looked when she had failed to stop her own village rushing off to fight Arlong after he betrayed her, how she lost it completely and started to stab her own arm until Luffy stopped her. Here, Vivi was realizing that everything she did no longer mattered and she was like a lost child without any idea to what to do now. But Luffy could see that as he yelled out, what this country needs more than anything. You think that just by putting your life on the line is enough to stop this from happening? Well then what is it that I should be putting on the line with it then, Luffy? Vivi yelled, looking completely mad here. What Luffy? She demanded as Luffy finally put his hands up, held back her fists as she gasped for breath. As he stopped her, she seemed to calm down as she gasped out in defeat, I don't have anything else I can put on the line, just me. Luffy finally threw her off him as he yelled out at the top of his lungs, you can at least try putting all of our lives on the line together, aren't we friends, huh? Vivi stared at him, completely speechless by what he said and tears began to form. Well, he demanded in a quieter tone, aren't we friends? But Vivi couldn't answer as she began to cry as he reached over to pick up his hat that fell off during the fight. There, now you see, now you understand. Hey, you can cry? She didn't answer as she broke down completely, sobbing opening into her hands as the tension seemed to disappear around them. Dusting off the sand from his hat, Luffy admitted, I know how much you hate this, you want to get Crocodile the most. Nami came over and hugged Vivi tightly as she sobbed. Everyone stood around them, each one knew what was coming, waiting for orders. Luffy put his hat back on and stood up, so now tell me, where can I find Crocodile? It took several minutes for Vivi to cry herself dry before she was able to choke back her sobs and rubbed her red yes. Luffy was right, she stuttered as she brought herself back to the matter at hand. Vivi grew a face full of determination. I made up my mind now. Change of plans, she said, we're gonna go and find Crocodile. Yeah, Luffy agreed. That does seem like the quickest way to stop the fighting from happening. Nami agreed with them after everything seemed to calm down and relax. And we can quit wandering around in the desert too, Zoro added, it was beginning to get old. So where is he anyway? Sanji asked, this crocodile guy. Let's see, Vivi said, pulling out a map and they all gathered around her, and she began pointing out where the capital Alubarno was in the city of Kotoria. And even with Eyelash, there was no way they could hope to reach it before something happened. But she pointed to another city to the north called Rainbase, which was where Crocodile would be. She told them all that if they started walking now, they could make it there before the sun went down. Soon they were walking again, but it didn't take long for everyone to start complaining and groaning, especially from Luffy and Usopp, the former from once again being the pack mule, Camel and Usopp from the heat. Nami was getting annoyed and snapped at them to stop moaning all the time. Usopp and Luffy began arguing with Nami, but we had to walk, he reminded her. Meanwhile, Chopper asked Vivi if Rainbase had any water there, and Vivi nodded, admitting that there was no shortage there, and it was a gambling town that pretty much avoided all the fighting in the war. I guess people need places to relax, even here in Alabasta, Sanji said just as Luffy and Usopp began a game of keep away with the water that Toto gave him, and he was easily outpacing the long-nosed sniper in the form of an animal built for desert travel. Come on Luffy, just give me one sip of it, Usopp whined, isn't that why he gave it to you? The old guy from the sandstorm place gave it to me, Luffy said stubbornly, he had to dig all night just to get this much of it, we can't go drinking it like it's regular water or something, so no way. Wow, Nami called, you can restrain yourself sometimes. He retorted that of course he could before he turned to Vivi and asked how long it would be before they reached Rainbase. She smiled as she jumped down from the straw hat wearing Camel and said, hey Luffy, she said, thanks a lot. I never would have been able to make this decision on my own. Luffy's tongue rolled out of his head and said, okay then give me food. Huh? She asked as he nodded in determination. After I beat up Crocodile then give me food, I'll eat until I explode? She smiled wider. I promise I will. Finally they were standing on the dune where they could make out the city in the distance. Unlike Yuba or Aramalu, this city seemed to be green and thriving with life. Even from this far away, they could see that there were hundreds of people bustling around and doing their shopping. Yeah, Luffy screamed, double punching the air. Time to kick Crocodile to the curb. Zoro suddenly asked, so after all that's happened, are we operating under the assumption that Baroque Works knows that we're here on the island with them? That seems likely, Nami said. We did run into Mr. 2, so I think it's safe to say that they have at least some idea that we were heading to Alabasta. Who cares about that? Luffy asked in annoyance as Usopp explained that if they knew what they looked like then they had to stay low or else Crocodile would find some way to get rid of them. But naturally, Luffy didn't listen as he charged off, looking for water, and they watched him go running off. It wasn't long before they were back in the middle of a crowded street with shouting and screams going on. Luffy and Usopp were both carrying large barrels of water with Smoker and the Marines right on their heels. And they were leading them right back to the crew, again. Luffy screamed out, "Hey you guys, I think the Marines are here." Zoro yelled back sarcastically at them, "Hey thank you, we hadn't noticed that, Luffy." "Hurry up, we can't lose them this time men," one of the Marines yelled. "This is bad," Usopp yelled as the crowds moved back to prevent themselves from getting run over. "Baroque Works will see us if we run through the city." They could see people from all sides, watching from behind curtains in the buildings, down alleyways, even in plain sight as they ran past were all watching them with pictures. Zoro was the first to notice. "I think it's a little too late for that, Usopp." "Then it's decided," Luffy yelled, and Vivi turned to stare back at him, to where Crocodile is. "How about it, ready?" Vivi pointed ahead of them. "Do you see that building up ahead with the alligator on its roof?" she screamed. It was hard not to notice. It was clearly the largest building in this whole town, and with the large alligator on the roof, it was only too clear of where Crocodile would be. "That's the casino that Crocodile runs. It's called Rain Dinners." "I see it," Luffy said in understanding, "so that's where Crocodile is." Sanji yelled that it would be best if they split up for now, and he had a point, with Smoker and the rest of the Marines, as well as the Baroque Works members likely covering the city, it was their only choice. "Right, see y'all later," Luffy laughed as they all split when they reached a building. Viv and Zoro went one way, as Sanji, Usopp, and Nami went another. Luffy went running up, jumping up on an awning and into the air. "Don't die," he added, before he looked back to Smoker and stuck his tongue out at him like how he did with those Lapons once before. As he started hopping among the rooftops with grasshopper legs, he heard Smoker's voice screaming out, "You've got some real nerve there, Straw Hat, but don't think you can run forever." After a wild chase, both Nami and Usopp found their way to the casino, and not long after that, Zoro and Luffy showed up, Smoker hot on his heels. They were just in front of the casino. It was in the shape of a pyramid with lots of typical plants and even surrounded by a lake. The front door on the other side of a bridge with Nami, Usopp, and Zoro all there. Luffy was still running from Smoker, and when he saw them there he yelled, "Hey you guys, let's go, we have to get inside now." "Right behind you," Usopp yelled without any problems at all as Luffy ran past them all and they were on the bridge. As soon as Luffy realized where they were heading, he began to scream out at the top of his lungs that he was going to beat up Crocodile. As they ran, more members of Baroque Works had appeared and were shooting at them. Zoro went to deal with them and they went bursting through the front doors, though no one gave them any notice, even as Luffy kept screaming for Crocodile to come out so that he could kick his butt. Thankfully both Nami and Usopp both hit him from behind. "That's not gonna make him come out here, you loudmouth dope." "Don't forget," Usopp added as past Zoro caught up with them, "we're dealing with this country's hero. You want to turn all these customers against us?" "Alright fine," Luffy snapped at them, "so what do we do?" Usopp suddenly realized that they didn't even know what Crocodile looked like without Vivi, and they realized that she wasn't anywhere in sight. "Vivi, Crocodile, come out," all three were now screaming out with Zoro shaking his head. "I got you this time, Straw Hat," yelled a voice. "Smoker," Nami screamed as they all looked behind them to see Captain Smoker running across the bridge towards them. It was largely crowded, filled with people playing cards, rolling dice, or playing the slots. The noise and bright lights were a bit disorientating after their time in the desert. "You think you can just stroll in anywhere you like and I won't find you?" he demanded, and they all turned and ran. "Oh great," Usopp yelled. "What's that refugee from an ashtray doing in a casino in Rainbase?" "If you ask me I'd say he's developed a special affection for Luffy here," Zoro joked. Again, the people hardly paid attention to them as they ran through the room, practically trampling everything in their path. On they ran, even running right over some of the guards like they were just bumps in the road. Something else happened as they ran through the crowd. A group of people were waiting for them, leading them to the VIP room. "Did he just say the VIP lounge?" Usopp yelled in shock. "Hold on," Nami screamed out, "do you think that it's a trap maybe?" "Hey, don't these lounge things have free drinks for their guests?" Zoro asked. "It's not like we have a choice. Run for it," Luffy yelled as they barged through the doors and down the long hallway. At the end of the hall, it split into two paths. There were a pair of signs there with one saying, VIPs, and the other said, Pirates. Naturally, they turned down the path that said, Pirates, and led them to a dead end where the floor beneath them opened up and they fell into the darkness and then faded. They bout that childish ruse hook, line, and sinker. How are these guys the protagonists of this series again? They found themselves in a large room, with the windows like the aquarium, and so they supposed that they had to be under the lake. But what got their attention was that the five of them were inside a large stone and iron cage. Nami was already yelling at them all about this and Luffy just ignored her, looking pretty sick as he held onto the bars. "Luffy!" Zoro yelled as Smoker stood up, and when Luffy turned, he struck him with his jute, holding him down by the tip of his weapon. "What's wrong?" Luffy asked, his tongue rolling out once again and his eyes becoming glazed over. "I feel so helpless. It's like when I fall into the sea as a human, too." The others were gathered around, each of them demanding to know what Smoker did to him. That was when he confessed all about the sea prism stone, how it somehow gives off a wavelength that is the same as the sea itself. Upon contact, the material drains the victim's body of energy, and negates their devil fruit powers, having the same effect as throwing them into the sea. The tip of his jute was made of it as well, and he explained that this cage is also built of it, which is why he hasn't broken out yet. Zoro slowly began to pull his sword out, looking ready to fight him. Nami and Usopp tried to tell them to stop, that there was no point in fighting here. That was when an unfamiliar voice, one that was deep and relaxed with a hint of mockery, suddenly spoke up. She's right, give it up. They all looked up to see a large chair at its back to them. You're all gonna die together, the same voice said mockingly, so why not make an effort to get along first, the voice said. Huh, it's Crocodile, Smoker said, and the figure in the chair turned to face them. It was here that they got their first glimpse of the villain that they crossed a desert and an ocean to reach. A tall man with a wide chest, broad shoulders, and a thick neck was sitting there in the chair. He also had nape-length, deep black purple hair which is kept neatly slicked back with a long stitched scar above his nose that stretches across his face, but what they all noticed was that he was missing his left hand, and instead it was replaced with a large golden hook. He smirked evilly at them all from where he sat, as if he had this whole thing planned out from the very start. As soon as Smoker confirmed that it was Crocodile, Luffy was growling as everyone stared. Smoker finally pulled his weapon off Luffy as he glared at him. Huh, you're every bit the low-life sea scum I imagine, he stated. My, Crocodile said silkily, getting up from his chair. You're every bit the wild dog I've heard you were, Smoker. Unlike your superiors, you've never really believed I was on your side, have you? And of course, you were right. You know, Smoker, I have a feeling you'll die bravely in the line of duty, Crocodile went on. I'll be more than happy to inform the government that you put up a valiant fight against the vicious Straw Hat Pirate here. He stepped out from behind the desk and walked calmly over to them. I haven't the vaguest idea what really brought you to this country, but I'm guessing you're on your own. We both know that the government would never order you to come to this land. They have every confidence in me, a warlord of the sea. You big old bag of wind, Luffy yelled, rolling over to glare at him. You're Crocodile? He got up and grabbed hold of the bars. Come and fight me like a man, you big dumb, but his voice became slurred as Usopp yelled at him to let go of the bars. Straw Hat Luffy, Crocodile said smoothly, I congratulate you on getting this far, and I promise to dispose of you neatly and efficiently, once our special guest of honor has made her appearance. A guest? Nami repeated anxiously. While even as we speak, my partner is on the way to fetch her, he said. And so he calmly sat down at the table to enjoy his meal, which only made everyone angry that he was so calm with them trapped like this. But with nothing else they could do, the only thing was to wait. It was ironic, even having finally met the one who orchestrated the whole mess in Alabasta, Luffy and the others with him were unable to do anything to get at Crocodile because of the cage they were in. At first, Luffy tried turning into a rhino and simply burst out of the cage, but it turned out that it was sturdily built and Luffy had to quickly go back to his normal form or risk crushing himself and his fellow prisoners. He then tried going for a mouse to simply slip through the bars, but the second he did, Crocodile said in a casual manner, Oh, and Straw Hat, if you try to end the game before the guests arrive, I'll make sure your friends are the first to suffer and the last to die. Shuddering at the threat, Luffy went back to his human form with a pout while Nami and Usopp were pale at the casual tone the man used to threaten them with. It seemed to take forever as they waited. Crocodile merely sat at the table, enjoying his meal while Luffy and Usopp passed the time copying people with Zoro catching a quick nap. But over time, Nami seemed to grow more and more angry and finally ended up smacking the two to get them to stop clowning around. Get serious. How can you two screw around when we're in this desperate situation? She yelled. Well, we can't get out, so what else is there for us to do? Luffy demanded. The fact that we can't get out is the reason it's so desperate, Nami screamed out. If we don't do something soon we're gonna wind up dead. And why are you sleeping? She turned to Zoro and knocked him awake. Crocodile seemed to be growing tired of their talk and looked to her as he said, You're certainly a high-spirited young lady. Nami smirked back, telling him that he better enjoy it while he could because as soon as they got out of his cage the boys were going to beat him bloody, which Luffy yelled out confidently. Crocodile didn't seem the least bit concerned. Your crew members seem to put a lot of trust in your talent, Straw Hat Luffy, he said in amusement. How foolish. I think trust is completely unnecessary. Who does he think he is sneering at us? Nami demanded as Usopp tried to tell her not to say anything she'd regret before she made him angry. Crocodile, yelled a voice above them, and up on the stairs were two women, Vivi and Miss All Sunday. Vivi, the ones in the cage, called. My humble greetings, Vivi, Royal Princess of Alabasta, I mean Miss Wednesday, Crocodile said mockingly, leaning back in his chair. I compliment you on evading all our assassins in order to get this far. Vivi was shaking in rage as she glared down at him. You have no idea what I do, or how far I go to see you dead, Mr. Zero, she whispered, her voice trembling before she snapped, much like how she did at the desert when she smacked Luffy. I wish you had died in your cradle, you monster, she screamed as she charged at them. The ones in the cage screamed at her to let them out instead, that she couldn't take him on her own, but she ignored them as she pulled out her weapon. She threw it, striking his head as he had causally stuck a cigar into his mouth. At first it looked like she had done it, for his head was gone. Not gonna work, Smoker said, and the rest of Crocodile's body had turned to sand, spinning around like a small tornado, in his body, still missing his head, appeared behind Vivi and grabbed hold of her. Feel better? He asked discourteously. As a native of this country, you should surely know that I have the power of the sand fruit. Crocodile's head suddenly reappeared and he asked something that made them all feel cold. Want to become a mummy? Luffy began screaming at him to leave her alone, warning that if he hurt her he'd have to deal with him. Crocodile forced Vivi to sit in the chair opposite of him. I trust you'll be comfortable there, he told her. I must say that your timing is perfect. The party is about to begin, isn't that right, Miss All Sunday? Party? Nami asked as All Sunday pulled out a watch. It's exactly noon right now, she said softly, time for Operation Utopia. Luffy asked what this was about, but Crocodile just laughed insanely at that, looking back to Vivi. It will mean the demise of the Kingdom of Alabasta, Miss Wednesday, he said. I'm going to wipe it off the face of the map as if it never was. All people, great and small, will be sucked into eternal darkness as they writhe in agony. Let Operation Utopia begin. Crocodile laughed darkly at his sick and twisted plans. Vivi struggled against the ropes that now bound her to the chair, demanding to know what he was planning on doing to Alabasta. She let him know that if he planned on killing her father, he'd be dead before he could even get close to him. But he didn't seem bothered by that, Instead, he let her know that he didn't think that her father was even worth killing, and instead he was going to let him face something crueler than death. Vivi demanded to know what she was going on, screaming that he tell her what he was planning. Crocodile smirked and confessed his whole plan to her. How he planned to finish this country once and for all. He had his agents kidnap her father, and when Mr. Two disguised himself as him, he was going to have him attack the citizens, believing that the king had betrayed them. Here, the rebels would have the motivation they wanted. They would soon storm the capital, and that would be the end of it all. He laughed again as they all glared at him. Well, do you like it? Crocodile asked her, as if asking for her option on this whole plan. The operation you once participated in has now reached fruition. If you listen closely, I'd wager you can hear the howls of the kingdom. And they all scream the same thing, protect Alabasta, protect Alabasta, protect Alabasta. SSSSSTTTTOOOPPPPITTTTT. Vivi screamed out, sounding close to crying again. How are you so cruel? Crocodile only chuckled. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? Their love for their kingdom will be what destroys it. That was too much for Luffy. He charged at the cage again and was now attempting to break it apart with his bare hands. Is he stupid? Smoker suddenly asked Zoro in the background. Didn't he hear what I said before? I'm sure he did, he just doesn't care, Usopp said knowingly. Besides, he's too angry to think logically at this point. He's definitely stupid, Zoro admitted, a smile on his face. But that's also the reason he's our captain. Why else would we keep him around? Nami said scolding, though they all knew that she didn't mean a word of that. Crocodile, Luffy snarled, I am so gonna kick your butt. You know what? Crocodile said, as if bored. I've had to make so many moves to be able to get to this point. The sabotage to inflame the citizens, manipulating the royal army. He looked back to Vivi. Do you have any idea to why I go to such lengths? To destroy this country? As if I'd understand anything inside your foul mind, Vivi snarled. Vivi suddenly knocked her own chair over. Usopp and Nami called worriedly to her as Crocodile looked down at her. Well, what are you trying to do, Miss Wednesday? Stop you, she said fiercely. I'm gonna stop you. There's still time. If I can just get to Ulubarna east of here. She dragged her body across the floor. If I can get there before the rebel army, I may be able to stop them. I'll never give up while there's a chance. Crocodile only chuckled. Somehow I'm going to stop you, Vivi declared, glaring fiercely at him. Just watch, you won't get away with this. Amused by this pathetic attempt, Crocodile told her that he and Miss All Sunday were about to meet her father in Ulubarna themselves, but before he left, he held up a small key. The key to this cell? Luffy yelled. Hey, give it. Crocodile merely smiled as he let the key drop as Vivi struggled with the ropes. She was able to rip them apart just as she made a wild snatch, but it was too late. Crocodile opened up a trapdoor and the key fell down a long shaft. It won't be too long until the rebels and the royal force begin their battle to the death, Crocodile said. Even if you hurry to Ulubarna from here, who knows if you'd make it in time? He turned back to her. To stop the rebellion you'd need to leave at once, Miss Wednesday. Will you do that, or will you try to save your friends instead? It's your choice, but if you chose the latter, it doesn't help that I accidentally dropped the key into the banana gator's den. Vivi gasped as she looked down the hole. Banana gators. What are those things? Luffy called, before he shouted, pointing to the window. Look out the window, there's an alligator growing out of that banana. And as they looked, Usopp shrieked at the giant gators with banana-shaped growths on their heads. Gators so big that they could have easily swallowed a human in one gulp. In case you haven't noticed, that's not the only one, Nami screamed and panicked. It looks like we're in an aquarium, Usopp yelled, sounding scared out of his mind. I hope we're not the fish food. What weird bananas, Luffy said to himself. How can you think that? Usopp yelled at him, but Vivi gasped in horror as she continued staring down the hole. What now? Luffy called worriedly. Vivi, what happened? A big banana gator swallowed the key to your cell, she cried. Well then go down there and make it spit it out, Luffy yelled as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Vivi looked up and yelled back that she didn't stand a chance, explaining that banana gators were so strong and dangerous that they even preyed on sea kings. Sorry, Crocodile said, not sounding sorry in the slightest. You might have had the key if I hadn't accidentally dropped it, and now there's no telling which one of my pets swallowed it. Crocodile started to lead through a hallway behind them, one made of glass, and they could get a full look at least a dozen gators. Explaining further that Crocodile decided to flood the room they were in, so he presented Vivi in front of Luffy and the rest, the choice between getting to Ulubarna in time or saving Luffy and those with him before the room completely filled with water in 1 hour. As Crocodile was explaining this challenge to Vivi, he ended up laughing at the rebels and about Toto still digging away his life in Yuba. It was then that he confessed that he was the one causing the sandstorms as well as the drought to drive the people here insane. Vivi's face was livid. I will kill you, she shouted. He just turned and headed through the door as the water began pouring into the room while Miss All Sunday said he was receiving a call from Mr. Prince. Usopp freaked out at the sight of it, screaming for Vivi to help them and that he wanted to live a lot longer than 1 hour. Zoro then snapped at him to calm down, but Usopp was past hearing, screaming that they were going to drown like rats if they didn't get out. Vivi meanwhile was left to defend herself against the banana gators that started to enter the room. All right, now that jerk is gone, Luffy said in relief before scurrying out of the cage as a mouse, going back to Vivi's side, and becoming human once more. Quickly knocking several of the banana gators out that got too close to the princess, sadly none of them having the key, he turned and focused back to where his friends were being held. Now, I'm gonna tear that cage apart, he declared as he turned around, becoming a stegosaurus as he did so. Winding back his spiked tail for a massive blow, Nami and Usopp cheered their captain on. However, much to their shock, Luffy wasn't even able to make a dent in it. No matter what form he used, whether it be dinosaur or modern-day animals, he couldn't make a single scratch appear on the cages. While Luffy knew he had some forms that could possibly break the cage, they were just as likely to hurt his friends in the process. Also, every blow to the cage made Luffy slightly weaker as the sea prism sapped at his strength. The cage is too tough, Usopp screamed, looking ready to start bursting out in tears. I didn't even dent it, Luffy screamed dejectedly, just as Smoker spoke up, in a surprisingly disinterested voice, as if he couldn't care less to what was happening to him. We're all about to die, Usopp snapped at him loudly. How can you just sit there like that? You should be trying to get out of there too, Luffy added just as angrily. But rather than answer that he asked a question. Tell me something, how much do you guys know? What exactly is Crocodile after? They all looked surprised at the question and then Smoker went on to talk about Miss All Sunday, or her real name Nico Robin, about how the government had been after her for about 20 years and about her bounty. He also admitted that if those two were planning something, and if they aren't stopped here, there was a chance the whole world could get dragged into this. Luffy ignored him, claiming that he didn't need any other reason. He was still going to kick Crocodile's butt no matter what. I see, Smoker said in a skeptic voice to Luffy's declaration. So, how do you intend to get out of here? Or do you plan on leaving your crew members behind in order to chase down Crocodile yourself? Watch what you say, you jerk, Luffy growled angrily but then screamed as they were all beginning to freak out again at the ever-rising water. Just then, several more banana gators were able to climb over their out-cold fellows and started to converge on Vivi and the slightly weakened Luffy. Just then, a familiar voice spoke up. It's really impolite to make a lot of noise at mealtime like you were doing. I'll teach you to behave. And then one gator was suddenly flying. The impact of the kick was so great that the water seemed to part around them. Bad manners kick course. Sanji looked to the large dent in the gator's stomach and was out before it hit the floor. Hey guys, he said, looking to them. Been waiting long? Yay, it's Mr. Prince, we're finally gonna get out of here now. Usopp and Luffy cheered together, doing the kind of jig, tears of relief in their eyes. Thank you, Nami gasped in relief as Zoro snapped at him to hurry and find the key, but Sanji was once again swooning at Nami, asking if she loved him yet. Sure, she said, though it was clear from her tone that she didn't mean a word of it, and I'll love you even more if you hurry up and open this cage. Sanji turned back to the gators that were crawling up into the room in droves. Each one was baring their teeth at him as he turned back to them all calmly. More dinners with bad manners, huh? Sanji raised his foot, looking ready to fight them all. He was claiming to take his time for going after Nami. Usopp was screaming that they didn't have time for chivalry and to hurry up and take them out. Minor surprise came when Smoker helped them out by telling them that the third gator that just came in was the one with the key. Hey, Luffy said, looking back at him, how do you know that, Smokey? Guess your ears aren't as big as your mouth, he snapped back, isn't the one's growl the same one who swallowed the key? Luffy and Usopp stared back at the gators, hearing their growls, and Luffy admitted that he couldn't really tell, as he wasn't focusing on it at the time. Sanji took the Marine's advice and went straight for that gator, and when he did, something large, round, and white came spitting out of its mouth. A large, perfect round ball came bursting out and hit the floor, splashing water everywhere. They found out what it was very quickly. Everyone got a shock when the egg suddenly cracked open and Mr. 3 was there, looking as dried up as a mummy, and he dove his face into the water. Yes, water at last, it's a miracle, Mr. 3 gasped out. Mr. 3, who was drinking all the water around him to rehydrate himself, he didn't even notice them as he recovered and began talking to himself that after Crocodile fed him to the gator, he used his powers to create the wax ball and survive. That was when he noticed something attached to the wax ball and picked up the key. The two in the cage were yelling, trying to reach through the bars to grab it, and he freaked out as soon as he saw them. Obviously still having traumatic flashbacks to what happened at Little Garden. They could see the stunned look on his face change slowly as he put two and two together. Now I see what's happening here, he said, an evil smirk uncurling on his face. Mr. 3, I presume, Sanji said, stepping up to him, and Mr. 3 jumped in shock at that, demanding to know how Sanji knew who he was. Well, your hairstyle kinda gave it away, Sanji answered back, holding his hand out to take the key. I'll take the key, toss it here. Sure thing, Mr. 3 yelled with a toothy, malevolent grin. Here it goes, and then he tossed the key as far away as he could. They all watched in horror as it went flying and landing in the water, right in the middle of all those gators. I don't know who you are, Mr. 3 said, turning back to Sanji, still cackling insanely, but if you want the Straw Hats free, you're no friend of mine. Good luck, you'll need it with all those alligators around, trust me, I know. Jerk, Sanji snarled, looking ready to give him a beating. Better find it soon, Mr. 3 taunted them, that water's rising. And he wasn't kidding, the others were all yelling out, looking desperate now. Nami screamed out that they were almost out of time. Lousy, good-for-nothing wax guy, Sanji hissed. But Usopp suddenly cried out, wait a minute, Sanji. He might be good for something, like using those wax powers to make a key. Sanji grabbed hold of Mr. 3. It wasn't hard for him to convince him to help them out. Sanji beat him to within an inch of his life before he let up enough for Mr. 3 to turn his finger into a wax key and open the door. Nice work, Candleman, he said, now there are just two more things to do. He planted a note to Mr. 3's chest, Mr. Prince was here, and then kicked him hard enough that he went flying against the wall and knocked out. Everyone was piled out of the cell, and Sanji said that they had to hurry because he didn't know how much more time they had before Crocodile came back. Nami agreed, saying that they had to hurry and stop the rebels before they reached Lubarna, and that they should be able to get out through the hall that Crocodile was about to take before. But Vivi cried out that the hall was filled with banana gators. Not that they had to worry. A newly recovered Luffy and Zoro had just taken care of them all. That's it, Luffy yelled out, practically roaring with energy. I can take on hundreds of those WERID bananas. Well, Nami said, as they stared at them, that's problem solved. Vivi turned away, suddenly crying in shame after seeing how easy they took care of them all. And I had so much trouble with just one of them. Usopp was trying to comfort her, saying that she shouldn't compare herself to their insane strength, but that's when things got worse, as it always did. The walls all cracked and broke apart, and as the water came rushing towards them, they were soon bombarded with water. Luffy was yelling something at Zoro, but the others couldn't hear him over the roar of the waves. Soon they were all outside the casino. They were all a little taken aback by how low the sun was. They were in that cage for longer than they thought, and now they were at the very edge of the lake. Vivi, Nami, and an out-cold Usopp were riding on Luffy's back as he took the shape of an orca. Soon after, Sanji surfaced as well and spat out a mouthful of water. Sanji got up as the girls yelled at Usopp to wake up and helped him to pull himself out of the water. Zoro finally came up, but to everyone's shock, he had Smoker with him. Sanji spotted them and began to tell the swordsman off for doing something like that. That he was their enemy and he should have just left him down there. That was when Zoro snarled back that he didn't want to do it, so he should just shut up. Whatever, Sanji said, we gotta get moving guys. We've lost too much time already. Vivi, can you still make it? I don't know, Vivi admitted as she wrung out her robes. Sanji then turned to Nami and asked if she still had the perfume and asked to put it on. Roronoa, screamed a voice, and Smoker had turned his jute to Zoro, who blocked it with one of his sword. Why did you save my life? He demanded loudly, looking ready to fight him then and there. Zoro glared at Smoker and told him the whole truth. That seconds before the room was destroyed, Luffy had told him to go back and get him despite his protests. Smoker pulled his jute back as he registered what he said. All I did was follow my captain's orders, Zoro said coldly, that's it, so wouldn't read too much into it if I were you. It was one of his crazy whims, pay him no mind. Smoker put his jute back onto his back and asked, and you wouldn't have any gripes with me carrying my duties and arresting you, right? See, Sanji demanded, I knew it was a bad idea, this is what you get for saving a marine. Usopp and Luffy were getting back to their feet, yelling out about getting to Ulubarna. That was when Luffy noticed Smoker and turned to face him, looking ready to fight. You want some? Bring it on. Luffy yelled as Usopp begged that they just forget him and run for it. There was a very tense silence as Smoker looked to them all. For a moment they thought for sure that he going to just ignore what they did for him and try to capture them, but whether it was because they had saved him, or because he knew that they had a bigger issue with Crocodile to deal with, he finally answered. I should, but you just saved my life, he said quietly just as the sounds of his men could be heard. Smoker just looked at them long and hard before he slowly closed his eyes. Go, he said, and they looked at him, as if wondering if they heard him right. This is the only time I'm letting you straw hats off, got it? Smoker added, as if to make sure that they didn't read too much into this show of mercy. When we next meet, it's gonna be as enemies. Everyone stared at him, some of them even broke out into smiles as Sanji declared that was their cue to get out of here. The others all ran off, but Luffy stood where he was for a few seconds longer, Zoro calling after him to hurry up. Luffy looked back at Smoker for another long moment before he smirked. Hey, you're not such a bad guy, Smokey. Startled at what he said, Smoker's face grew red from either embarrassment or anger, they didn't know. Would you get the heck out of here, Straw Hat? He roared, attacking him, which caused them all to start running once again. Zoro smirking behind him as they ran to catch up with the others. Hurry, Usopp cried out, those marines are hot on our heels. Alright guys, Luffy cried out, taking the lead. We've got lots to do, so we're not gonna stop until we get to Lubarna, are you with me? Chapter 15. The Straw Hats were fleeing fast, still running through the mostly deserted streets of Rainbase. Suddenly Usopp was yelling at the others. Hey, he yelled, please tell me you guys aren't thinking of running all the way to Ulubarna? We've got Luffy and Chopper. Nami reminded him before she seemed to realize that Luffy was still in his human form. Why aren't you a camel yet? For that matter, where'd we find Chopper? Are you crazy? Luffy yelled back to Nami. I can't fight Crocodile while carrying you, anyway, I don't have a form that's big enough and fast enough to carry us all to Ulubarna in time. Hey, doesn't this town have stables? Let's get some horses. But the whole town is crawling with marines, Vivi reminded him. Not to worry, Sanji yelled with a smile, look up ahead. And they saw it. Chopper was on the back of the largest crab any of them had ever seen, big enough for all of them to ride. His face was grinning happily, with rope attached to either side of its mouth as it moved sideways, heading straight towards them. Hey you guys, Chopper yelled, waving when he saw them, hop on. Usopp screamed, his eyes bugging out so that he looked like the crab. A crab? Chopper. Nami yelled in shock as Vivi gasped in amazement at the moving crab, she called it. But Luffy was actually drooling when he saw it, obviously thinking one thing until Chopper called out that he was going to give them a ride. We get to ride it, Luffy cried happily as Chopper explained that he'd found the crab, named Scissors, and he was willing to give them a ride. Though he neglected to mention that he'd promised the desert crustacean the chance to meet 2 female incentives to get him to help. I can't believe you found one, Vivi said as Scissors used his claw to raise them off the ground and onto his back. Moving crabs are always submerged under the sand, so it's nearly impossible to spot one. Judging by its size, I'm guessing that this guy can move pretty fast, Zoro said as he looked at it in interest, his sword over his shoulder. Alright, Chopper declared, Luffy hanging onto the crab's eye as he shook out the reins, and they started moving off at an incredible speed. But just as they were gaining speed, really starting to enjoy the ride, they heard Vivi screaming in terror behind them. Startled, they all turned around to see, to their horror, that Crocodile's hook had hooked her around the waist and was pulling her backwards, away from them. The Straw Hats were as freaked out as they were, and Zoro screamed at Chopper to stop the crab, which he did so suddenly that they were almost flung off. But as Luffy steadied himself, he glared out into the distance. It's him, he yelled as he sprinted over to the hook on the legs of a cheetah. Luffy had grabbed hold of Vivi in the meantime, and he then switched places with her, holding onto the hook. He freed her and threw her back towards the rest of the group, but there wasn't enough time for him to let go as he was dragged back. Hey, Luffy, Zoro yelled after he caught Vivi. That idiot, Sanji added furiously. Luffy, no, Vivi screamed in terror as they watched Luffy being pulled back. But Luffy was grinning back, as if he had this all planned out. Hanging upside down, staring back at them with his arms still hooked, he called, you guys go on ahead, don't worry about me. He landed rather anticlimactically near Crocodile's feet. Luffy was still upside down, on his head with his feet dangling out as he called back to the others, make sure you deliver Vivi home safe and sound, you have to promise me. None of the past Straw Hats looked the least bit happy as they stared at him. He knew that each of them was struggling within themselves to do it. Follow their captain's orders and to leave without him, or to take him with them and risk all getting killed by Crocodile. Good luck you guys, Luffy stated softly, but somehow knew that they could hear him. Zoro had a rather rough smile plastered on his face, as if he was fighting hard not to be sick with himself, but he nodded in understanding and acceptance as he ordered Chopper to just keep going to Ulubarna. Chopper ordered Scissors to keep going, but looked ready to cry. The moving crab was almost out of their sights, and he could vaguely hear some of the Straw Hats arguing with each other. Some of them wanted to go back for Luffy, while others insisted that they should just keep going. But then, just before they were out of earshot, Vivi's voice called out, Luffy, listen, we'll be waiting for you, we'll be in ALUBIRNA. Luffy still lay on his head as both Crocodile and Miss All Sunday stood behind him, watching them leave with unreadable expressions on their faces. All Sunday spoke up. You could say that Princess Vivi slipped through our fingers. But Crocodile didn't seem too upset by it. No matter, he said causally, the agents are still scheduled to gather in Alubarna. Contact them at once. Crocodile looked down his nose at Luffy. Straw Hat, I'd say you've taken this nonsense a little too far. Luffy, whose face had turned hard and serious, finally flipped himself upright and began to pull off the blue scarf that was wrapped around his head and hat. Nonsense, he repeated softly. Vivi doesn't see it that way. You see, unlike most people, she generally cares about others. Crocodile kept looking at Luffy in a bored way as he finished dusting off all the sand from his clothes. I guess deep down she's an optimist, Luffy went on, even if it's not too realistic. Take this revolt for example, she believes that nobody needs to die. Nobody needs to die, Crocodile repeated with a smirk, highly amused at that. The problem with idealist fools like Princess Vivi is they take a stand without any comprehension of what is truly involved in a real fight, wouldn't you agree? Luffy seemed to agree with him. Yep, he answered as he stood up, but that doesn't change the fact that as long as you're around, Vivi's gonna fight until she either wins or dies trying. So I figure, his eyes turned dangerous as he stared him down, I'll take you down right here. But Crocodile merely chuckled at that. Such a foolish boy, he said casually. Despite what the idealists cry about, there's one constant truth. On the rough battlegrounds of life, you either kill or die. That's why I'm more than happy to shoot a bullet through every bleeding heart I meet. Luffy finished dusting himself off as he cracked his knuckles together. Yeah, he said, which proves you're the bigger fool. Crocodile's eyes turned dangerous and he bit down on his cigar so hard that it broke apart. All Sunday, however, was chuckling to herself at Luffy's words, holding her fingers up to her mouth as she tried to fight the urge to laugh out loud. Crocodile glared at All Sunday out of the corner of his eyes, seeing her laughing. You think something's funny? He growled at her, as if daring her to answer. Perhaps you'll like to die as well, Nico Robin? If you want to try, go right ahead, Robin said calmly, as if she couldn't care less with what he said. She turned away, still smiling before she asked as she walked away, and didn't you promise that you'd never call me by that name? Where are you going? Crocodile demanded as they watched her retreating back. I headed to Alubarna, she called back without stopping or even looking back at them. See you there. Cursed woman, I'll never figure her out, he heard Crocodile mutter to himself as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small hourglass. He threw it to Luffy's feet and the sand inside it began to fall. I got 3 minutes to spare, he informed him as they looked to the hourglass. After that, I'm certain your time will have run out as well. The two faced off, the wind blowing around them so that their clothes rustled a little from the breeze. The air was so tense between the two they could almost feel it in the air around them. At long last, Crocodile spoke. Your 3 minutes are counting down, he informed Luffy. I don't have any more time to waste on you. After another brief pause, Crocodile seemed to grow bored as he held up his hook and taunted him by saying, It's your move, kid. With pleasure, Luffy said as he cracked his fingers. He then disappeared from view and reappeared behind Crocodile in his cheetah hybrid form with his claws on display. Rapid cheetah swipe. And with his claws moving in a blur of motion he went out to hit him, but even though he hit him full on, it went right through the warlord when he turned into sand. This caught Luffy off guard as he stumbled a bit from the lack of resistance. This nearly cost him. Luffy just barely dodged as Crocodile flew at him and tried to stick his hook into his head. Luffy was forced to bend back into a handstand as he used his clawed foot to try and kick him there. But once again, his attack did no damage as he dissolved into sand. In frustration, Luffy brought his foot back, and the impact knocking him to the ground and his robe was discarded as he caught his breath. By now it should be quite obvious, Crocodile stated just then, and his body was pulling back together as Luffy got back up from the ground. But I'll warn you. You cannot beat me. Luffy was grinding his fangs together as he glared at him and Crocodile finished. This is a lesson in futility. Naturally, Luffy didn't seem to care as he turned to face him, thinking that if speed didn't work he'd go for power. Turning large, gray, and with tusks coming out of his mouth, the nearly 20-foot-tall elephant hybrid brought both his boulder-sized fists together and brought them down on Crocodile's head with a trumpet of elephant double hammer. This attack that could easily smash through solid steel, it went right through Crocodile as if he were made of air as the ground underneath him formed a large crater. Luffy kept throwing punches that sent shockwaves through the desert until he had run out of breath and struggled for air as Crocodile reformed once again, smiling smugly at him as if he had just proven a point. Listen to my warning and take heed, Crocodile said, eyes closed, still smiling. If you continue with this senseless attack, you will have accomplished nothing. Luffy, quickly turning into his Minotaur form, charged off once again, positioning his horns to pierce the warlord. Even as he hit him with such a powerful attack, and sand came bursting from Crocodile's back, still unaffected as he merely looked on with a rather blank expression, as if this wasn't worth his time. Now getting desperate, Luffy suddenly leapt up, and when he came back down again, a blue whale wearing a straw hat crashed down on the desert sand. The dust was so thick after the attack that there was zero visibility for a moment. When it cleared, there was no signs of Crocodile and Luffy was breathing hard back in human form, stomping furiously in the sand as he screamed out, Darn you, you lousy, old, stupid sand gator. Crocodile reformed behind Luffy this time. You're wasting your time, boy, he said in that same bored tone, and Luffy was becoming more angry with every passing second. You jerk, he cried out, spinning around to face him. No matter how hard you fight against the truth, there's no way that a zoo reject like you could even hope to rival me, Crocodile said just as Luffy lost it and punched his mouth, getting rid of part of his face before he yelled out, taking several breaths, I'm sorry, my fist interrupted you, now what was that? Crocodile's calm expression faded at that. He had been unruffled and collected the whole time they had fought up till now, but now he seemed to be close to losing his patience completely as he held up his gold hook. I've had my fill of your pathetic fun and games, he yelled, no longer playing around, let's end this now. Fun and games? Luffy repeated angrily as he wiped some of the sweat from his face. Trust me, I'm dead serious, jerk. But then he added to himself, dang, he's right though, he's got an answer for all my attacks, what do I do now? We may both be pirates, Crocodile yelled as his right hand began to turn into a blade of sand, but you fall grossly short on skill. He then brought his hand down and cried out his attack, Desert Spada. And with from his hand came a fast-moving sand and then stabs it into the ground, extending it along the ground like a torpedo, splitting anything in its path, including the very ground itself. This wave of sand headed right for him. Luffy didn't think of moving until the wave hit a rock that was directly in its pathway and it was split right in half. Luffy to move for he stepped out of the way just in time, but when the dust cleared he gasped at the deep ravine that had been formed from that attack. Crocodile then surprised him by giving Luffy a compliment as he turned his hand back to normal. Nice reflexes, boy. A full-on hit from that attack would have killed you. Luffy looked down the chasm that Crocodile created with a shocked expression. What the, that's one deep hole. You may have devil fruit powers, Crocodile went on as he held up his hand, his fingertips halfway to sand, and was being blown in the wind. But you lack discipline and training. With that your skills could be as formidable as any, but you're not there yet. Like so many fools you waste time obsessing over your abilities, gimmicks get only you so far in a fight, without the skill set to back it up. Crocodile cried out, Desert Girasole, and here, Crocodile created another loose sand blade from his hand. But this time, when he stabbed it into the ground this time, the area in front of him started to collapse. In its place was a giant pit where the sand was being sucked down like it was going down the drain. Luffy stared at him in confusion before he realized that he was being pulled right into the hole as well. Luffy was already running as hard and as fast as he could to get himself out of the pit, turning his legs into multiple animal ones, but so far it wasn't doing him any good, he wasn't even going anywhere. He was yelling in panic, not getting what was going on as Crocodile watched in pleasure. What's wrong? Never heard of quicksand, Crocodile called as Luffy kept running. Every few steps that he took he was being dragged back, at this rate he'd never get out. It makes for a convenient desert burial when you need to get rid of someone in a hurry. The sand is drawn down into underground waterways and I have the good fortune of being able to detect exactly where they are. That advantage alone is enough to make me unbeatable when fighting in the desert. If you think I'm going to let myself be buried alive in this sand trap you've got another thing coming. Luffy yelled as his eyes widened with inspiration and he turned his arms into a hawk's wings to fly himself right out of the trap. Luffy shot up into the air and made a beeline straight for the warlord. With some quick maneuvering, his arms went back into their human form before they became insect-like and multiplied by 3, giving himself 8 spider legs. If I can't slug you, he cried as spider webs began to lace through his arms, then maybe I can catch you instead. And as he threw the makeshift net to trap him, it was the same as before. Crocodile used a wave of sand to block the net. Haven't you learned anything, moron? He demanded, now sounding deeply annoyed, predictable. Shut up, Luffy yelled, trying to use his chimera form to try and rip him in half, but it was now getting desperate. Crocodile said that this was now getting old as he pulled his two halves back together. Suddenly, his powers worked like quicksand once again, and pulled Luffy in towards him. Let me go, Luffy cried as he tried to pull his reptilian arm free, I'm warning you. Crocodile swung his right arm forward while leaving a crescent-shaped trail of sand behind it. Crescent cutlass, he cried and slashed at Luffy's arm. Luffy then screamed in pain as he grabbed his arm and jumped away so that he landed hard on his back. His entire right arm to his elbow had been dried up, mummified. Luffy was staring at his shriveled up arm, unable to believe what he was seeing. What did you do? He demanded from where he lay. It's all shriveled up, like a mummy. You turned my arm into a mummy. Stop whining, Crocodile called to him dully. This is the price you pay. The sand has absorbed all the moisture from your arm. You're lucky all I decided to attack was your arm. I can do this all day long until you're a pile of dust. Luffy was slowly sitting up as he gasped for more air. You've got to be kidding me, he said before his eyes lit up as if he had a sudden idea. Before you could blink, he suddenly ran towards the robe that he threw off when he started fighting Crocodile. Throwing it aside, he found what he was looking for, the little water barrel that Toto gave him from Yuba. And like that, once Luffy drank from it, the much-needed water flowed into his arm and it was returned to normal. Crocodile still looked bored and let him know that he thought it was all in vain. You're wrong, Sandy, Luffy yelled and raised the water up for him to see. You see that old guy in Yuba gave me this barrel of water. He spent all night digging it up just for me. He's not scared and neither am I. He got back to his goat-like feet, having found his second wind. I'm not about to give in to the sand, without a fight, and he charged towards Crocodile again. Chimera. This is getting ridiculous, Crocodile asked, slightly annoyed, standing still for another punch or kick, but Luffy did something different. Fire blitz, Luffy cried as he stretched out his mouth wide enough and sent a stream of white-hot flame that incinerated half of Crocodile's body. When the flames ended, half of Crocodile looked smooth and transparent, having become glass. Just as Luffy was about to celebrate, however, he noticed that the sand under him was starting to be drawn towards the seemingly dead pirate. The glass portion of him suddenly shattered, and a sandy outline suddenly formed out of his waist until it formed into an unhurt crocodile, but he looked mad. Enough. This ends now, Crocodile screamed in rage and Luffy was thrown back onto the ground, coughing up the sand that he swallowed from the impact. Crocodile was glaring at him, the redness in his eyes standing out, truly looking put out at being humiliated here. Vermin, he snarled, it is time to die. Both you and the accused land of Yuba. Luffy was still spitting out sand as Crocodile looked to the hourglass to see that the sand had run its course. Your 3 minutes are up, he said, like I said at the start. I don't have time to fool around with you any longer. And then, it was here that he created another sandstorm with his right hand, one so big that Luffy was forced to cover his face as he tried to force himself to stand tall. Crocodile was standing there with his eyes closed for a moment, as if he was merely enjoying a soft breeze from the ocean. Ah, the sand's so soothing and dry, he said to himself before he looked to Luffy and asked, listen carefully. Can you hear it move? In this land the prevailing wind always blow from north to south, and so, if this infantile sandstorm of mine were to say catch one of these winds, it would grow until it became a monster. And following its path south, where do you think it would strike? Luffy demanded to know where. Crocodile grinned. In Yuba, he answered. Luffy's eyes were wide with realization and anger. No, not there, he screamed over the sandstorm and grabbed him by his coat. Darn it, why the heck are you doing this? Stop it. But Crocodile ignored Luffy's demands as he looked to the storm with a fondness, as if he were a proud parent, Look, he said smugly, it started. It's headed south. That nice old man has nothing to do with this, you hear me? Luffy yelled as he let go of him and actually went running to try and stop the storm. Stop it, or I swear I'll kill you, you creep. Luffy was thrown backwards, practically spinning through the air and landing back in the sand as the wind picked up speed. You cannot alter fate, Crocodile advised as he looked back to the storm. That sandstorm is going to pick up strength, and eventually it'll become strong enough that even I can't stop it. I don't believe you, liar, Luffy screamed at the warlord. Yuba is finished, Crocodile said with a serene smile as he shut his eyes, as if he was enjoying the moment. In a fit of rage, Luffy charged up to him and grabbed him by the coat again. If you don't end it, I will. He screamed as flames licked his fanged maw, but then he stopped dead, his threat dying on his mouth as his eyes widened, staring ahead of him as if in shock. Luffy still didn't speak as his hands slowly fell to his side as his form slowly shrunk down to his human form, and looking down you could see why. Luffy was so distracted that he didn't notice that he had gotten too close. Crocodile's hook had struck him in the stomach. The entire hook had gone through his body as if he was made of butter, and was now sticking out of his back. A single trail of blood dripped from Luffy's mouth as he fell forward on Crocodile's arm, limp as a rag doll. Crocodile was holding Luffy off the ground so that his full weight was on the hook. He was hanging there limply, blood now flooding from his body and dripping into a pool on the ground. Blood poured from his mouth and nose, dripping all over. Did you really think you were my equal? Crocodile asked him softly as the steady dripping of the blood from his hook was Luffy's only response. There have been many number of rookies like you who challenged me, and you've all shared a common trait, fatal ineptitude. In the end, the only thing you are truly qualified for is death. This sandstorm will deal you by a final destructive blow, Crocodile told Luffy as he held him up a little higher. Luffy's eyes were now completely empty, his mouth wide open and he was no longer breathing, adding the flames of anger within the rebel army until an inferno ignites. But in the end, the bleeding hearts which infest this land will be what kills it. He smiled fondly at his plan as he shook his arm out so that Luffy's limp body was forced to move back so that they could all see his face more clearly. If only you had purged yourself of such weakness you may have lived a little longer, Crocodile said almost sympathetically. But despite all the bragging, he almost failed to notice the destroyed water barrel that his hook also pierced when he rammed his hook into Luffy's body. Water? Crocodile questioned absent-mindedly before he smirked. I assume that you don't feel so indebted to this water now? But then Crocodile received the shock of his life as Luffy's hand suddenly flew up and grabbed hold of his arm. Crocodile took a step backwards at that and suddenly he yelled out. The water from Luffy's wet hand was allowing him to touch his arm. Perhaps Luffy realized this as well, for suddenly he was starting to move again, struggling for air as he tried to breathe, choking and coughing up even more blood. Crocodile was staring at him in complete shock, maybe even a little fear. What's this? You're still alive, he cried out before he angrily threw him from his hook into the quicksand so that he rolled down to near the bottom. Luffy suddenly turned over and was now screaming in anguish as he held onto the bleeding hole and blood was bubbling up, seeping everywhere. Luffy was struggling for breath as he writhed around in pain, the sand now starting to cause him to sink, and with no way to pull himself out of it this time. That looks like it hurts, Crocodile observed smugly, but you'll be out of your misery soon enough. Luffy must have comprehended that he was sinking and was trying to thrash around to get out. His vision was fading in and out, sometimes blurry and others clearer, but it was steadily growing darker by the second and Luffy just couldn't seem to will himself to move. As he looked up he could still make out Crocodile's form standing there. Luffy raised his hand, as if he was trying to reach for one last attack on Crocodile as he turned and disappeared as the rays of sun stared going down. Goodbye, the dying boy heard his slimy voice say as Luffy tried one last time to give chase, but it was no use. The sand was drawing him in very slowly. The sound of the sandstorm slowly faded away as it headed south, and the sunlight disappeared as the darkness set in. Luffy's breathing was now a deep rasping gasp and his vision was so bad that they could only just make out shapes and shadows around them as he continued sinking deeper. Only Luffy's head was still above the sand and he was still struggling to pull himself out. Just then, Luffy spoke, with his last breath, he called out at the top of his lungs just before his head disappeared beneath the sand. MMMMMMMETTTTTTT. But then the sand piled on top of him and he could see nothing but darkness. Suddenly, he could hear the sounds of crunching sand, someone was here, and then the next second, he was back in the open air. Luffy was being lifted out of the sand by arms. Standing above him, Nico Robin looked down at Luffy's bleeding form with curiosity. Luffy was a real mess, he was still breathing hard and he was now drenched in his own blood. Luffy opened his bloodshot eyes and turned his head painfully towards Robin and croaked out, thank you. Robin didn't say anything for a moment before she finally asked, why do you fight? Luffy was surprised by this as he gave her a look of confusion. She must have understood the unasked question because she added, those of you with the name of D? D, Luffy repeated with a choke, clearly not understanding what she was talking about. She didn't seem surprised at that as she continued looking at him, merely dissatisfied as she sighed. Apparently you don't have a clue what I'm talking about, she said, the disappointment in her voice clear as she looked away where another of her hands had appeared, pulling out the straw hat and threw it towards her like a frisbee, which she caught. But as she looked at it, an angry voice called out behind them, I found you. With the little strength he had, Luffy turned in time to see a pale-looking man using a sword as a crutch for him to walk. He was a rather tall man with purple lines under each eye that ran down the sides of his face, making him look a little like a falcon. He was dressed in a long, white robe with star-like motifs. He looked to be almost as big a mess as Luffy was, like he just fought for his life out of a heavy battle. He barely seemed able to walk. Where is Vivi? The man, named Pell the Falcon and one of the king's royal guards, demanded, glaring at Robin. She politely fanned herself with the straw hat and asked, awake already? Pell called out, now that I've studied your ability, this won't turn out like last time. He looked ready to draw his sword and fight her right then and there. But she didn't seem concerned as she causally tossed Luffy's hat so that it fluttered on top of his chest. Be careful, Pell, she warned, you don't want to push yourself. Pell still tried to make his way towards her, wanting to fight but he was in bad shape and shouldn't even have been walking, let alone fighting. Robin turned away and they were startled to see a strange alligator in the sand waiting for her. They were all suddenly reminded of when she left the Mary the first time on the back of that giant turtle. As she headed it, she called back causally, "Perfect timing. Why don't you save the boy before he dies?" Pal looked over to spot Luffy laying there, his blood now soaking the sand around him. "After all, he is the brave knight who brought your precious princess back alive," Robin informed him. Pal was looking at Luffy in surprise as Robin went on, "It must please you to know Vivi's safe. That even as we speak she's on her way towards Alubarna. She stepped onto the ladder to the desert croc as she finished, though it's a long trip and anything could happen. Guess the situation is what it is." Pell was growling furiously as she took her seat and the gator led at an amazing speed, just as fast as the moving crab had moved as Pell fell to his knees, unable to stand up any longer. They could all tell that even a short walk was painful for him in the shape he was in. But Luffy suddenly dragged himself over to him, with Luffy ignored his own injury as he grabbed Pell's sleeve, who looked back in surprise. As he tried to pull his arm free, Luffy looked up and gasped out, "Meat." Luffy kept coughing up blood, and Pell realizing the full extent of his injuries. "Hey, kid," he asked in concern, "are you alright?" "Need meat," was all he answered him. "Meat, meat," Pell repeated in bafflement. "You don't need food now," Pell went on, "that's the least of your worries." He got back up and staggered a few feet away in the direction of the city. "Hang on, I'll get a doctor for you." But Luffy hadn't let go of his sleeve and it wasn't until Pell was a good 10 feet away before he realized it. He looked back and seemed startled at his stretched out arm, as Luffy spoke into the sand, "I'm gonna make sure that Crocodile pays for this." Pell stared at him, his eyes widening at Crocodile's name as Luffy croaked out, "He insulted Vivi, and that old man with the shovel who gave me water." He gave a shuddering gasp, "He's definitely gonna pay." Pell seemed at a loss for words before he slowly limped back to him as Luffy still muttered about meat. Later, Luffy was in the air. Luffy looked 10 times better than before as he flew in his hawk form. Though still a mess and had a thick bandage wrapped around the wound, he was looking like he was ready to go another round with anybody. He had tied a large barrel and hose around him so that he was able to carry it on his back and apparently having a long talk with Pell who flew alongside him. The man himself had eaten his own devil fruit that allowed him to take the form of a falcon. "So what is your connection to that woman?" Pell asked. "What woman? You mean the one who dug me out of the sand?" Luffy asked him. "Yes," Pell said, his eyes looking back at him. "She is in Baroque Works, isn't she? But she helped you, didn't she? So how do you know her?" "I don't," Luffy answered truthfully. "Well, after we met Vivi she was on our ship and tried to tell us where to go but I wouldn't listen. But Vivi said that she was Crocodile's partner," Luffy finished. "I see," Pell said softly. "I suppose then that I shouldn't be surprised that she dealt with me so easily, though it is hard to accept." "I hear ya," Luffy nodded, talon foot over the spot where Crocodile's hook impaled him and his eyes hardened. "But I'm going to take that croc out the next time I see him. We have to hurry to Alubarna." "And you truly are the one who brought Vivi back here to this country?" Pell went on, asking with a deep worry in his eyes. "Yeah, of course," Luffy called. "In that case I owe you a deep thank you for protecting her for us while we were unable to," Pell said, and he could hear the gratitude in his tone. "Where is she now?" "My crew took her to Alubarna while I stayed back to fight Crocodile," Luffy said. "They should be there already." "You sure about that?" Pell asked worriedly. "Don't worry," Luffy said brightly, thumping his chest with a wing before wincing in pain as he went on without any doubt in his mind. "My crew will get her there no problem. They can handle anything. Besides," Luffy went on as they continued on and could make out a city in the distance, "I figured out Crocodile's weakness this time." "Beware of Crocodile," Pell suddenly warned Luffy. For the last 3 years he had gotten rid of the pirates who had come here. It is how he had earned the trust of the people here. Each and every pirate was taken care of. Even if you're right about his weakness, that won't be enough to guarantee a victory. However, there is a saying here in the Grand Line, Logia devil fruit users who think they're invincible often die young. Even if that's true, Crocodile surely didn't become a warlord because of his powers alone. "Don't worry," Luffy said firmly, "I'm going to kick Crocodile to the curb this time for sure." Pell must have understood the determination in his voice for he nodded his head. "Alright then, we're almost to Alubarna now." Onwards they flew over the great city, though at the moment it was almost impossible to see anything. There was a thick fog of sand and dust clouding their vision so it was almost impossible to see anything on the ground. There were screams of pain and they could make out the sounds of thousands of people fighting. As they flew a little lower, they were finally able to get a good look at what was going on. Rebels and royals were battling out in the square and streets, attacking anyone they thought was the enemy. It was complete and utter chaos as gunfire, cannonballs, and explosions filled the air. Blood was splattered all over the place and people were dropping like flies, neither side gaining or losing ground. "Dang," Luffy's voice suddenly yelled, "I can't see anything here, I don't know where everyone is." "This storm isn't natural," Pell answered as they flew just a little bit higher so that they could look around farther, "and if what you said was true about Crocodile being the one responsible for the constant sandstorms, then it doesn't surprise me that he would use that here." "Where do you think Vivi is?" Luffy asked again. Pell thought it over for a moment. "The only place I can think of is with Chaka at the palace. She must be there, let's go." And suddenly he turned sharply in the air, heading for the largest building, towering higher than all the others. Luffy hurriedly flew after him. They then noticed that there was someone standing up on the wall, overlooking the square. "What's that?" Vivi and Crocodile. They were right. Crocodile was holding Vivi by the throat, dangling her over the wall and had just let go of her so that she fell like a stone to the fighting below. "My princess," Pell cried in horror as Luffy screamed out in shock. "Come on, we have to get her," Luffy shrieked and Pell didn't need to be told that as the two zones went into a steep dive and like a meteor, they fell towards the earth. They were close enough that they could hear that horrible, power-dripping laugh of the warlords, but that didn't last long for he was looking up and spotted them coming at them. "CCCCRRRROOOCCC Kudial LL Lee," Luffy screamed at the top of his lungs. The falling Vivi heard his voice as well. "Luffy," she screamed joyously, a hopeful smile back on her face as Crocodile let out a cry of disbelief. Leaning low over Pell, the two were able to swoop down and caught Vivi just above where all the fighting was happening. catching the ones below them off guard as they went soaring up high again, Vivi safe in Luffy's talons. Just in time, Luffy sighed in relief as Vivi clung tightly to him. Vivi continued to hang onto to Luffy and buried her face into his feathered chest as she cried out, "Luffy, pal, there isn't much time left before the squares blow up. Everyone is already down there." My voice, she choked out, it can't be heard no matter how much I yell. At this rate, the country will fall apart. And she broke down completely here, sobbing her heart out on his shoulder. It was hard to watch, seeing how hopeless that Vivi saw everything. Luffy then spoke, and she was surprised by his sudden change in tone, like how one would speak to a small child who had a terrible nightmare. Despite all the noise from the fighting and explosions, she could hear his words as he smiled at her. "Don't worry, Vivi," he reassured her, "as long as we're here your voice will always be heard." She stared at him before she gave him a watery smile, tears falling faster than ever as she hung on tightly. They headed to the foot of the palace, Pell landing and Luffy setting Vivi on her feet, shifting the barrel on his back. Luffy stepped forward while going to human form, spinning his arms around and limbering up, getting ready for a real fight. "Best of luck, Luffy," Pell said, "be careful. I ate tons of meat, bird guy. I'll be just fine," Luffy cried out, stretching his arms out as he glared up at Crocodile, who glared back down with a deep annoyance. They could all tell that though Crocodile still thought that he wasn't worth his time, his patience was running out and Luffy had made himself into a real pest. "I won't lose to you," Luffy declared, looking ready to rocket himself up there, but then a familiar voice screamed behind him, "It's Luffy, he's alive." Spinning around to look, they saw that the Straw Hats were there. Chopper, Usopp, and Sanji were all there. The scream had come from Chopper, looking burnt and bruised, but still alive as he looked like he was out of his mind in happiness. "Tony's here too," Vivi cried out as they saw him. "What? Luffy, Luffy," Usopp yelled, his entire body wrapped up like a mummy's. Chopper spotted Vivi and cried out happily that she was alright too. See, he's still alive. What did I tell you? I knew it all along," Usopp yelled, as if hoping that the whole world knew that he had been right, though he looked ready to cry here. "Really?" Chopper asked him eagerly. However, Sanji reminded him, for someone who knew it all along you sure look surprised. Sanji was full of thick bruises, and he looked a great deal like how he looked when he got hurt in that avalanche on Drum. "Usopp, Sanji, you're alright," Vivi exclaimed in shock as Sanji looked at her and gasped in concern. "Oh, Vivi, what happened?" he cried out. "Are you alright? You look like you've been hurt." Zoro came running up, carrying Nami on his back. Both of them were a mess as well. Zoro looked like he had a bad fight with a cheese grater, his entire front was slashed and his shirt was soaked with dried blood. Nami was covered with cuts and puncture holes with her clothes ripped and torn, her leg probably in the worst shape as blood dripped from a large hole in her foot. As soon as she saw Usopp she jumped down and hit him over the head with her weapon. "Nami too, and Mr. Bushido," Vivi muttered, gasping with her eyes wide, as if not really believing what she was seeing. "Everyone is alive. I asked you to make a weapon for me but instead it did magic tricks, like flowers and doves," Nami cried out as Usopp rubbed his abused head. "You turned me into a clown?" "Oh come on, you're standing up just fine," Zoro screamed angrily. Usopp asked about the powerful attack and she told him to be quiet as she turned back to Vivi, asking about the dust flying everywhere. Sanji was now yelling at Zoro, "Explain yourself, idiot. How could you let Nami get injured like that?" "She's fine, let it go," Zoro snapped back as he tried to catch his breath. "I'll listen, Chopper," Usopp gasped. "Do me a favor, bury my body out in the wastelands when I'm dead and gone." And it was hard to tell here, but he seemed to go into an actor's faint. "No, Usopp, don't die," Chopper cried in worry. "I'm sorry, you guys," Luffy said, whose face was once again hidden by shadow, and everyone looked to him, his arms stretched out, and looking ready to launch himself up to the palace. But he hung back long enough to talk to them. There was shame and embarrassment in his voice as he finished. "I know I lost to him once already. This time, I'm gonna win. The rest is up to you." The others didn't seem to be upset with the fact that he lost. They were all smiling confidently at him. "So get going already," Zoro said with a smirk with Nami and Sanji smiling just as widely as he was. "If you can't beat this guy," Usopp said loudly, "then I don't know anybody who can." Luffy reassured them all, "I'm gonna put an end to this, for good." Yeah, they all cheered him on, looking ready to take on the world despite all their injuries as Vivi started crying again. "Thank you," she gasped, rubbing at her eyes, "after all that's happened, all of you are still with me." Even Pell was looking at them all with a gentle look in his eyes, as if he couldn't agree more. Even he was looking like he believed that Luffy could take him out. Finally, with one last grin at them all, Luffy rocketed himself up on an eagle's wings, hurtling himself through the air at him, screaming the whole way. "Try all you want," Crocodile called. Now that the shock of seeing him alive was over, he was back to confident. Luffy landed and became a jackrabbit who sprinted towards the man with a fist cocked back. He continued, "But no matter how many times you swing, you'll never hit me. I guess you didn't get enough the first time, huh?" Crocodile stood still, waiting for the attack, but this time, when he was starting to cause his head to dissolve into sand, Luffy threw a punch, and to his amazement, he was able to strike him this time. Luffy had hit him so hard that he was knocked right off the wall. Blood was dripping from the side of Crocodile's mouth and his eyes were wide with shock as he was sent flying back, landing painfully in the dirt just as Luffy skidded on his own landing. Once Luffy came to a stop, he realized that they weren't alone. There were several guards, either dead or out cold on the ground. Robin was also there, but was standing next to a man who was actually nailed to the wall. 2 long spikes were shoved right through his arms and his blood was dripping down around them as he stared ahead at the fight. He had a wrinkled face, a tied-off beard with long, curly hair, and he was dressed in a simple yet regal robe, and there was something about his large kind eyes that reminded them all of Vivi. Crocodile started getting up, but Luffy was far from done. His back was coated in an armor like hide while his face elongated into a snout. He then curled himself into a ball and started spinning in place. Meanwhile, the croc had staggered to his feet. "How can he hit me?" Crocodile gasped as Luffy came spinning towards him. "Armadillo, buzzsaw." With a great headbutt that would have cracked a normal person's skull right in two, Crocodile's eyes rolled into the back of his head as he went flying back fell to the ground. Cobra was also gasping at what he saw, his eyes wide as coins. Robin was smiling slightly, once again, amazed at this kid's tenacity. Luffy was gasping for breath again. Though he had only started, he was already starting to get tired thanks to that wound. Though he had recovered enough that it seemed to have closed over, the repair was only temporary, and if he wasn't careful, he knew that it was going to open up again. He had to be careful, as changing his forms was undoubtedly going to put pressure on the wound. The sounds of the battle below them seemed to fade, for here, only this battle seemed to matter. Get up, Luffy yelled at Crocodile as he shrunk back to human form. I figured something out when some of my Yuba water dropped on your hand. Once you touch water, you can't turn into sand anymore. Luffy then took the hose connected to the water barrel on his back and splashed some onto his arm as he spoke. You took away all the rain because you're afraid of water, didn't you? He grinned as he held up his soaked hand. I know how to defeat you, Crocodile. Our real fight is starting now. Luffy's body became covered in a black armor-like exoskeleton while his now wet hands became claws and a large stinger-tipped tail burst from his spine. With his claws he grabbed hold of Crocodile's arm and the Sandman cried out in pain. Get up, Luffy yelled again more fiercely. It's time to fight, now Crocodile. Finally, Crocodile chuckled to himself as he slowly sat up. By the time he was in a sitting position, it had turned into a full laugh as Robin and Cobra watched on. Luffy pulled off his hat and threw it out of harm's way so that he wouldn't have to worry about it getting harmed in the battle. Crocodile asked in great amusement, come on, you think you can defeat me? Sure do, Luffy answered bluntly, now that I've figured out how to stop you from turning into sand. I'll admit I'm impressed you figured it out, Crocodile said, holding up his hand casually, as if discussing the matter at the dinner table, especially since you were about to die. But I hope you realize that something like that isn't enough to make this an even fight. I am one of the 7 warlords of the sea. So what if you're one of the 7 dumb warlords? Luffy exclaimed. Guess that makes me the 8th warlord. Really, who is that guy? Cobra asked Robin as they moved back closer to the palace walls so that they could get a better look at the whole thing. He's a pirate, Robin answered coolly as he looked to her. I'm surprised you haven't heard of him yet. He's helped your darling Princess Vivi escape from death a few times now. So then he asked looking back at him with new interest, is the one responsible for bringing Vivi back? Robin didn't answer him as she watched, her thumb brought up to her smile as if she was really enjoying seeing Luffy pound Crocodile. Scorpions, jab, Luffy yelled as he attempted to puncture Crocodile with his stinger, but Crocodile easily moved his head just a little so that Luffy missed him completely. If I dodge it, then it's no use, he said as he grabbed hold of the tail that rocketed by his head, my hand can still absorb any fluid on you. Luffy gritted his teeth in anger as Crocodile attempted to dry up the appendage, but it soon turned to a triumphant smirk as a look of confusion appeared on Crocodile's face. Luffy sent a vicious backhand with his claw that sent Crocodile sprawling away. The warlord got up with an enraged, but also confused, look on his face. What, why can't I drain you? He cried. Luffy grinned. Remember how you told me how devil fruit powers get stronger? He threw another jab with his tail at him, however, when he pulled at his tail, he let it vibrate like how one would when they placed a guitar string. So then it snapped like a rubber band, making it look like there were dozens of stingers flying at him, impossible to know where it would land. Crocodile was taken by complete surprise as Luffy finished, Scorpion, shotgun. Crocodile was forced to jump out of the way at the last second, sending another desert spotter right at him. Luffy realized this and moved, missing it by just a hair. Like before, there was now a deep ravine in the palace yawn, smashing right into the wall and blew it away in an explosion. Luffy was breathing deeply as he looked to the damage, but was still going for it. He turned and looked ready to throw another attack right at him. You didn't answer my question, Crocodile growled, but then his eyes lit up in realization. Of course, he drawled, it's that form you're in, isn't it? That scorpion is native to the desert, so it isn't affected by my sand as badly. Luffy gave a cheeky smile as he said, yep, I figured that in order to beat a desert, I needed to be animals that do so on a daily basis, as long as I'm in forms that can't be hurt as bad by sand. He continued as he quickly shifted his forms until he was in the form of a man-sized thorny devil, the lizard boy coating his body in multiple protective spikes. He then jumped up into the air to avoid another attack from Crocodile. That's been my plan from the beginning, Luffy declared as he still hung in the air, ripping the barrel right off his back and threw it, trying to get him wet. Of course your plan was obvious, Crocodile shouted out, his hand calling the wind, sables. Both Luffy and the barrel were knocked right in the air, spinning around in the twister so that he was all turned around and dizzy by the time that he was able to get his senses together to figure out where he was. Luffy was dangerously close to being knocked right over the ledge, but managed, not only to land safely on the wall, but to also recover the barrel. Crocodile laughed mockingly. You're struggling so hard, Straw Hat Luffy. Even with desert animal abilities, you can't do anything at all without that barrel of yours, can you? He demanded smugly. This isn't any different from my first fight against you after all. Luffy was standing up, holding the barrel as he nodded. Yeah, you're right Crocodile, he said as he seemed to get a strange look in his eyes. It isn't any different like this, Luffy went on and suddenly, he ripped off the very top of the barrel and began pouring the entire thing over himself. Crocodile could only stare as the ridged scales along Luffy's body soaked up water like a sponge. The water then traveled into his mouth and he swallowed the entire thing. Luffy's stomach was now full of water so that he looked like a melon. How about this? Luffy yelled confidently as he slammed the barrel onto the ground so that the almost empty barrel shattered. Now I'm not the same as I was, huh? You gotta be kidding me, Crocodile yelled at him. Water Luffy declared, patting his belly. But then, the wound that Crocodile gave Luffy before, opened enough so that water came out of his front and back. Oh no, he screamed out in panic, a leak. Though the leak was stopped, he seemed to be fighting back a burp, and the water spilling from his mouth. With a great swallow he said, guess I shouldn't have drunk that much water. Robin lost it completely and burst out laughing here, but Crocodile seemed to lose all tolerance as he turned and bellowed at Luffy, stop your messing around, you brat. Crocodile was now attacking in blind anger. He formed a kind of dust storm where his legs had been and began flying at him, but Luffy pumped up water from his throat and into his mouth before he spit out a giant water bubble at the charging pirate, who had skidded to a stop at once. but it was too late. He was completely soaked through by the time the water hit him. Luffy charged with his spiky scaled fists pulled back. "WHO said I was messing around," he demanded with a scream. Crocodile suddenly frozen as Luffy brought his arms directly behind him. "I'm always serious. Now let me show you. Now devils, devastation." And here he slammed his fists right in Crocodile's stomach and sent him back so hard that he was spitting up blood, the spikes ripping through the man's coat like paper. With force so great, Crocodile was sent flying back right into a large stone structure, reducing it to rubble. "How was that?" Luffy asked as he wiped his mouth. "Sand Croc." Cobra gaped at him, but Robin's face showed no emotion. That's amazing," Cobra gasped. "He beat Crocodile. That kid is weird, but incredible." "There's no time now for all this admiration," Robin said, the laughter now completely gone and now all business. "We have other things to do." She then used her powers to grow arms on the wall and bluntly pull out the spokes that held him there. He screamed in pain as he fell to his knees, blood dripping from his arms as she told him to get up and that he was going to show her the way to the poneglyph. "What are you planning to do?" Cobra demanded back as he struggled to get up. "How could looking it possibly help you?" Rather than answer his question, she had another arm grown from his back and hold him down as he gasped in pain. "Just stop asking questions," she said in a dull tone, restraining him. "All you have to do is show me where it is." Robin must have felt Luffy's eyes on her as she turned and looked back up to see that he was staring at her with a blank face. The two shared a long hard look at the other, as if reaching some sort of understanding. "Your luck's beginning to run out," she finally said to Luffy. "You certainly did try, but there's not much time left." There was a bang from the rubble and Crocodile was up on his feet. He glared at Robin and ordered, "You should get going now, Nico Robin, unless you want to be dried up along with this brat. Go now, I'm done with playing games." Cobra's eyes widened at Robin's name. Robin, however, didn't seem concerned at the threat. After a few seconds of silence, she nodded her head once and did what he said as she took Cobra with her and left, which left only Luffy and Crocodile in a stare down. Crocodile put his hand to the ground. "Listen up, Straw Hat. I'm gonna destroy every last rock on this ground," Crocodile stated, his face looking dangerously sinister, "and you along with them. Not even the sturdiest of desert animals can stand up to this." Luffy gave a sharp intact of breath at what he saw. Crocodile was sucking the very life out of the ground. Luffy yelled in shock as the palm trees crumbled away to dust. "Ground SEKKO," Crocodile shouted as everything collapsed and died, turning to sand and cracking apart as Luffy jumped back away, but there was a large ravine that opened up beneath his feet and he fell, just barely holding on. Luffy was hanging upside down, his feet stretched across the gorge, like doing the crazy version of the splits. Luffy pumped more water into his throat and shot several more bubbles of water at him, but Crocodile stopped his progress of drying the ground long enough to dry the bubbles instantly as soon as they touched. His hand sucked it up. Luffy cried out, his eyes wide. "You actually thought you could kill my powers, didn't you, Water Luffy?" Crocodile asked almost in a mocking, sarcastic way as Luffy was able to pull himself back up. "That was a very foolish mistake to make. The true power of sand is drying things out," he finished as he put his hand back to the ground. "My right hand can suck out the life out of anything by turning it to dust." And once again the ground's once green lawn had turned to sand, the stone around them was crumbling away to dust. Its power is limitless. He wasn't exaggerating. Luffy exclaimed in shock as the statue of the jackal, next to the front doors fell. "Even the statues are crumbling." The statue fell and crumbled away to nothing as he stepped back, staring around in horror. Everything is just dying. He suddenly cried out in pain as he held up a foot to see that even some of his scales had disintegrated to powder. Crocodile was smiling, his face overshadowed with insanity. "Everything connected to the ground is done for, including you." Luffy's eyes widened and he was actually shaking. "Ground death," Crocodile yelled in a dark voice that seemed to echo around them. Everything exploded around them and turned to sand, the ground shaking as if in an earthquake. Luffy grabbed his hat and went running for the doors of the palace. There wasn't anything left of the place, that was now no different than the desert they had spent days marching across. Luffy, going into the form of a desert toad, had jumped up to hang onto the palace wall above them, hanging there out of harm's way and overlooking everything. Luffy was now trying to pull himself back up, struggling a little with his still budging, water-filled belly. But then he gave a cry of shock as he looked up to see that Crocodile was now on top of the building, grinning evilly, as he grabbed Luffy by his neck. Struggling to get free, Luffy fought to pull Crocodile's hand off him. "I'm quite tired of wasting my time with you," Crocodile said, looking a great deal like how he was dangling Vivi over the edge before. With one last-ditch effort to escape, Luffy shot several more water bubbles up at him, but all Crocodile had to do was move his head so that the water shot past him, hovering in the air far above their heads. "It's far too late." "Missed me," Crocodile said softly as he slowly dried Luffy. Luffy was gasping in pain as his body, not nearly as adaptable as his scorpion's form, slowly began to dry up and mummify. Luffy turned back to his human form in an attempt to access one of his more adaptable forms, but the process only sped up more before he could. The straw hat fell from Luffy's withered hand, blowing away on the wind like a kite down towards the fighting below them as his body dried and withered so that he looked as if he was made of paper. "You have lost to me, 2 times now, Straw Hat Luffy," Crocodile laughed, his face full of sick humor as he held him up by his neck, standing over the edge as Luffy's feeble body gasped there weakly. "This is a good way to die." His vision was slipping in and out of focus once again as Crocodile's voice went on. "Within 6 minutes, this yard will be blown up along with the square. I'd stay, but I'm in a hurry." He then let go of Luffy's body, which was fluttering to the ground like an old newspaper would in the wind before he landing on the sand below, not moving. "You just wait right there, okay? And then you can celebrate the new king of the sand country." And with one final grin, Crocodile left the palace in a stream of sand and headed west. A shadow passed above him and he looked up. The water bubbles that he shot before were falling hard and fast like giant water fell right on top of him, and his dried body soaked it up like a sponge. With a shuddering gasp, Luffy sat upright, gasping that he thought for sure that he was going to die. "That creep, he took off," Luffy growled, getting viciously to his feet and glaring in the direction that Crocodile took off in. "I think he flew off in the direction," he growled to himself, gritting his teeth together and declaring, "He won't get away with this." Luffy forced his wounded body to get up and gave chase, not stopping as he kept running as fast as he could. He ran through the chaos in the streets, Luffy ignoring them all as he just kept going straight west. Luffy ducked underneath a rebel who spotted him and just kept going, dodging a few swords that were aimed for him as the royals attacked on the other side. Luffy tried to sniff the man out, but there was so much smoke and the smell of blood in the air that Luffy couldn't pinpoint Crocodile's scent. On the ground ahead was a familiar young woman, looking as though she was in the wrong end of a fight. She wasn't the only one, but there was also about 3 dozen unconscious marines behind her, each one looking as if they had been choked out. Grasping her sword, Tashigi looked up when she sensed that she wasn't alone anymore. Crocodile, Luffy snapped at her. Startled, she held up the sword and pointed it at him, Straw Hat. It was rather tense as Luffy demanded to know where Crocodile went. She stared at him long and hard, as if trying to figure out any trace of betrayal here. The war around them was getting louder and the battle was becoming more bloodthirsty as Luffy lost his patience and yelled out, "Tell me right now, which way did he go?" Tashigi seemed to be struggling within herself for a moment, wondering what she should do. Finally, she let the sword fall from her hand and slowly pointed down a pathway. Towards the temple, she said softly, "That way." "That direction," he repeated, looking down the road, "Thank you." And he ran off without a glance back. He headed even farther west. The farther that they ran, the sounds of the fighting seemed to become less and soon they came to a large temple on the far side of the city. It truly was a grand thing, looking hundreds of years old and full of decorative writings and elaborate statues. He was staggering as he ran, his hand over the wound that Crocodile gave him, and they saw that it had opened up again. Luffy finally fell and went running right against a wall of a building, sliding down it and leaving blood splattered where he fell. Luffy was still struggling to get back to running, but the area around him was blacking out and blurry so that he couldn't see straight anymore. Luffy was losing the fight to stay awake, muttering to himself that he should lie down for a moment, but his body answered that for him and he collapsed on the grass just outside the temple and he blacked out. The battle was still waging on in the distance. Luffy was awake and had pushed himself into a sitting position. "Ah, I slept good," he said to himself, a hand on his head as if to touch his hat. "Wait," he said as if trying to remember what was going on. "That's right, I couldn't move all of a sudden. So I decided to risk it and take a nap right here since there was really no other choice. Yeah, and I feel better now." So, Luffy finished as he punched his fist into his hand and he got right back up to his feet as if nothing interrupted him and charged ahead. "Alright, now it's time for me to beat up Crocodile." He turned and went running once again, running through the place, and looking ready to head right into the temple when he noticed something. Just outside the temple there was a set of stairs heading deep into the earth. Muttering to himself quietly as he made a 180 and bolted straight for the darkness. It was a long set of stairs that seemed to head into the bowels of the earth, yet still he ran, but as he did the entire place seemed to be falling apart. Small bits of rock was falling on top of them and the entrance behind them seemed to have caved in. He finally reached the bottom of the stairs and saw that the room was in shambles, and only continuing to collapse around him. Pillars and pieces of the ceiling were in front of him, blocking the way. Using his powers, Luffy was able to jump and swing through it all, still searching for Crocodile. But just as Luffy was looking ready to scream out in frustration, he heard it. Crocodile's insane laughter was coming from behind one of the stone walls. Grinning, Luffy yelled out, "Found you," and then went punching right through the wall. He was in the large room, looking just as messed up as the rest of the tomb. He could see the poneglyph, a large stone tablet with strange writing on it, standing tall. Through the smoke of the destroyed wall, Luffy stepped through, looking more tired than ever and covered in blood. But there was a fierce determination set on his face as he stepped through the hole in the wall, glaring at Crocodile. Crocodile was staring at him in shock, not believing what he was seeing. There was no longer any smugness, boredom, disappointment, or even confidence on his face. For the first time since Rainbase when he discovered that Luffy was still alive, there was real fear here. But his stunned expression was quickly replaced however by anger. "So it's you," he yelled, and now he truly sounded infuriated here. "You can't get away," Luffy yelled fiercely, "you're mine." "How are you still alive?" Crocodile demanded loudly, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "No matter how many times I kill you, you just keep coming back for more. Well, answer me, brat. How'd you live and come here?" croaked a voice and they finally looked around to see that Cobra was there as well, leaning up against the wall and staring at Luffy like he was a ghost. "Who is this boy?" Robin was lying face forward on the floor, a deep wound in her own chest, much like the one that Luffy had before, though maybe not as serious as his had been. Groaning a little she looked up, her glassy eyes spotting Luffy. "It's Straw Hat." "Tell me, just how many times do you have to die?" Crocodile demanded, holding up his hook threateningly. "There's something you still need to return, Crocodile," Luffy declared at once, surprising them by how calm he sounded here, "and I came here to get it back." Crocodile looked just as confused and asked, with a rather hysterical laugh, "What is this thing I took?" He held up his hand. "Is it money?" He held up his hook. "Is it fame? Or people's trust? Their lives? Is it rain?" He laughed louder than ever, truly sounding insane, but loving every moment of it as he admitted for them all to hear. "I have taken all those things, so which is it you want me to give back, Straw Hat?" Stepping forward, Luffy answered only 2 words, "This country." "The country? Really, you should know better than that right now. I have no intention of giving up this country." Crocodile laughed. "Why would I when I'm going to become its next king before long?" Crocodile finished. Luffy's eyes narrowed dangerously. They could all feel the hatred in his tone despite the fact that he was still calm. "We came here to this island to save Vivi's country. But then, when we got here it was gone," he answered slowly, as if remembering something painful before he finally yelled, pointing an accusing finger at him, "You stole her country." Crocodile only scowled at him as Luffy shouted out, "This is her country and I'm here to get it back from you. I will defeat you and take this country out of your evil hands." His eyes became enraged once again as he screamed out loudly, and then, "Vivi will SMLIE again." Once the shock had worn off, Crocodile seemed to realize this fact as well. "Threaten me as much as you like," he smirked as he held up his hook, "but without any water, you're nothing." Ignoring his words, Luffy charged once again, not even bothering to take on a different form, but to their amazement, when he kicked Crocodile right in the face, he didn't turn to sand and was sent back so hard that his head went smashing right into the wall. Just then, Crocodile slowly sat up and glared at Luffy, his expression holding nothing but shock before his eyes widened. Luffy looked ready for the next round as he cracked his knuckles. Then he gave a loud yell as he threw his arm back and slammed his fist so hard into Crocodile's face that he was sent flying black into the wall once again, bleeding heavily. Slowly sitting back up, he asked with his voice shaking with anger, "I see, you're using your blood?" Luffy's fists were, indeed, covered with blood. Clever, Crocodile admitted. "Blood can harden sand too, can't it?" Luffy said neutrally, holding up a bloody fist. Crocodile forced himself back to his feet. First Rainbase, and then the Royal Palace, he laughed madly, and now, this underground temple. Luffy just looked on at him, wondering just what he was trying to say here. "You should be rewarded for your insistence on challenging me," Crocodile went on. "Even though I put you through the ringer twice now, you keep coming back." Luffy went for another attack while taking on his Chimera form, forcing Crocodile to jump out of the way so that Luffy went slamming through the wall this time. Crocodile reached for his hook and pulled off the golden part to reveal that there was another hook just underneath it. Only this one seemed to be made of iron and was embedded with large holes with a slight pink haze drifting from it. "You're a pirate, Straw Hat," Crocodile declared, and Luffy's eyes widened a little in confusion when he saw that. "You certainly proven that with your determination to defeat me no matter the cost." He stood back up, "And I'll admit that you've become an annoying persistent opponent during our 3 encounters." Luffy stared at the hook before he asked, "Alright, what's that?" "A poisonous hook," Crocodile stated as he held up his weapon and let the golden hook covering fall. "I see," Luffy said simply, and clearly not caring. "You seem to be a confident pirate, I suppose, so surely you must understand," Crocodile said, frowning heavily, "that a duel between pirates is always about 2 people fighting for survival, and when that's the case, there's no such thing as playing dirty." Luffy turned into a battle position just as a giant boulder blocked their way out behind them. There was no chance of escaping now. "When the explosion happens in the square, this place will most likely crumble to dust," Crocodile informed him. "This will be our final battle. Let's settle this once and for all." And so it began. The two were at each other's throats, no longer caring what happened to themselves, focusing only on beating the other. Luffy was able to keep up with Crocodile at first despite his injuries. Luffy took several blows from the hook but didn't even slow down. You wouldn't think the poison was so powerful that when Crocodile slapped it into the rock, missing Luffy by inches, the rock began to melt and bubble as if someone spilled acid all over it. It was fortunate for Luffy that his Chimera body, which produced the venom of several different animals at once, allowed him to ignore the effects of the poison for now. Crocodile was showing incredible vitality too. Even though his ability to turn to sand was pretty much rendered useless by Luffy's blood, and the blows the Chimera was raining on him could easily break the bones of weaker men, still he fought on. Unfortunately for Luffy, the damage he took from the previous 2 battles were starting to take their toll as he began to start breathing heavily and slowing down, taking more blows in the process. However, Luffy kept going, even with the tomb collapsing around them, the two dealing each other powerful blows, but neither one would stay down. "You were skewered, buried alive and dried up," Crocodile cried out. "You many have made it through all that, but you won't escape this time, Straw Hat." He then smirked as he held up his hook which hissed poison. "There's no hope for survival. The game is up. This poison will spread through you soon." "You know, Crocodile," Luffy said, holding up his fists, "you just don't understand." Crocodile blinked at that before his expression was contorted with anger. "What is it that you're saying?" he demanded, sounding angrier than ever. "What is it that you think I do not understand, Straw Hat?" Luffy didn't answer as he charged once again, but even as he threw a punch, again Crocodile dodged it, but he wasn't stopping. Again and again, he attacked, but Crocodile was too quick. Luffy then tried to use his flame breath, however his moves had become so sluggish that it was easy for Crocodile to avoid the searing flames. "I don't think you understand," Crocodile declared. "You're going to die here very soon. The poison from my hook has entered your wound." Luffy stumbling around, looking barely able to stand up, but silently smirked to himself. "Your body is probably becoming numb right now," Crocodile asked almost like a taunt. "It doesn't matter whether you win or lose this fight, your body will still be buried underneath the rubble when this tomb collapses. Whatever it is you really want can't be in this country," Crocodile said as he stared down at Luffy, looking completely deranged. "Aren't I right? You're fighting for somebody else's goal now, and how can there be any point in dying for that? If only you would just get rid of a friend or two, you could easily avoid so many of these inconvenient problems. Loyalty is only for idiots and weaklings." "Like I said, you really don't understand anything, do you?" Luffy growled as he glared at Crocodile through slit and bloodshot eyes as he still struggled to get back to his feet. Vivi is always telling people not to risk their lives, but she's the first to lay down her life to save others. If we don't help her, she'll die. You'll kill her." "You still don't get it," Crocodile yelled in frustration. "That's what makes her such a burden, so why not ditch the princess and save yourself?" Luffy looked up, his face now full of rage as he cried out as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, "Because none of us want Vivi to die. Helping each other is what friends do." Behind him, Cobra was staring at him in amazement as Luffy was finally able to push himself back up to his feet. "And that's why none of us will leave her behind or quit fighting you. As long as she doesn't give up on her country, neither will we." Crocodile just looked at him, his face not showing any emotion as he asked, "Even if that means all the rest of you end up dead?" "If we die then we die," Luffy told him fiercely. "That's all there is to it." Just then, Luffy's legs gave out again, and he fell back to the floor. There was a slight pause before Crocodile began to chuckle to himself, as if he couldn't remember ever hearing anything so stupid in his life. "You can talk as tough all that you want and keep blubbering on about friendship if you like, but your body is still freezing up on you," Crocodile said, suddenly confident once again. "You look pathetic, Straw Hat Luffy." As Luffy tried in vain to push himself back up, his vision was so foggy that it was getting impossible to make out anything. Crocodile then taunted Cobra about the bomb. "A time bomb?" Cobra cried in panic. "No, I've been very well prepared, Cobra," he said silkily. "You have to be willing to admit that much surely." He then bragged about how he had it all planned out. Even if the others had been able to find the bomb and took out the 2 agents who were going to fire it, he had it set up so that it would still go off after a certain length of time. But before he could go on, the ground was shaking worse than ever, as if there were a crowd of giants walking around above them, which could only mean one thing. Cobra leaned back, gritting his teeth, and seemed to be fighting the urge to cry here. The building was falling apart faster than ever. The bomb had gone off. Crocodile laughed out triumphantly. At last, my time has finally arrived. The day my grand ambition is realized, Alabasta now belongs to me. Luffy finally stood up again. His body was shaking, but he glared fiercely as a fire seemed to be burning inside him. His vision seemed to clear as he faced Crocodile once again, and this they knew was going to be it. Crocodile glanced behind him and seemed to be completely stunned at seeing him up when he thought he was down for the count. Cobra was also staring at him in shock as the ceiling above them was now cracking apart and falling in large chunks. You can't, Luffy gasped out and Crocodile's eyes widened. Defeat me, Luffy finished as he stood tall, looking every bit as the king of beasts that he was. Crocodile glared at him before he gave a wild grin. You finally managed to speak and that's all you can come up with. He headed back to him as he said, I suppose it's an acceptable bluff from a loser who's about to die. Of course, like any bluff, it's empty air. But Luffy was far from bluffing as he declared loudly without a shred of hesitation, except, I'm the man, who'll be king of the pirates. Listen up, you stupid brat, if you really knew anything about this sea, you wouldn't make such an idiotic statement. He said held up his hook, I told you before. There are thousands of rookies just like you. Every one of them chasing their naive little dreams. And suddenly, it was as if he snapped as he ran ahead, his hook held high as he screamed out wildly, the sooner you understand the true level of the Grand Line, the sooner you'll give up on your foolish dreams. But Luffy not only dodged the hook, he brought his hooked foot down onto his arm and slammed the hook down so hard that it snapped right off as if it was glass. Crocodile gasped at what just happened. I'm the one, who's gonna beat you. Luffy hissed so dangerously that they were all taken aback by such a tone. But Crocodile didn't have time to register that, for Luffy stretched his arm back and slammed it so hard into Crocodile's stomach that blood erupted from his mouth. But Luffy didn't let up as he used his foot to kick him hard in the head, sending him flying once again before he pummeled him right into the cracking floor. It had suddenly turned into a beatdown. Luffy then grabbed him by the front of his shirt and pulled him around, swinging him like a lasso and slamming him into the wall behind him. Now it was Crocodile who was finding it impossible to stand up. Through the rubble, he stared back at Luffy, looking completely lost to what was going on. Luffy was looking back, his face now deadly. There was no trace of the captain that the Straw Hats knew in those cold eyes. Crocodile was now getting desperate as he caused the blade of a dagger to come up from where the hook was broken off. It was as if he snapped and he was back up, refusing to let his plan of 3 years be ruined by a single pirate. You're just a two-bit nobody who comes from who knows where, Crocodile screamed in rage as he charged now, trying to lob off his head. You can't beat me. Do you have any idea who I am? I don't care who you are, cause it doesn't matter, Luffy declared as Crocodile's eyes widened when he realized that he left himself wide open. Luffy looked up and then he screamed at the top of his lungs, whoever you are, I will beat you. And with those words, he finally kicked him so hard that he was sent flying up into the air, but before he hit the ceiling, Crocodile pulled himself back together as he hovered there, seemingly effortlessly, as he stated that he was going to destroy him along with the tomb. He raised his hand and gathered a swirling mass of extremely dense sand in his hand, before he hurled it at Luffy, causing a massive shockwave when it hit the ground. Everything near them was reduced to dust, but Luffy was able to move out of the path of destruction as the tomb was crumbling. Robin still lay there, blood seeping around her, but was now in danger of falling debris. Luffy seemed to realize this, for he jumped over and grabbed her roughly just as a boulder came falling down, narrowly missing them both. He set her aside against some random wall and turned to look back up at Crocodile as they sighed in relief. Stretching out his bat-like wings, Luffy shot up to the ceiling with such force that there was a small crater left where he stood. He flew right towards the warlord, both reptilian fists pulled back and his face set in a bestial snarl. Like a rocket he shot towards Crocodile, pulling his fist back he began, Chimeras. Just as Crocodile held up his own fist, Desert. Rampage. Luffy screamed, throwing a punch. La Spada, Crocodile screamed as he formed several solid blades with fan-shaped edges from sand, flying down towards them. It was all or nothing here. Luffy's fist collided with Crocodile's attack, and the force behind him was so great that he shattered the axes right back into sand, and like a wild animal, he began to pummel Crocodile with what looked like hundreds of punches at once. Luffy didn't seem to care where they hit or even if they hit at all, but he was going to keep going no matter what happened. Crashing right into the ceiling, Crocodile was held there as Luffy kept going, hitting every part of Crocodile that he could. It was merciless, and the force from his attacks was breaking right through, sending Crocodile up and through the stone. Though it was only a matter of seconds, the attack seemed to go on forever as the roof above them cracked. But finally, he broke through, like a volcano erupting. Crocodile was forced right up through the rock, and into the air, leaving a trail of sand behind him as bright sunlight came pouring through the hole. Luffy punched the air in victory. Amazing, croaked Cobra, who was now gapping up at the hole. He punched him straight up through the bedrock beneath the city. Now completely out of energy, Luffy fell back to the ground, landing so hard that he cracked the floor underneath him. He was barely breathing and his body seemed to be going back into shock as it once more shrank back into his human form. Hey, Cobra cried, pushing himself up and slowly crawling over to Luffy's wounded body and knelt beside him. Are you alright? But as he looked to the bright light above him he whispered, I thank you. He no longer looked afraid or sad, his face oddly peaceful, and they realized that here he no longer cared what happened to him. Even if he died here, he could die happily knowing that the real threat was gone. Despite how badly hurt he was, Luffy was grinning at him, no sweat. But then they heard a light clack on the floor and they looked to see that Robin had pulled out a small red bottle from her coat and rolled it over to Cobra. Use that, immediately, she told him as he looked down at it. When he didn't take it at once she clarified, it can neutralize the poison from Crocodile's hook. Cobra gave her a suspicious look as she went on. Even if he was buried underneath all this rubble, there's a chance he might survive since he has the strength of the entire animal kingdom at his disposal. Still looking like he wasn't sure he could trust her, he took the bottle and uncorked it. But Cobra was looking back at Robin, and said, You looked me straight in the eye and told me the only thing written here was history. Why did you lie to me? Blood was dripping from both sides of her mouth as she looked away, looking sad. You knew? She asked grimly. How cruel. The truth is, this country's history isn't written anywhere in there, Cobra explained, though it was clear from his tone that he already knew that she knew that. Instead, it has everything about the weapon you wanted to get your hands on. The description, location, it doesn't make any sense. Cobra lifted Luffy's head and gently poured the cure into his open mouth. At once his vision seemed to clear and his breathing let up, though his face was now red from a growing fever. If you had told Crocodile this information, this country would now be his for the taking, isn't that right? Robin looked exhausted as she leaned back against the wall. I'm not interested, she confessed and shut her eyes. Whether people in this country live or die, it really makes no difference to me. I had already decided from the start not to give Crocodile the weapon. I don't understand, Cobra said as he placed Luffy back on the stone floor and kept looking at her with curiosity. Then why did you come here? There was a tense pause as the walls buckled around them. I don't even know anymore, she confessed as she opened her eyes. Chasing a dream, I suppose, an empty dream. The last remaining poneglyph in the world that still carries the true history, the Rio poneglyph. What do you mean by the true history? Cobra questioned, not understanding it. Nothing, Robin sighed, looking as if she no longer cared. It doesn't matter now. For 20 years I've searched and I've never had a better lead than this. This is my last hope, and it didn't work out. The final beams that were holding the ceiling up buckled. They had perhaps less than a minute left before it finally crumbled. So if I'm going to die here, it's the perfect time. I'm tired of this fool's crusade. It's over. A large boulder fell and smoke filled the room, but when it cleared, they could see a smile on Robin's face, but it wasn't a happy smile. All I wanted was to learn our true history. Tears appeared and slowly began to fall from her face, and to share it with the whole world. So then, you're saying that it's possible that our lost history can be recovered, Cobra said, his eyes wide, and the poneglyph are the key to unlocking these records? Robin said nothing, but kept that same grim smile, and Cobra stared at her. You mean, all this time? But neither one said anything else on the matter because Luffy had gotten back to his feet, though he was covered in blood, sweat, and dirt, his face now showing clear signs of a high fever. He was standing upright. He picked up Cobra under his arm like how he carried Sanji back at Drum, before he went to Robin and threw her over his shoulder. "'Kay, let's go," Luffy declared, looking up to the hole he made in the ceiling, knowing that it was now their only way out. "Hold on," she cried, now sounding angry, looking like she wanted to fight, but no longer had the energy to do so. "I no longer have a reason to live, just leave me here." Luffy hardly glanced at her before he looked back to the hole. "You're coming with me, do what you want once we're out of here." Robin just stared at him, unable to believe what he was doing. He didn't owe her anything, was second in command to Crocodile, but here he was, saving her. She seemed to lose all will to move as she allowed him to do what he wanted. Using up whatever strength he had left, he was able to jump up the falling stones just as it caved in, burying everything below them. He managed to get up and through the exit, but instead of the bright sunlight they expected, there were thick storm clouds and heavy rain. Luffy landed safely on the ground and dropped Cobra and Robin. He skidded a little and fell, landing on his face and no longer able to move. "The rain," Cobra gasped as he looked up at the sky. "It's come back." Cobra was actually began to cry as he held his shaking hands out to catch the cold rain. It was clear that he truly thought that he was going to die in that tomb, but not only was he alive, but the war was over now. Luffy smiled a little before the blacked out at once. When he awoke, he was in a large room that was filled with several beds with most of the Straw Hats and Vivi. Luffy was sitting up in a large yawn and was laughing out loud. "Oh man, I slept good," he cried out, clearly feeling good, but when Luffy put his hand on his head he realized that his hat was missing and began looking around for it and his breakfast. "You just woke up and you're already causing a racket," Sanji said, leaning back in a chair as he watched. "And it won't be breakfast, it'll be dinner, it's evening." Standing next to him was Usopp, who then pointed to a table, letting Luffy know that a solitaire found it in front of the palace. Luffy stretched out to grab it and looked happily at it before he put it on his head. "We never would have heard the end of that if we never found the hat," Zoro stated. "I'm so relieved you finally got well, Luffy," Vivi said in relief. He looked at her in surprise. "Got well? What do you mean? I was never not well." Nami spoke up from one of the other beds as she stacked some books up, telling him how bad a shape he was in and how he could thank Vivi and Chopper for taking care of him. "Really?" Luffy said, looking from Chopper to Vivi. "Thanks you guys." Just then, the door opened and Zoro came in, also looking almost completely healed from his fight with Mr. One. "Oh, Luffy," he said, pleasantly surprised, "you woke up." Luffy held up a hand in greeting. "Zoro, long time no see," but then he blinked at his words. "Wait a minute." As he thought his words over, Zoro was getting a drink of water as Chopper yelled at him about him going out to train. And soon it was the same old fight. Chopper yelled at him about taking his bandages off and Zoro complained how impossible it was to move with them on, and Chopper would scream that was the whole point. "Long time no see," Luffy's voice said, moving his head side to side. "Why'd I say that?" "Probably because it has been long," Usopp said from the couch near the door. "You've been asleep for 3 entire days." 3 days? 3 whole days? Luffy cried out. He thought it over for a moment. "I missed 15 meals. Nami snapped that he sure could calculate when it came to food. "By his count that's like 5 meals a day." Usopp laughed as a door opened and a woman who looked suspiciously like Igaram came in, bearing a whole cart of food. Luffy was able to swallow all the food in the cart faster than blinking, and Zoro and Sanji began yelling at him for that. After that they had this great feast that included everyone, even the miraculously alive Igaram and his wife, and took long, hot baths, and said farewell to this kingdom of the sand. There was darkness behind the windows, revealing night. Vivi and all the Straw Hats were there and seemed to be discussing what they were supposed to do now. "Tonight?" Usopp asked in surprise. "Yep," Nami nodded firmly. "We have to leave?" Chopper asked, sounding disappointed. "The Marines know we're here," Zoro said. "More will be coming." "I agree with Nami. We need to get out." Everyone in the crew slowly agreeing as well, with Luffy saying that they should stay for a little more food. The Straw Hats gave him a quick bonk on the head and he nodded at once just as there was a knock on the door and a guard came in. He was holding a transponder snail on a tray and telling them all that they had a call. From who? Nami asked in surprise. The guard answered that he called himself Bon. The Straw Hats didn't seem to know who he was talking about. That's strange, the guard said. He insists that you're all good friends. Sanji got up. Friends with us? He repeated before he picked up the receiver and heard the familiar voice on the other end. Hello? Hey old friends. It's me. The voice of Bon Clay cackled. Bet you never thought you'd hear from me again? With a frozen look on his face, Sanji hung up, but the phone just rang loudly again. You freak, Sanji yelled at the snail phone, shut up. But Luffy reached out to grab it so that he could talk to him. So you escaped Mr. 2. What do you want? He asked. Straw Hat, Bon Clay's voice said. I'd recognize that voice anywhere. You're right, I escaped, and I intend to keep it that way, so don't call me Mr. 2. If the Marines intercept this call they'll be able to ascertain the locations of both me and you. Thanks a lot you jerk, Chopper yelled. Tell us what you want, Zoro yelled. Oh, it's not what I want, it's what I have, Bon Clay answered. Your ship. Stop joking. Everyone but Vivi screamed out. I'm going to kick your butt for saying that, Usopp yelled threateningly. Where are you? On your ship the Going Merry, he answered a little mockingly. I should have kicked him harder, Sanji yelled, holding up a fist. Hey, calm down, Bon Clay said. Please, I mean, we're friends right? Right, and he hung up not long after that after he told them where they could find him and left with a long laugh. The Straw Hats were all looking at each other, wondering what to do. He's at the upper part of the Sandora River, Luffy finished speaking as Sanji asked if they could trust him. We did become friends that one time, Luffy answered back, but that was before we knew that he was part of Baroque Works, Zoro said loudly. I guess, Chopper said slowly, we have no choice. You're right, Sanji agreed with him, he has our ship. If he tries to trick us, I'll be more than happy to kick the crap out of him again. Once that was decided, they were all got up and began packing up their things, getting ready to sneak away into the night. They were so busy with thoughts about getting their ship back, they didn't even realize that Vivi hadn't said a word as she watched them. Hey, you guys, she asked softly and they all looked to her. She looked to be shaking as she confessed that she didn't know what to do now. The Straw Hats all glanced at each other for a moment before they sighed. No one said a word again until they finished packing and were heading to the window to leave. Vivi, Nami said to her, looking over a map, we can give you 12 hours to make a decision. We'll travel down the Sandora, after teaching Ballerina Boy why he shouldn't steal from us, and by noon tomorrow we'll draw near the eastern harbor. She looked back up to her with a smile. I doubt we'll be able to drop anchor though, if you do decide to join us, that's going to be your only time to come aboard. 12 o'clock, on the dot. Everyone was smiling at her, letting her know that no matter what she chose, it was alright by them. It's your choice. You can stay a princess, or you can become a pirate. I'm sure that being a pirate doesn't compare to being a princess, Sanji added, leaning on the windowsill as they began slipping out, but we'd sure love to have you. Luffy was all for the idea and telling her that she should come with them right now, and Usopp was telling him off as he shoved him to their exit. Why? Luffy asked confused as Zoro practically threw him out. Don't you guys want her to join us? We do, Usopp said firmly, but that's something she has to decide herself. Soon, they were standing on the edge of the river with the Mary in front of them, and a familiar face standing on the crow's nest. The Straw Hats had been riding a flock of ducks that were just as big, if not bigger than even Karoo, the supersonic duck squad. Finally, long time no see my friends, Bon Clay cried happily from his place up there. Did you guys miss little old me? Not a bit, Zoro called back as they all turned back to wave to the ducks, bidding them farewell. Even Bon Clay waved them off, but then it turned to a fight between him and Sanji, with him arguing about learning some manners on how to greet his friends. Quit saying that, you weirdo, Luffy said as they began loading the ship. We're not friends, we're enemies, you lied to us. No, I didn't, Bon Clay yelled. I just didn't admit that I was a member of Baroque Works. Bon Clay sat on the railing with a sigh and went on. Besides, none of that really matters anymore, does it? Baroque Works is done for now and that means we're no longer enemies. Well, if we're not enemies, Ballerina Guy, then why the heck did you steal our ship? Luffy demanded as Zoro snapped for Bon Clay to move out of the way so that he could get on the ship. Oh, how dumb are you? Bon Clay yelled. Bon Clay asked that if he hadn't taken the ship from where it was moored, what did they think would have happened to it? The Marines probably would have seized it, Nami answered as she knelt over one of the bags and Luffy gapped at her. Chance that probably to a definitely, honey, Bon Clay yelled. The Marines have been looking all over for you guys and your ship. Every port in the country has been blockaded, locked down. Wait, Luffy yelled, are you telling me that you took the Going Merry so that the Marines wouldn't? Usopp and Chopper were with him and both demanded the same thing, and when Bon Clay answered, he merely gave them a thumbs up and said, "'Cause you guys are my friends." Soon Bon Clay, Luffy, Usopp, and Chopper were dancing and singing together once again. Oh my friends, Bon Clay yelled. We might have had to fight on opposite sides of a war, but our friendship will survive for an eternity. Friends? Zoro asked in annoyance as they finished loading the ship. Yeah right. Tell the truth, Twinkle Toes. You and your crew don't have a chance of breaking through that blockade, but you might if you had us as allies. Bon Clay stopped in mid-dance and the three looked to him in shock. That's right, Bon Clay said dramatically, crying, you got me, but in trying times such as these we have to band together under the flag of friendship. If you believe in true friendship, say aye. The three yelled with him. Other voices cried out and Bon Clay's crew and ship seemed to appear out of nowhere. Zoro screamed at the other ship where they came from. Soon after that and they were all standing on the Mary's deck, the ship was being shot at by giant black harpoons, at least 8 ships giving chase. You jerks, shoot cannonballs, Luffy yelled at them in frustration. I can't deflect pointy things that good. I think that's the point here, Luffy, Sanji called as the harpoons pierced through the hull of the ship and they could hear Usopp and Chopper below, trying to repair the holes. Sanji called up, if we keep taking iron spears to the bottom of the ship it's only going to be a matter of time before it sinks. Crap, here they come, Nami cried out as more spears hit their sides. Hey, I can't keep plugging these holes, you guys, Chopper screamed as he came up from the bottom of the ship with a mallet and several boards of wood. Nami started yelling at the others to do something. What more can we do? It'd take all our effort to protect one side, Sanji demanded. One ship versus 8 isn't a fair fight. Zoro was growling out that they'd have a better chance of hand-to-hand combat than this. Even if they ran or stayed to fight, they weren't going to break their formation. The battle went on, and things seemed to be getting worse every second, but the strangest part was when they ran across two familiar faces on one of the Navy ships. Django and Full Body. The Black Spear Squadron, Django exclaimed proudly. It's a work of art. On the ship next to him, Full Body was laughing confidently and stuck his tongue out at the Straw Hats. It's the Black Cage Corp specialty, idiots. Hey hypnotist, I thought you were a pirate, Luffy screamed at Django. I am. Now shut up, Django yelled back quickly. My reasons are my own. Where do I know that guy from? Sanji was asking thoughtfully, looking at Full Body. Full Body declared loudly, it took a long time but I finally found him, that annoying crazy cook and his gang of wild cutthroats. Here, today, I vow to sink them. Django took out his familiar charm, about to use his abilities, but before he did, Usopp ran around to the cannon and shot a cannonball. It hit it in such a way that it fell apart and, not only sank, but crashed into Full Body's ship as well. Brother, Full Body yelled in distress as Django's ship slammed into his and they both sunk into the ocean. Luffy looked towards Usopp, who was staring completely dumbfounded the whole time. Usopp, did you do that? Luffy exclaimed in surprise. Amazing. Usopp looked to him, his face registering nothing but shock before he snapped out of it. Yes, just as I calculated, he called confidently, it was me. That's what happens to enemy ships when I'm on the job. Then why do you seem so surprised? Zoro asked in amusement as Chopper jumped up to Usopp's shoulder, telling him how cool that was. Rest easy, Chopper, he exclaimed, joyously. Captain Usopp will have everything under control. Really, Usopp? Chopper asked happily. Will you? That's so reassuring, Usopp. That was amazing, Nose-chan. Bon Clay also cheered. The ships in the south are all sunk, nothing can stop us from breaking through. Bon Clay, we've got trouble. One of his men suddenly called from his ship. When Bon Clay turned to ask what the problem was, they yelled out that it was the Black Cage. Bon Clay's face was turned to terror. Who's that? Luffy asked. Black Cage Hina. She's a marine captain and we're in her jurisdiction, Bon Clay exclaimed in fear. She's a real pain. We have to hurry up and fly the coop. Bon Clay's men all cheered on the idea of escaping, but the Straw Hats didn't move at all, even with Bon Clay yelling at them to do so as Hina's ship was drawing nearer. If you want to go, go, Luffy said to him. We can't go that way. And exactly why not? Bon Clay screamed in frustration as his own crew screamed that they should just go. Noon at the Eastern Harbor, Nami answered. We have an appointment, there's no time to go around, we'll go straight through. What? Suicide? Bon Clay yelled angrily, looking ready to leave anyway. It's ludicrous. Is there some treasure you're not telling me off that's worth throwing away your lives? He turned his back on them as he jumped to his ship. Fine, run off and die. We have to go get one of our friends, Luffy answered, and Bon Clay's face was filled with nothing but shock. Whatever answer he was expecting, it wasn't that. So, it's for your pal that you risk it all? He asked softly as silence sunk in around them. He then turned to his crew and declared, we're going to fight the Marines. His entire crew screamed in surprise as the Straw Hats stared in shock. Running now would go against everything Bon Clay stand for. The Drag Queen yelled to his crew. If we abandon allies who are risking their lives to pick up a friend, could we live with ourselves tomorrow? The crew all stared at him before they all cried out the same thing, ready to fight as Bon Clay yelled to the Straw Hats, tears in his eyes. Listen guys, Straw Hats too. What I must say is of great importance. He took on Luffy's face and his crew took disguises of the rest of the crew before they left to distract the crew, giving time to the Straw Hats to escape. It worked perfectly though, the Marines were completely distracted as they went after them, but the battle didn't last long, and only ended with the ship going down in a blaze of glory from Hina's ship. Bon Clay, Luffy cried, all of them watching the scene with horror as the ship went down. I'm gonna miss you, Bon Clay, Luffy cried. Usopp, Chopper, and even Sanji were all crying next to him as they sailed away. We will never forget you. They then heard Bon Clay's voice calling out almost like an echo, if we are to fall, let it be in the sea. The flower of friendship is rejoicing. The Mary went on east, fighting their way through the two marine ships that were blocking their way, but they managed to force their way past them and finally reached the Eastern Harbor like they were supposed to meet. However, Vivi wasn't anywhere to be seen. They waited for a few minutes before they heard her voice, apparently though a loudspeaker, addressing her country on what happened during her 2 years away from home. Vivi, Chopper said sadly as he and Luffy leaned on the rails. Forget about it, you heard the speech, Zoro snapped at the two. That was Vivi's voice without a doubt. Sanji was looking deeply disappointed as well as he added that they were broadcasting the ceremony from Lubarna. Vivi clearly made up her mind not to come here. No, I don't buy it. I say she's here, Luffy said stubbornly. This is the place we promised, right? Yes, it is, Zoro added, trying to sound patient, but also with a firm look that reminded them all of the danger they were in. Sanji looked around, letting them know that it was past noon. There's no way she wouldn't have come, Luffy said, sounding hurt. She's definitely here. Let's get out and look for her. Usopp brought them back to the matter at hand by screaming that the ships had reappeared and were coming up fast. When Zoro called how many there were, they knew that it was time to go with all 6 ships still after them. Looking like he also wanted to get out and look, Sanji told Luffy to give it up. Viv's course is on a road far different from ours. Luffy pouted, but seemed to accept it as he turned from the railing. But as he did, Vivi's voice called out behind them, but this time it wasn't from the amplifier. Everyone. They all looked and there she was, dressed just like how a princess would look and Karoo by her side. Vivi, Luffy screamed happily and everyone turned at once with smiles on their faces. Karoo. Usopp yelled joyfully and the two both waved back merrily at them. Excited, the whole crew was getting ready to turn around and go back, but they had to hurry since the Marines were right behind them, but they didn't have to bother. I came to say goodbye. Vivi yelled, and the smiles were wiped off their faces in confusion. What, she say? Luffy began to ask, not understanding what was going on. Sorry, but I can't go with you, Vivi said as she spoke through the speaker once again. Thank you so much for everything. I'd like to go on more adventures, but I can't ignore the needs of my country, which I love more than anything. I have to stay, I hope you understand. Luffy still seemed stunned, but got over it as he smiled an accepting smile. I see, he said brightly. Thank you, Vivi cried out, now starting to sob and tears were forming in her eyes. When she spoke again, she was trying to hold back the cries so hard that she was starting to stutter. I will remain here and fulfill my duty. If we ever meet again, no matter how much times pass, will you still call me your friend? Luffy didn't even have to think that over as he started shouting back to her, but Nami cut him off by covering his mouth and telling him not to answer. The Marines now know about Vivi and us, she told him. If they can prove she has a connection to us, it's all over, she'll be considered a criminal. Luffy frowned at her, but unable to think of a way to counter that argument. They all turned their backs on her and Karoo. Turn away, Nami said firmly, leaving no room for argument, not another word. They did as she told them, but they didn't leave without giving Vivi an answer. The Straw Hats here, all wordlessly took off the wrappings that they still had on their arms and held them up so that Vivi could see the X's still on their arms. Though no words were said, the message was clear. Vivi also held up her own arm with Karoo, both wearing the same X mark. Whether they liked it or not, they would always be honorary Straw Hats, and no matter how much time had passed, they looked forward to the day they met again. Chapter 16. They were all on the Mary's deck once again, the ship still bearing the fresh scars of the battle with the Marines, and Zoro was leaning over the side of the ship to look behind him. Looks like the Marines have stopped following us, he called, before he heard several loud groans behind them, as if the fact that they were now out of danger was a bad thing. That's good news. We shook them off, he added as he glared at them, but the rest of the crew only groaned a little louder before the swordsman spotted them. All other 5 members of the crew were all lying down on the upper deck with their heads through the railing, looking close to tears with big, sad puppy dog eyes looking behind them. Stop it, Zoro snapped at them, what's with the pathetic groans? I miss her, they all cried out together, and it didn't take long at all for him to know who they were talking about. Irritated, Zoro started telling them to stop whining. If you wanted her to join that bad, then you shouldn't have let her leave, he told them, and that got them all gasping. Aw, you savage, Chopper gasped, as if he couldn't believe he heard Zoro say something like that. Blockhead, Nami agreed as Sanji then added, idiot. Luffy tried his hand at insulting him, but it sounded pathetic, and Usopp began telling him off for that as Zoro turned away from them, as if he couldn't believe he was dealing with this. We didn't, did we? Zoro demanded, already sick of this whole thing, now shut up about it. The group ignored that and continued with their pouting. Suddenly, Luffy caught a whiff of something, or someone, he'd smelled before, but for the life of him couldn't place the scent as it was all muddled thanks to the craziness that occurred on deck just recently. Just then the galley door opened up and a familiar voice cooed from inside, looks like we finally escaped the firing squad. Zoro barely registered the voice until Robin stepped out and said, excellent work. She looked greatly different than the Robin they had seen up to that point. She was dressed much more casual and modestly than she had before. A simple light purple shirt with darker pants. She smiled confidently at them as Zoro looked and finally realized who he was talking to. As soon as they saw her, the other 5 above them got up so fast that they banged their heads on the railing above them. Zoro's hand went directly to his sword as he yelled out, here to avenge your friends, just try it. It's an enemy attack, Usopp screamed out fearfully. What are you doing here? Nami demanded as she held onto the swollen bump on her head before she took her new weapon out, ready to protect herself. It was really quite funny to watch them all freak out at the sight of Robin, who just stood there and watched. Usopp was yelling fearfully over a speaker as Chopper ran around in a panic. It was very tense as they finally calmed down enough to have her surrounded on all sides, looking ready to fight her if she so much as moved wrong. Chopper was asking who she was. I don't know, Sanji gasped happily, his eyes turning into little hearts like how it had been when he first met Nami, but she's so beautiful. Robin, meanwhile, was walking past them all without even giving them a glance of concern. She went over to a lawn chair that was underneath the stairs before she disarmed Nami and Zoro, surprising them both. Didn't I tell you before? She asked nonchalantly, don't point such dangerous objects at me, are you always so slow? Zoro was looking annoyed. That stupid ability of hers made her deadly to swordsmen. He looked ready to fight her barehanded when Nami demanded to know how long she had been on the ship. Quite a while, she answered as she picked up the lawn chair and added, these clothes are yours, right? I'm borrowing them. Just a minute lady. Who the heck do you think you are? Nami screamed at her, outraged that a member of Baroque Works was in her clothes. But Robin was looking directly at Luffy, her attention solely on him. Monkey D. Luffy, she said calmly, it hasn't been so long that you've forgotten what you did to me, has it? Sanji grabbed Luffy by his front and started shaking him in anger, demanding to know what he did to her. Wait a minute, stop lying. Luffy then called to Robin as she walked by him and set the chair up. You know I didn't do anything to you. Wrong, she answered back firmly, with that same smile on her face, as she sat down and started to make herself comfortable. And what you did to me was unbearable, she added as she leaned back, go ahead, admit it. Sanji was shaking Luffy harder than ever as Usopp was telling Robin to leave from behind the mast, and they could hear Chopper asking what it was she was talking about from just above them, out of harm's way. You're not making any sense, Luffy said, now looking really annoyed at everything that was going on. What do you want me to do? With a smile, she leaned forward in her seat, as if they were discussing business. I want to join you. For a brief moment there was nothing but silence around them, except for the sound of the flag flapping in the wind above them. Each one of the Straw Hats stared at her as if she had suddenly confessed to a murder. WWWHHHLATTT. Almost everyone yelled, staring at her with a mixture of different expressions. Some angry, some shocked, some fear, and, in Sanji's case, bliss. She only smiled, turning back to Luffy as she explained, I wanted nothing more than to die at that very moment, but you forced me to live. That's your crime. Sanji looked startled at that as she rested her chin on her hand, still looking directly at Luffy as she finished. There's no place for me to go or to return to. So I decided that I'll join you. Luffy's face held no expression as he thought it over for a moment. I see your problem. Guess there's no other choice, he finally said calmly. Welcome. Hey, he called just as the Straw Hats all yelled at their captain furiously, but he just looked back at them with a smile and added, there's nothing to worry about, he said firmly. Trust me, she isn't a bad person. Everyone was staring at him, sure that he lost his mind, but Sanji was looking overjoyed at Luffy's decision and was cheering it on in the background even after the others calmed down. Later in the crow's nest with Zoro who was training as usual, Luffy's hand suddenly appeared and he rocketed himself up to him. Hey, Zoro, he said happily. Sanji told me to tell you dinner'll be ready in 5 minutes. He said he's going to try making some of the yummy food they had at the palace. It's gonna be so good. Zoro didn't respond at once as he kept lifting weights silently for a moment, staring out at the sky that was an assortment of different shades of reds, oranges, and pinks. And then, without even looking at him, he asked, why did you do it? Luffy looked confused. Why did I tell you? Well, it's dinner and we need food. Not that you idiot, Zoro said in annoyance, finally looking at him, his back to the fading sun. I mean, why did you let that woman join us? What do you mean? Luffy asked him in confusion. Did you forget already that woman used to be part of Baroque works? He snapped at Luffy in frustration. We don't owe her anything. You saved her life and suddenly you owe her a favor. How do we know that we can really trust her? Zoro finished asking him seriously. After her part in helping to tear Alabasta apart, you really want someone like that in the crew. But what reason does she have to attack us now? Luffy asked him calmly. It's like with Bon Clay, she only wanted to leave Alabasta, right? There wasn't any reason for her to want to stick around there anymore. Maybe, Zoro said, but what makes you think that we can let her stay and not worry about her betraying us later? I dunno, he answered and Zoro looked ready to hit him over the head with the weight in his hands at the answer. We need more than that. Zoro yelled. I don't know, Luffy repeated, his eyes looking out into the distance. But something just tells me that we can trust her, Zoro. I mean, we've all done a lot of bad things in the past, right? Besides, I don't think she ever really liked Crocodile, Luffy said and Zoro looked to him in surprise. She was his partner, he reminded her. And he tried to kill her, Luffy spoke up, looking back at him, and she saved me before. Zoro looked even more startled by this as Luffy explained about how it was Robin who gave him the antidote to the scorpion poison, and had even been the one who helped him out after Crocodile left him at Rainbase. And when I finally caught up to them in that tomb, Crocodile stabbed her with his hook, Luffy finished explaining to him. After she gave Vivi's dad the antidote for me, I could hear what they were saying. Crocodile was looking for something. Looking for something, Zoro asked, what was it? And it was clear from the look on Luffy's face, that he didn't get the fact that it was some kind of weapon that could cause mass destruction that Crocodile was looking for. Only the fact that it was something dangerous that slimy creep wanted for himself. I don't know, but it was something bad, he answered him, and I overheard Robin say that she decided from the start not to hand it over to him. He was quiet for a moment before he added, I don't know, but she doesn't seem like a bad person to me. He looked to him and finished, she sounded more sad than bad to me. Zoro just looked at him before he sighed. Fine, he told him. I guess we have no choice anyway. But I'll be keeping a close eye on her just so you know. She does anything that seems like a betrayal, I'll be the one to throw her off. Over time, the whole crew warmed up to her as she got to know them. Every morning Robin was able to wake up to bright faces and good food that Sanji worked so hard for them. Luffy was always the first to wish her a good morning and Nami was more than happy to talk to her and get some relief from the boys. Usopp and Chopper had also gotten used to her and didn't seem as nervous to be around her, even Zoro's cold eyes slowly seemed to warm up and he seemed to be willing to take a nap even when she was around them. It was a bright sunny day nearly a week later and the crew was all on deck doing random tasks. Zoro, who was lifting weights in the background, looked up and asked if that was rain. They all looked up to see that it was dust and bits of wood that were falling on them. No way, Sanji said, holding his arms out to try and catch it, this ain't rain. He looked up and they all did the same thing in time to see something falling through the clouds just above them. That's interesting, it looks like oh. His eyes widened and his voice died in his throat as they all realized what it was. It was a worn-out, rickety old ship falling from the sky. The Straw Hats were all so stunned that it was as if time had frozen for a second. But that soon faded as they all began to scream out in fear as it hung right above their heads. It ended up missing the Mary, though narrowly, and the ship hit the ocean with such a large crash that it turned the waves around them as fierce as any Grand Line storm. Unlike with Nami giving them a slight heads up before the weather turned unforgiving, this came without any warning and all they could do was cling on to the Mary desperately as bits of the ship counted to fall from the sky like hail. It soon turned into insanity as they all struggled to stay upright, the waves pitching the Mary around like a piece of driftwood. They could hear Zoro's voice screaming somewhere to hold on tight and not to let go no matter what. The Straw Hats, Usopp and Chopper especially, screamed and seemed ready to have a nervous breakdown. Why are their ships falling out of the sky? Nami screamed as she hung on to the mast as more bits of wood fell around them, the waves rising up above them like some kind of beast trying to swallow them. I know, Usopp cried out, his eyes wide and a mad smile on his face. This is just an awful dream. Great, I love dreams, Chopper called out, truly believing Usopp for a moment before their heads crashed together, thus ending that theory. Hang on, I don't think the party's over yet. Sanji called over their cries of pain, and when they looked up it was as if they were stuck on a merry-go-round, everything was spinning. It won't stop falling. The rudder, turn the rudder, Nami screamed and Zoro called that they would only flip over in these waves. Sanji yelled to Luffy to help protect the ship, to which the captain asked how. Luffy then noticed how Usopp seemed to have calmed down suddenly. He was sitting in a meditative state, his eyes closed with a calm smile. I cast aside my worries and reach deep within to find my happy place. Usopp declared firmly. And when I open my eyes, this serene landscape is all that will lay before me. He picked the wrong moment to open his eyes. He screamed at the top of his lungs when his new friend fell out right in front of him, a skeleton dead guy. Don't throw that nasty thing at me, you idiot. Nami screamed as he threw the pile of bones off him and near her. They're falling everywhere, Sanji yelled out, another skeleton falling near his feet. I'm surrounded by dead, Usopp cried out, sounding close to losing his mind as he curled up in a fetal position. When is this stuff gonna stop falling? Nami screamed out. They could only continue to hold on and hope for the best. Soon, however, after several more chaos-filled minutes, the sky was clear again, the falling debris had finally stopped, and the Mary was surrounded on all sides by the broken ship that had reminded them of the destroyed galleon back at the Barati. But they hardly noticed it as they stared up at the sky, as if expecting another ship to fall. After doing a quick head count to see that everyone was all right, at least most of them since Usopp and Chopper were now in a corner, hugging the other like how a child would to a teddy bear, Luffy cried out, all right, why did a ship just fall out of the sky? I knew coming to the Grand Line was a mistake, it freaks me out. Usopp cried out, still hugging Chopper, his eyes twitching so much that it looked as if he was having a seizure. First we travel over a ship graveyard and now they're falling out of the sky, complete with skeletons. Nami gasped in horror. She was staring at the log pose, telling them that she was sure that it was broken because it was now pointing to the sky. Robin stepped forward, the only one who hadn't screamed in all that madness. She had returned to her usual calmness. It's not broken, she answered, as if things fell from the sky all the time on them. The log pose registers an island with a strong magnetic pull and the needle is reflecting that. If the needle's pointing to the sky, they all looked to her as she focused her attention skyward, then, it must be pointing to Sky Island. Sky Island, they all repeated loudly, none of them having ever heard of such a thing. They all talked about it, with Zoro ending the talk as pointing out that there wasn't anything but sky right over their heads. That's not actually how it works, Robin answered, it's not an island above us, but an entire ocean. Usopp, Luffy and Chopper all had their eyes wide and bright at the thought of going to an island floating in the air. They were all cheering and going on about wanting to go to such a place, but Robin used her powers to cover Luffy's mouth and Sanji reminded them they couldn't fly. Soon though, Robin and Nami were arguing about it, with Nami telling her that there was no such thing as a flying island and insisted that their log pose was broken. That was all. Not quite, Miss Navigator, Robin countered coolly as she pointed to the log pose, you're trying to fix something that's not even broken. We should be trying to find a way to get to Sky Island. You really need to learn to trust your instruments. No matter how crazy things get, or how weird the situation is we find ourselves in, never doubt the log pose. Out here, on the water, this is one of the most steadfast and unbreakable rules, Robin continued. What we should be doubting is the common sense we all that tells us that an island cannot exist in the sky, on an ocean nothing. That needle is pointing towards an island, I bet my life on it. Then Robin began looking through the remains of a skeleton they had found. As they looked through it, Luffy and Usopp went jumping over to the bigger parts of the ship to explore it. Luffy didn't pay any attention to the slowly sinking boat as he walked inside, the old ship cracked and creaked under his weight as he went looking through all the rubble. Luffy, who was looking over some of the papers they found among a desk that was broken right in half. Back with the crew, Robin told them about how just looking at a skull and some books, they discovered that the ship's name was the Saint Briss, which left the kingdom of Breeze in the South Blue about 208 years ago, as well as being able to tell how old the man was when he died. Suddenly, Luffy gasped. They looked up in time to see that he was staring in wonder at one of the rolls of paper in his hands and his eyes were bright. But soon the ship had filled up with water and Luffy was forced to run out of there, having Usopp haul him back to the Mary. You won't believe it. I did it. He held up the roll of paper he found. I found the most incredible thing. When they saw what it was, they gasped at what it was he had. A map of the Sky Island. They all cried out. Nami almost ripped it out of his hands and stared at it. It's called Skypia, she asked, more to herself than to Luffy who was nodding firmly by her side. Then it's true. There really is an island up there. It was great to see everyone looking excited at the thought, even as the last bits of the ship slowly sank beneath the waves. As the Goofy trio cheered, doing a dance with their arms linked, Nami pointed out that they didn't know how to get there or if it was even possible, and that there was always a chance that the map was a fake. The looks on their faces was as if she had just told a bunch of little kids that Santa Claus didn't exist. She saw the hope fading from their faces and quickly tried to reassure them that she was sure it was real. But then she punched the mast angrily and yelled out that if it existed or not wasn't the point, the fact was they didn't know how to get there. Luffy was refusing to listen and began yelling that he wanted to go there no matter what and the fight only ended when she hit him over the head. This isn't about me, it's about reality, she yelled at them angrily, and the reality is that we know next to nothing. What we do know is that we can't defy gravity and sail upwards. That's impossible. What we need is more information. If a big ship like that made it up there, then odds are we can do the same thing. We just have to find all the records left on that ship. Usopp reminded them that the ship was most likely at the bottom of the ocean by now. Nami cried out confidently, if it's sunk, then we'll salvage it. And with a little more thought, Usopp came up with the plan. He quickly built a diving system made up of barrels and long air hoses. And in the end, the monster trio had all volunteered to go down and find what was left of the ship. Luffy, however, decided to just swim, naturally, turning into a black reef shark before following the other two over the railing. The three jumping head first into the water. As the three of them went down to salvage what they could of the ship for more information, they come across a group of pirates led by a man who looked like an ape, named Masira, who claimed that he had control over the territory and all ships that sink there belong to him. Masira and his crew begin salvage operation and are in the process of raising the ship when they run into a snag. The monster trio were still inside the wreck and beat up his crew. Masira went down to handle things and confronts them when a giant sea turtle appeared out of nowhere and swallowed the ship they were in like how a fish would to bait on a hook. This didn't last long, however, as the overpowered trio were able to upset the turtle's stomach enough with their constant thrashing that all the humans were spat out. Soon after they headed towards the surface and they were back on the Mary, however now it was pitch dark out. There was another large ship there with them. One that was at least twice as large as the Mary and had rows of palm trees going along the sides of his ship and 2 banana-shaped poles. Also on the sails was another pirate flag, a monkey's head with 2 bananas in place of the crossbones. Luffy was coming to from where he lay on the deck, dripping wet and slowly getting back to his feet, dropping the large sack that was on his back. Hey, he called to them all, when night happened. Zoro was pulling on a rope, telling them that they were getting out of here now. Suddenly, there was a cry of anger and they looked in time to see someone jump out of the sea and landed on the side of the ship, screaming back that they hand back the treasure they took. It was Masira, and he truly looked like an ape, more primate than human. He was also in a bright orange-yellow jumpsuit with headphones and goggles, much like the ones that Usopp had, but what made him really interesting was the fact that he looked like he had a tail. However, his face was full of anger as he glared at them all, threatening to tear their ship apart if they didn't hand the treasure over. Everyone got up, ready to fight Masira off. But then, Masira's crew were all looking ready to cry as they pointed wildly behind them, too frozen to speak about what it was. When they all looked, they all felt close to choking, feeling close to fainting at what they saw. Giants, at least 5 of them, so large that blocked out the sun. Black as night, they towered over them as great as the sky, even the giant island turtle was tiny compared to them all. They carried spears and had wings on their backs, like angels of death, looking down at them as if they were prey to them, though there were no eyes. Everyone was frozen in fear, even Robin was turning a shade of blue they had never seen from her before. As the middle one raised his spear above their heads, they all came back to life and screamed out, SSC The Straw Hats were all in overdrive. Together they broke out the paddles and began to paddle as fast as they could go to get away from these things. It was as if they suddenly had a motor on their back and were going as fast as ever before. Fear was the only thing that kept them going, and they didn't stop until they had reached the end of the dark sky and were safe in the bright sunlight. Once the danger had passed, they all huddled on the deck, shaking and trying to catch their breath. Suddenly, Zoro spoke up what they were all thinking. That couldn't have been real. They all began to list what happened in the last few hours alone. First there was that huge galleon that fell from the clouds on top of us, Zoro started off. The log pose's needle started pointing to the sky. Nami added, hugging her knees as she glanced at the needle. A psycho makeup-wearing monkey shows up and blocks our way, Usopp added, slowly calming down to a normal breath rate. Chopper then added, and then a gigantic sea turtle eats our salvage ship. Then darkness fell, Robin sighed, almost grimly. Because the biggest monsters I've ever seen in my life blocked out the sun. Luffy finished for them all. The crew noticed that they still had Masira still on deck with them and kicked him off. Then the monster trio, unloading the sacks of stuff they got from the ship before it was eaten. There wasn't anything that told them about Sky Island, and not even a scrap of treasure like Nami had thought there would be. Needless to say, Nami wasn't the least bit happy. She began to yell at them about this as they tried to tell her that his was all they found down there. That they picked it clean by the time that Masira appeared. But she only got angrier as she began to break it all, even crushing the suit of armor that Luffy was walking around in. It wasn't a good thing. She looked ready to start foaming at the mouth with rage until Robin was able to pacify her by showing her the map and eternal pose to a place called Jaya that she took from Masira's ship, and they soon decided to go there, in hopes of finding someone who could help them. Soon they were sailing into a harbor. At first glance, it looked like some kind of resort, full of beautiful buildings with red pointed roofs and palm trees. Except for the numerous pirate ships docked at said harbor. Usopp had noticed the ships as well and pointed it out to them, with Nami slapping him playfully that since when can pirates dock their ship without being run out of town. Just as he was starting to calm down, they could hear someone from one of the buildings screaming that he was about to be killed and the weakling trio all looked ready to cry in fear. Nami had decided to go with the boys, and as they walked on, they could hear the sounds of fights and arguments going on everywhere they passed. They couldn't go a few feet without something breaking or hearing death threats, and Nami was giving the boys an earful, making them promise that they wouldn't fight back no matter what. If they got into trouble, they'd be forced to leave and then they'd never be able to find information on Sky Island. They barely acknowledged what she was saying just as a crippled old man fell off his horse right in front of them. Croaking for help, he asked if they could help him back up onto his horse. He was a very large man, with a slightly longer than normal nose, straight purple tattoos coming from his hairline to the corners of his eyes, and was wearing a thick, black fur coat. After Luffy and Zoro helped him back on his horse, he offered them some apples as a thank you. Do you take us for idiots? Zoro demanded, noticing the sneaky look on his face. We'd never trust food from someone like you. But Luffy did take one and took a bite, and as soon as he did, there was an explosion behind them. They then heard some shouting, some men yelling that apparently some men took some apples from that same old man and when they ate them, the apples blew up. Zoro and Nami had turned almost as blue in the face as they had been when they saw the giants as they realized what was going on. Nami screamed at Luffy to spit it out, practically strangling him in the process as Zoro had his sword in his hands, looking ready to attack the man, demanding to know what he had done. The old man smirked. No worries, he said with a hiccup, the boy isn't hurt. If he had eaten a bad one, you would have died on the first bite. You're lucky. The two dragged Luffy away before he could do anything else that might kill him. Nami was hissing about it to Luffy, who didn't seem bothered by his close escape from death. But then they heard the sounds of insane laughter from one of the roofs right behind him, and when they looked, there was a large man standing there as if he had just been declared the next king. He was a big, muscular man with curly, light violet hair reaching past his shoulders and with a mask covering his upper face. The others heard some of the citizens talking about how he wanted to be the fighting champion, which got Zoro's and Luffy's attention as they looked back, ready for a fight. Don't even think about it, you two, Nami screamed before she dragged them on. Later, they were all suddenly in a worn-down looking bar. Nami and the boys were at the bar enjoying some drinks and food as they talked about what it was they were supposed to do. Nami slapped her glass down on the bark in front of her. Man, that really ticks me off, she said bitterly as the other two let her complain, Zoro downing his drink and Luffy waited impatiently for his food. She began with a long talk with the bartender about this island, and he gave her the same kind of advice that Robin had stated only a little earlier. He set 2 cherry pies on the bar for Luffy and a large man next to him before he told her that the log pose would reset in only a couple more days, but it might be wiser to skip town sooner than that. Nami had started to ask the bartender something when both Luffy and the man next to him slammed their fists down onto the bark, each with their own opinion about the pies. Soon he and Luffy had gotten into a fight about the pies being served to them. Noticing that their remarks opposed with each other, they decided not to mind the other at first and drink some soda. But at that, they both made opposing remarks about that, really getting on each other's nerves this time, and they decided to have some food for takeout. Luffy ordered pieces of meat and the man started ordering pies. However, upon learning the number of food that the other was ordering, they started competing about who can order more. The two were now glaring at each other, looking ready to fight. Do you two even have the slightest idea to what you're fighting about? Zoro screamed, as Nami shouted that he promised her not to start a fight. And that they didn't have that kind of money anyway, they weren't here to shop. Luffy didn't look happy at all, glaring at the man as if daring him to say something wrong. The man suddenly grinned evilly at Luffy. So then, are you a pirate? He asked. Yeah, that's right, Luffy answered, and then Blackbeard asked how high his bounty was. 30 million, Luffy answered. The man however seemed to think that Luffy was making it up, and even telling him that he wouldn't believe it even if he collected it. Are you calling me a liar, you fat, hairy ape? Luffy yelled angrily. Finally, Zoro was yelling at them both to break it up, as the bartender sent down a package of cherry pies on the bar in front of Blackbeard, telling him that one of the rules in his bar was no fighting and that if they wanted to settle it so bad they could do it outside. Hoping that he would just leave, he gave him the package of 50 pies and asked for him to just go. The man glared down at Luffy, who glared back harshly before he seemed to decide that it just wasn't worth it. Instead, the man picked up his package and left the building without a glance back. Someone came bursting through the doors, calling that he was looking for someone with a straw hat. They all looked, to see a tall and darkly tanned man with unkempt blonde hair as well as a scar just above his right eye and a mark of a smiley face with a slash through it on his chest. He then saw Luffy at the bar and started walking towards them. Who's this guy? Luffy asked impatiently. Looks like he's got a bone to pick with you, Luffy, Zoro muttered as they watched him come nearer. He must be that Bellamy guy who rented out that hotel we were at, Nami whispered to them, as they had earlier went to a hotel for info, only to find it booked by a pirate captain named Bellamy the Hyena. Bellamy was right next to them, towering over Luffy as Luffy commented that everyone they were meeting today was huge. Bellamy ignored that as he ordered a glass from the top shelf and told the bartender to give Luffy anything he wanted. Soon, the rest of Bellamy's crew came in, talking in loud voices about how disgusting and cheap this bar was. One of them, a guy wearing a long coat made of fur, took out a bent knife that was as big as a sword, and actually slashed one of the other customers so that he could get his seat. The man with the knife sneered at the dying man on the floor, you'd be in a lot less pain if you'd offered us your seats already. Pathetic harbor trash. Several others ran out of the bar in terror, gasping at how it was, big knife sarquisses. Meanwhile, the bartender brought out the drinks that Bellamy asked for and stood back, clearly not wanting any trouble as Bellamy said to Luffy, cheers. Hey, thanks for the drink, pal, Luffy said cheerfully. You know what, you're all right, Luffy said as he started to tilt his head back to drink when suddenly, Bellamy slammed Luffy's head into the bar table so hard that it shattered. The whole bar went silent and stared at them as Bellamy smirked. Zoro had his blade out and was holding it to Bellamy's neck. And what are you doing, punk? Bellamy asked him, as if amused that Zoro turned his blade to him. That's the question you should be asking yourself, Zoro sneered, his face dark as night. Bellamy only sneered at him, as if enjoying the thought of fighting him. Nami was behind him, pleading with Zoro not to fight, that they still needed information, but he interrupted her, telling her to be quiet because if this guy wanted to fight, he was more than happy to give it to him. Luffy turned to face Bellamy, asking if he was ready to take him on or not. Bellamy only grinned wildly at him as everyone else cheered on, wanting to see a fight. You've got it all wrong, kid, this isn't a fight, it's a test. Bellamy laughed. Now come on, let's see how strong you are. Looking worried that a fight would break out, Nami turned to the bartender and asked quickly, Mister, we're trying to get to the Sky Island, do you know anything about that? The bartender stared at her as the bar went silent once again, all of them staring at her. Others began whispering to each other on that subject, clearly unable to believe they heard right. Luffy glanced at them all in confusion. Nami looked just as confused, but went on bravely with her question, like I was saying, if you knew how to get to Sky Island. But before she could finish, the whole bar burst out laughing, startling them all as everyone around them began to mock them about searching for a place that didn't exist. Nami held up her wrist so that they could see their log and she yelled out, what the, you can look at the log pose yourself. It's pointed at the sky plan as day. That stopped them all laughing for only a brief moment before they began laughing once again, mocking and taunting Nami who was turning a bright red color. Bellamy sat down sharply, slapping his knee as he also roared with laughter. You got me there, kid. He yelled out. I can't believe you guys are putting hope in such a ridiculous legend like an island in the sky. Especially considering how little you know. Like how out of the thousands of weird currents in the Grand Line one of them is called a knock-up stream. He then stared at Nami. Looks to me like this is the first time you've ever heard about it. Any ship that gets caught up in the knock upstream is catapulted into the sky and later slams back down into the ocean. Bellamy continued to laugh. Years ago, a bunch of ignorant sailors saw a bunch of ships falling from the sky and assumed that there must be an island up there somewhere. In their minds, how else could a ship get up that high? He stuck his tongue out with a deranged smile as he finished. Ha! Ridiculous. Anything that seems supernatural always has a rational explanation. Anything a man can dream can eventually be explained, and let me tell you, the truth will hurt. The bar continued to laugh with Bellamy, however, as Luffy seemed to grow angrier, his hands now fists, as if he was fighting back the urge to punch this guy. Bellamy sighed again as he looked to them. What a shame. Look, I was gonna to let you into my crew if you passed the test for the new era, but it seems like you're a lost cause. Bellamy glared at Luffy like he thought that he was not worth the trouble anymore. Thing is, the time of pirates' dreams are over. The city of gold, the emerald ruins, and the great One Piece, fools who dream of these fictional treasures don't notice the real treasures all around them. Bellamy laughed. In this age of oceans, the very men who are capable of navigating currents end up chasing these ridiculous dreams and die in the process. Bellamy's smile got even wilder as he said mockingly, whenever these people speak of these dead idiots, they always say, he was happy because he died living his dreams. Ha, no, he died because he was a fool. Luffy glared at him, his fist slowly loosening up as his anger seemed to vanish so that there was no emotion at all on his face. But then, Bellamy held up his own fist and declared, so when I see people chasing dreams of One Piece I get disgusted. And without raising a hand to defend himself, Luffy just shut his eyes and allowed Bellamy to hit him so that he fell back onto the ground. Nami cried out in shock. Zoro didn't react at all as he looked at his captain, as if wondering what it was he going to do about it. Bellamy suddenly went on speaking, laughing as if he knew the answer to the meaning of life. You're a weak pirate just like they were. And as long as you're hacking around you're making us, the real pirates, look like trash. And then he threw his glass at the floor, narrowly missing Luffy's head, who was still lying there, staring up at the ceiling. Luffy didn't move at all, just laid there with an empty expression, as if he was merely bored as everyone followed Bellamy's example and began to throw food and drinks at them. Sarkis encouraged Bellamy to beat them up, who was grinning back only too eagerly. Nami finally couldn't take it anymore. Luffy, Zoro, forget all about all that pacifist crap earlier. She screamed, take this jerk out. Luffy slowly sat up, not even reacting to the food and drink around him as he looked directly at Zoro and gave him one order. What he said stunned Nami. Zoro, no matter whatever happens, don't fight back. Zoro looked just as expressionless as Luffy, though a little cold. Nami was stunned as she watched as Bellamy and his crew attacked. They began to punch and hit them, like they were practice dummies. She watched as they threw food at them and Bellamy took a long sip of booze before he spit it all into Luffy's face. But no matter what they did to them, neither one fought back, even as Bellamy slammed Luffy's face right through a window, leaving the steady dripping of blood on the shattered glass. Nami went running over to them both, still trying to get them to fight back, but what Sarkis said next got a chill to go up her spine. Saying that he wanted to buy her. Nami stared up at him as she hissed, excuse me, did you just say that you wanted to buy me? That's right, Sarkis said with a rather evil grin, come on girl, join us. Nami didn't look angry, but her face had turned to one of a disgusted smirk. I hate to say it, she said, her face dark, but I'm too good to be seen with a pirate like you. You're nothing but a small-time thug. The rest of the bar laughed at them, with Luffy and Zoro lying on the floor, no longer moving. The only other person who wasn't laughing was the bartender, who was cleaning some glasses and just watched. His own expression was empty as Bellamy threw his glass down like a child having a tantrum, and yelled at them to get out of his sight. With as much poise as she could muster, Nami picked up both men by their shirts and dragged them out as they continued to throw bottles at them the whole way out. As Nami dragged Luffy and Zoro they heard a familiar voice proclaim, the Sky Island does exist. Nami had her head turned right towards the man from before, who was eating his pies, sitting on the ground watching them with a curious expression. After he took a big bite he said with a laugh, that place really does make a killer cherry pie. Nami seemed to be expecting trouble. She dropped both the boys and snarled at him, got something you wanna say? Now what could you possibly be angry about? The man asked cheerfully with a wide grin. Your two friends won that fight without ever throwing a punch. The man began to laugh again, but unlike the men back at the bar, it wasn't a mocking or belittling laugh, more like one of respect. And this was proven when he said, I respected the way you treated them back there. You've got nerves of steel, lady. Zoro and Luffy got up and began to dust themselves off. Fixing his hat, Luffy turned his bloody face towards the man, looking at him with that same unreadable look that he had given Bellamy. The man only grinned a little wider, looking at Luffy with a great deal more respect than he had before. He then said, this new era they keep rambling on and on about is a load of crap. The era where pirates dream of treasure will come to an end. Yeah right. The man laughed again just as he slammed his whiskey bottle onto the ground and called out loudly, getting everyone's attention around them, the dreams of pirates will never end. There was silence from everyone as Luffy still didn't react at all, like he could see something in the man that they couldn't. Am I right? The man challenged, and soon his shouting had caused the crowd around them to laugh good-naturedly at him, asking what he was talking about. One-upping your peers isn't easy, was his only answer before he calmed down enough to look directly at Luffy, answering, they can laugh at us all they want because when you aim high, you often come across fights that just aren't worth fighting. Right. Zoro told the other two that they should just go. Nami had no problems with that and was about to follow him until she noticed that Luffy still hadn't moved. Luffy, she asked softly, but he was still giving the man that long and hard look, and they knew him well enough to tell that he wasn't happy with what he saw, but didn't say anything else as the man stood up, his bottle and sack of pies back in his hands. Oh, it looks like I interrupted you, he said as if he just realized that he was being rude to a group of shoppers. Are you in a hurry, kid? Luffy didn't answer, however he didn't seem to be expecting one as he turned and raised his drink. One more thing, he added, I hope you find your way to Sky Island. He turned and laughed as Luffy also left, leaving him behind. Nami was now pressing the boys, suggesting that they should go back and talk to that guy and that he might know something about Sky Island. Nami was then asking if they had any idea who he was. I dunno, Luffy confessed softly, in serious voice that was almost unheard of from him, but it's not he. Nami looked at him in confusion and asked, if it's not he then, what is it? Probably they, Zoro answered, who seemed to know what Luffy was taking about as his captain rubbed some blood off near his mouth before the two headed onwards, not bothering to answer any of Nami's questions as she asked what they were talking about. Later they were back on the Mary with Zoro and Luffy both cleaned up and Chopper treating their many cuts and bruises. So, what happened to you guys? Usopp asked in concern, leaning against the railing and watched as Chopper dabbed disinfectant on a deep cut on Luffy's arm. It looks like you were mauled by a pack of rabid wolves. It was pirates, Luffy admitted before he assured him, but we're okay. Just some scratches. Yeah, Zoro added, looking as if they had just got into a simple misunderstanding, but Nami was looking put out as she sat on the stairs, her back to them all. You guys seem to be okay with everything, but I certainly am not. She said as the boys looked at her. She seemed to be trying to hold her rage back before she lost it and began yelling out, what's wrong with you two? You are men right, when someone provokes you, the only logical response would be to pummel their faces and then wipe up the blood with their friends' faces. Or better yet you should have just blown up the entire annoying town. Zoro asked what happened to all her pacifist talk, but shut up at once when she turned the evil eye at him. Shut up Zoro, what's past is past, we're not talking about ancient history here, she shrieked at him, shaking with anger. Usopp was asking Luffy why she was in such a bad mood since she didn't get a scratch on her. Luffy answered he had no idea. Chopper then bravely asked if they found any information on Sky Island, which seemed to bring up those bad memories from Nami as she slowly turned her wrath onto him, who was crying in fear. Chopper and Usopp, who were scared so badly, that they were guarding themselves and pretending to be dead. But Nami didn't seem to notice as she screamed out that she honestly couldn't care less about Sky Island anymore. That all she had to do was say the name and they laughed at her. She then screamed out, demanding to know what was so funny about saying it. Thankfully, Robin returned at that moment and Nami turned her wrath onto her. Yelling that if it turned out that Sky Island didn't exist, she was going to throw her overboard with rocks in her pockets for good measure. Usopp warned Robin to keep her distance for a while until she calmed down. Robin only smiled as she gave Luffy a map of this island, telling him that she got some information on it. As they looked over it, they saw that they were at the point labeled, Mop Town, but on the other side of the island was a large X. And Robin told them that apparently a man was banished there because he didn't blend in with the town here. Didn't blend in, Usopp and Luffy repeated in surprise. His name is Mont Blanc Cricket, Robin explained as she headed to the door to the galley, apparently Mr. Cricket talked about his dreams too much. Sounds like you have something in common. She smiled brightly as she closed the door and Luffy beamed at the map, loudly proclaiming that they needed to go pay this guy a visit. They were back out at sea on the Mary, with a large ship right in front of them. It looked a great deal like Masira's ship, with the giant trees that served as masts. The sides of the ship were covered in little doors and ladders where some men, dressed in wetsuits, were climbing up, and a large orangutan skull and crossbones for the Jolly Roger. Luffy asked the others if this was the same salvage ship from before, with the others dismissing that, saying that though it looked the same, it wasn't Masira's crew. Usopp and Chopper both nodded in firm agreement behind them, saying that they saw those guys and it turns out that they docked at Mop Town just like most ships in these waters. And they reasoned they must be all the same as the guys who fought them. A large man who looked like an orangutan with long green hair and wearing a black button-up shirt that is too small for his body showing off his hairy torso. Can you believe I got all worked up, wondering who you people are? He asked them all. Your face looks weird, Luffy called bluntly, what species are you? I'm human, moron, the now identified human named Shuju yelled angrily as his crew all yelled in outrage as well. That there was no one out there who knew more about underwater search than their captain. But Shuju calmed them down, going on to admit that his temper was short these days because he wanted to be named as the next warlord since Crocodile was defeated, but he hadn't gotten the news yet. Luffy asked Shuju, so your goal is to become one of the 7 warlords of the sea? Didn't I just say that? Shuju called in annoyance, but then he went on to introduce himself, bragging about how he never cut his hair once in his whole life. But when Luffy said that was lame that got Shuju angry. However, when Luffy told Shuju to move, the ape seemed to lose it as he screamed out, you just don't get it do you? This is my turf, if you want to pass you either pay the toll or be sunk. Got it? Usopp, who was crouching low behind Chopper, began asking what he was talking about, his turf. He's starting to sound like our old friend Masira. He ended. Huh, Luffy asked, looking at him in surprise, Masira said stuff like that. That also got Shuju's attention. Masira, he asked at once, what about Masira? If you must know, Luffy said, looking back up at him, we kicked his butt off our boat. But we didn't think. But Shuju screamed in outrage as he yelled at him to how dare he kicked his own brother. Wait, hold on, Luffy yelled, trying to make himself heard, listen to me. Sure we threw him off our boat, but I bet he's alive. Shuju was far from listening as he pulled out his microphone and began to scream into it. No one could tell what he was doing at first, but the sound waves from his voice was actually causing pain to his crew and destroy his ship. The Straw Hats didn't seem to think it was anything to worry about until the Mary was also being torn apart. The planking was coming up, the patches that Usopp worked so hard to fix were falling apart and looked close to being blown away. The Straw Hats realized what was going on and knew that if they stayed for too much longer, they were sure to sink. Nami calmed down from her experience in Mop Town enough to give them all orders, and soon they were able to sail away from the range of Shuju's voice. Though the damage had been done, the Mary was in such bad shape that they were actually leaving a trail of debris behind them, and Usopp was now pulling planks of wood and his tool set out as they quickly began patching it up as best as they could. As the boys patched up the ship as best as they could, Nami and Robin were looking over the map. We left Mock Town and headed east by circling around the northern shore of the island. Our destination is here, Nami said as she traced the path with her finger before she looked to Robin and asked, we're supposed to meet that man here. What's that name? His name is Mont Blanc Cricket, she answered calmly as they turned the bend. And you're sure he'll be able to help us out, right? Nami asked, but her voice was drowned out by Luffy, Usopp, and Chopper when they spotted a beautiful palace right on the edge of the water. The Goofy trio were gapping at it, but the others all sided it, having already figured out what it was. It wasn't until Luffy jumped off to get a closer look, and yell in shock did they all find out that it was just a paper covering part of a house that looked like it had been carved right in half. Nami asked Robin why Cricket decided to live here. I don't know all the details, she admitted leaning against the rails, but I think it has something to do with his belief that a large amount of gold rests somewhere in the hills of Jaya. Gold, Usopp cried in excitement. Do you think he's here looking for some kind of buried treasure? Exclamation mark quote. Nami asked at once, her eyes lighting up. But even when Robin admitted that she didn't know, Nami didn't care as she began chanting about gold and berry marks in her eyes. In fact, as soon as they landed, she was having Chopper digging up places around the house. But Luffy didn't really mind as he stuck his head into the house, looking for anyone who lived there. After he confirmed that no one was home, Usopp snapped at him to get out of there in case this guy was dangerous. But as they started making themselves comfortable, on a large tree stump, Nami found a book and started to read it out loud for them all. Noland the Liar. Nami began reading it out. About how an explorer named Mont Blanc Noland who always told amazing stories about his adventures. But they sounded so far-fetched, no one was sure if they were to believe him or not. One day, when he returned from one expedition, he reported back to his king that on an island he found a city built out of solid gold. To see if Tor himself, the king took 2,000 of his own soldiers and set out with Noland to find this city for himself, fighting off powerful storms and sea monsters. By the time they finally found the island that Noland talked about, there were only 100 of his soldiers left. But all they found was deserted island with an ordinary jungle. Because of this, the outraged king sentenced Noland to death for his lies. His final words before he was executed were the followed. I can only assume that the city of gold sunk into the sea. But no one believed him anymore, even though he never swayed from his story until he died. Luffy, who was kneeling near the water's edge, was looking down to see bubbles coming up and bursting at the surface. As he looked a little closer, something was swimming up towards him. Chestnut, Luffy asked in wonder as he saw the strange object. Suddenly a large hand shot out of the water and grabbed Luffy by the front of his vest. With a startled scream, Luffy was pulled right into the sea, and that's when he blacked out until it came back with Usopp pulling Luffy back out of the water. Usopp snarled at Luffy to be more careful. Luffy coughed up seawater and tried to explain what happened. Once he had coughed the water all up, he asked who that man was. They looked to see a rather muscular, middle-aged man with blonde hair, and a large chestnut on his head. He was also bare-chested and barefooted and had a strange tattoo of a chestnut with the word, maroon, on his arm, but he was laying on the ground and struggling for air, as if in terrible pain. As they pulled Luffy out of the sea and Chopper was carefully approaching the man to get a good look at him for any injuries. Once the reindeer doctor was sure that he was out cold, he ordered for the others to bring him inside the house so that he could see what was wrong with him. Chopper told them the whole story. He explained that he was actually really sick and suffering from a serious disease known as Kyson disease, or decompression sickness. Apparently a condition arising from dissolved gases coming out as bubbles inside the body on depressurization. Since bubbles can form in or migrate to any part of the body, DCS can produce many symptoms, and its effects may vary from joint pain and rashes to paralysis and death, and it happens with divers. Luffy naturally called it a mystery disease, even Chopper explained it in full detail. Chopper gave them all orders on how to help this man, knowing just what to do to make him comfortable and ease up some of Cricket's suffering. But Chopper confessed to them all that he wasn't sure if he could help him here, guessing that he must have been diving every day for years without letting his body fully rest, and it finally caught up to him. That was why he collapsed during the fight. As they watched the scene, no one really bothering to talk, two more guests showed up. Both Masira and Shuju appeared, so big that they couldn't fight through the doorway together and had to settle by sticking their large heads in. Hey old timer, they cried together, are you alright? As they looked up and saw who it was, Usopp and Chopper screamed, as they started to run around in fear as Usopp cried out, sounding close to tears, they've come to kill us. What in the world are you people doing there? Shuju demanded angrily. And what do you think you're doing to our friend? Masira added just as angry. Luffy answered, we're trying to help. So I suggest that you either lend us a hand or find somebody else to bother. Usopp was screaming at him not to antagonize them, reminding them what they were capable of, and was even suggesting that they just jump outside the window and run away. But then the two oversized monkeys surprised them all by thanking them and practically crying, startling over Usopp and Chopper. The Straw Hats explained what was going on. Luffy went outside so that they could really talk to them, already getting along great with them like old friends. As they listened in, the two admitted that they did live here as well, but spent most of their time on their ship since this place was too small for them. It turns out that this little house was the headquarters for what they called the Saruyama Alliance. Shuju was talking to Luffy, saying how impressed he was that he got Masira off his ship like that, which Luffy responded that he was sure that even he could kick his ass if he tried. Chopper came running out of the house, calling Luffy that Cricket was awake. As he went in to see him, Shuju had kicked Masira and seemed surprised that he was able to do so as he went flying off into the distance. Cricket was sitting up, a great deal calmer than before, and smoking a cigarette like how Sanji did before he spoke. I'm sorry I attacked you, he said sincerely. I thought that you were nothing more than another group of bandits who had come to steal my gold. Nami's eyes turned to berry symbols. Did somebody say something about gold? Just calm down, Nami, Usopp hissed as Cricket asked, what exactly was it you wanted to ask me? Luffy walked over to him and said eagerly, "We're searching for Sky Island. And we were told you might be able to tell us how to get there." "Are you serious?" Cricket asked before he burst out laughing. "Don't tell me you believe that place actually exists." The laughing ticked Nami off, looking ready to slug Cricket, with Usopp desperately trying to hold her back as Luffy cried out, "You mean there's no Sky Island? Are you sure?" Though he had calmed down greatly, Cricket was still chuckling as he admitted, "I don't know." He breathed a little more on his cigarette before he finished. "See, nobody really knows if the Sky Island exists or not. I know only one man who claims to have seen the island himself, but he's considered a liar of epic proportions." Luffy turned to look at Usopp and Usopp asked what they were looking at. "There's an old fairy tale that the people in the North Blue know very well," Cricket went on. "It's called Noland the Liar." Again, Luffy looked to Usopp. "Quit looking at me, Luffy," he yelled. "My name's not Noland." Sanji spoke from a chair near the window. "Now that I think about it, Noland's family name was also Mont Blanc. Does that make you related to him somehow?" Nami gasped if that was true as well. Cricket looked out one of the windows and admitted it all without any shame. Noland was his distant ancestor. However, he also added that they were so far removed, he doubted that he had any of Noland's blood in his veins. He acknowledged that his family was driven out of the North Blue a long time ago. And though his family may deny the name, they have never hated Noland for it because contrary to what everyone else believed, Noland had been a very honest man. Cricket went on to state that he knew that Noland was far from stupid. That he truly believed what he saw and stuck to this story even though he was put to death for it. Usopp got excited, thinking he had it all figured it out, that Cricket came here to prove Noland right and clear the family name. However, Cricket lost it. "Don't be ridiculous." And to their surprise, he fired at him, freezing them all as they stared at him. Though it was clear that he never intended to hit him, missing him clear by a mile, it was enough to get his point across. "I don't even care if the city of gold exists or not. The actions of my ancestor have nothing to do with me and my life." Cricket screamed out, "You can't possibly begin to imagine what it's like. As a kid for everyone to laugh at you and riddicule you cause you're a descendant of that idiot Noland. That's what I dealt with my whole life." Cricket took several calming breaths, putting the gun back down. Cricket declared that many members of his family tried to do the same thing, to find the city and clear the family name. But in the end each one of them died in the attempt, long before they even reached the island. Ashamed of his family, Cricket ran away from home and became the captain of a crew of pirates. He did not necessarily wanted to become a pirate then, he just wanted to escape the curse of carrying the Mont Blanc family name. However, 10 years ago, Cricket and his crew accidentally came across Jaya, the island that Noland supposedly found the city and the island that so many of Cricket's family members failed to find their way to. Standing upon the cape where the city of gold was supposed to be, Cricket decided to accept his fate and find out once and for all if there was the legendary city that Noland found or not. His crew, however, did not agree with his decision and left him alone on the island. Cricket finished his story by telling them that he began diving all alone in these waters every day in search of any clue of the city of gold. "I don't care if I find the city or not," Cricket finished with a sigh. "I'm not here to prove Noland right or wrong. I have no interest in rewriting history. All I'm doing is following what I believe to be my destiny. This is between me and Noland. I am facing what I fear. And whatever the outcome, the act is all that matters." His words moved Usopp to tears. "But what about the monkeys?" Luffy suddenly asked. "How did they come to be on this island with you anyway?" "I'm sure that's another story of bravery in the face of incredible odds." Usopp said tearfully, "Your life reads like a great book, you know, Cricket." "They're just fans of the fairy tale," Cricket answered, and that ticked Usopp off. "How did they find you?" Nami asked with a few sweat drops around her head. "I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago," Cricket said, thinking back. "They heard a rumor and set out to find me. Those two truly believe that the city of gold exists somewhere and they're me find it." It was truly touching to hear Cricket admit that they showed up out of the blue one day, proclaiming themselves as his followers without his permission, and became part of his crew without asking. Though they were loud and did nothing but fight all the time, Cricket allowed them to help him in his search and accepted them as his surrogate sons. To Cricket, their barging into his life out of the blue saved his life from the constant loneliness he felt before they came. With this, Cricket became the leader of the Saruyama Alliance. Together with the two brothers and their pirate crews, they had been searching all around Jaya for the lost city. Once he told him how much he had grown to enjoy their company and put him at ease, Usopp cried again. But Luffy said bluntly, "Are you just about finished telling us your life story?" "Shut your mouth, you ungrateful brat," Usopp yelled, punching him, which Luffy responded by throwing him off him and saying loudly that all he wanted to know about was Sky Island. Cricket chuckled again. "You're a pushy guy, aren't ya?" he asked in amusement, "but like I told you before earlier, the only person who's claimed to see Sky Island is Noland. And nobody knows if it's the truth or just another tall tale." He then reached to the bookshelf next to him and pulled off a very old and worn-out book as he flicked through it. "Is there any record of his trip to the island?" Luffy asked hurriedly. "Officially, no," Cricket admitted, "but he does mention it in here." Nami then gasped, asking if that was Noland's logbook, and Cricket threw it roughly at her, telling her to read there. She looked at it in amazement, and read out things that Noland had claimed to have seen, such as sky fish, and the sky waver that was said to be created in the Sky Island, along with many other strange and fabulous objects. As she read on, everyone's eyes grew wider and wider with every word, like a fascinating story that they wanted to know the ending to. "Do you know what this means?" Nami cried out excitedly. "Sky Island must really exist." Luffy cried out, and seeing that, the Straw Hats all knew that Luffy was now determined to head to the floating island no matter what it took. Cricket was in front of a tree stump that served as a table as Luffy, Usopp, Nami, and Chopper sat down, listening to him talk. "Listen up and listen good," Cricket said. "I decided to tell you guys everything I know about the Sky Island. Most of this is rumor and hearsay, so you'll have to make up your own minds whether you believe it or not. There's something very strange that happens in this part of the ocean." He pointed out to the sea. Everything will suddenly turn dark as night, right in the middle of the brightest day. Luffy held up his hand as if he were in class and exclaimed that happened to them as well. Yeah, Usopp agreed at once. It was like the sun vanished. And then these enormous monsters showed up. You've seen the giants, Cricket said, not sounding the least bit surprised at that. There's a tale on where those things come from, but forget about it for now, we can go into it later. Now about this sudden nightfall, it's caused by the shadow of an incredibly dense cloud. But Nami was lost, telling him that it was too dark for clouds, it was as if the sun went out. He then explained that this cloud is special from every other cloud in that it forms high in the sky, has no internal air currents and never turns to rain. No light can reach the ground and it turns even the brightest day dark. These clouds, called the cumulonimbus cloud, never changed at all, and some people actually believe that these clouds are like fossils. Petrified clouds that drift around for centuries unchanged. Nami doubted all that before Cricket added that this was all rumors that he heard and what she believes is up to her. So it's a mystery cloud, Luffy decided upon. Instead of telling him he was stupid, Cricket agreed with that statement, but also said that there was only one place that Sky Island could be and it's on top of one of those clouds. Luffy and Usopp were both cheering, getting ready to go, but Nami hit them both, screaming at them that they still didn't know how to get there. Yeah, that's gonna be the hard part, Cricket agreed, because you'll be risking your life every minute. You mean like now? The boys whimpered behind him, Chopper looking at their beaten and swollen faces. There's only one way to get there, the knock upstream, Cricket answered for them. It shoots straight up in the air, so theoretically, it can take you into the sky if you're lucky. Luffy was looking thrilled at this idea and said that all they had to do was hitch a ride when it next went off, but Nami countered by asking if they would end up falling back to the ocean and get smashed to pieces. Usually, that's true, Cricket stated, unless you can get the timing just right. It's one thing to sit here all comfy and talk about riding the knock upstream. But if you think this trip is gonna be some kind of pleasure cruise, you're in for a very rude awaken. Luffy had wide eyes as Usopp and Chopper both looked freaked out. Cricket said that he heard many theories about it, but only one has ever made any real sense to him, however no one's ever been stupid enough to confirm it. The knock upstream is apparently created by giant underwater pockets below the ocean floor. Water seeps in, and is heated by geothermal energy until it turns to steam. At some point the pressure becomes too great and explodes, sending a giant stream upwards. The strength of each particular event varies dramatically, but they all last for about a minute each time. 1 full minute, Nami cried out in shock, getting up. Do you realize how enormous an explosion like that would have to be? Cricket turned his back on them as they tried to digest this thought as he finished. Anyway, you can't really explain something like this with words and theories. It's one of the great mysteries of creation. So, Usopp said, summing it all up, so then, we gotta ride this current that shows up 5 times a month into to reach some island in the sky, and just hope it's waiting for us. I'd say that sums it up pretty well, Cricket said. And if you miss, you fall back down, slam into the ocean, and get blown into fish food. Just like you said. Usopp, pale and sweating, turned to Luffy's smiling face. Okay, so we're gonna forget about Sky Island, right? The two laughed, though Usopp a little forced before he said seriously that this was nuts. That they would have to be beyond lucky to be able to pull off a stunt like this. But Luffy's eyes were shining at the thought and said that they will go anyway. Usopp reminded the captain about the Mary's condition, that she'll never be able to withstand something like that in her condition. Cricket agreed, saying that she was worthless, even Brand knew she would never have been able to survive it. Usopp frowned at him for that, as if almost tempted to do it just to prove that the Mary could, but let the insult slide before he thought that it would settle the matter. But then Cricket surprised them by offering to fix and reinforce the ship, which Masira and Shuju happily agreed to from inside the house. Nami then reminded them that they could only stay on this island for 1 more day before the log pose reset and they'd be forced to move on. Usopp beamed at that thought and asked Cricket when he thought that the next time the knock upstream would line up with those clouds, clearly sounding like he believed that they would be long gone by the time that it did line up perfectly. But that didn't last when Cricket stated that it would be at around noon tomorrow. Wait a minute, you mean we can make it? Usopp screamed. Afraid so, Cricket said, back still to him. If you're scared then don't go. Usopp's eyes turned angry and he began to shout, pointing an accusing finger at him. You're lying. Cricket turned to look back at him as he went on yelling, there's something's fishy about this. We've known you less than 24 hours, why are you being so helpful? And what's more? Luffy then stepped up, looking angry as he tried to tell him off, but Usopp snapped at him to shut up before he turned back to Cricket, yelling, this Sky Island, this legendary place, that we don't even know the location of is just gonna show up out of the blue. At noon tomorrow, and to help us get there you're gonna rebuild and reinforce our ship, for nothing. When something looks too good to be true, it probably is. Usopp yelled, the infamous liar Noland was your great-great-grand would ever right. So how do we know we can trust you? Cricket didn't seem fazed at all by this as he pulled out his cigarette and looked at him, Usopp tense up as if expecting a fight. The two monkeys were calling from inside the house that dinner was ready and Sanji came stumbling out and noticed the tense atmosphere. Untroubled, Crick said as he slowly walked to him. Masira said, whenever the midday night happens in this area, the cumulonimbus cloud appears in the southern sky the next day. Based on its usual cycle of 5 appearances a month, I'm guessing the knock upstream will also erupt tomorrow at midday. That will probably also be to the south. I can't be 100% certain, but there's a good chance the two events will coincide. Cricket walked past Usopp, whose anger faded to a look of nervousness and confusion. I'm proud to have met a bunch of brave fools like you, he said warmly, you're true pirates. Meanwhile, shame came over Usopp's face at those words as Cricket finished. Now then, let's go inside and eat. Tonight I want you to call my home your home, my friends. Those words were enough to cause Usopp to fall to his knees and Luffy smiled happily at that. Usopp, feeling down for his behavior, apologized to Cricket. Cricket, however, was a bit disgusted by Usopp as he was rubbing his running nose on Cricket's pants while apologizing on his knees. Soon they back inside Cricket's house, with all the straw hats, Cricket, and the monkeys laughing and enjoying a good party. Masiro was chasing Usopp around for tricking him to eat hot sauce, Cricket was drinking so much that his face was red, and Luffy and Shuju were dancing together. Nami was sitting in the background, reading Nolan's logbook. Cricket noticed it as well, and when he went over to her, he quoted from a passage, "The skull's right eye. That's where I saw the gold." And they all fell silent as they looked to him, waiting for him to speak as if he was giving a speech. Those words, smeared with tears, were the last words Nolan wrote in his logbook, Cricket answered as he stood up. "The skull's right eye, that's where I saw the gold." That very same day, Nolan was executed. I still don't know what he meant by that. It doesn't refer to the name of a city or some landmark that used to be on the island. Or is it just a poetic allusion to his own impending death? The blank pages that follow give us no clue. Cricket sighed, his face still red as he tilted his head back and drank deeply, and that's why we continue to dive to the bottom of the sea, we dream. The straw hats all raised their glasses high to that as they went on to enjoy the party. It was fun to watch, even as Cricket took the logbook and began to read out a particular entry. It was when Nolan first arrived on Jaya. They heard the peculiar cries of a strange bird and the ringing of a grand bell. In our pride and arrogance we thought we've seen and heard everything in our short lives, Cricket recited, obviously knowing this part by heart, but the sound of that bell tolling left us all speechless. It was as if the clang of that bell all struck us dumb with wonder. Cricket let out a loud cry which Luffy and the monkeys echoed happily. "Hey old timer, it sounds like you just might be a little fond of Nolan after all," Usopp teased, and they all laughed. Smiling, Cricket pulled out a few bags from a trunk. He passed one of them to Masira before he sat back down and opened up the one he still had and revealed 3 miniature golden bells. Usopp stated that they didn't seem so impressive to him, sounding a little let down. None of these is the bell that Nolan was writing about in his logbook, Cricket informed him as Nami picked up one and ran her hands over it lovingly. "These are bell-shaped golden ingots we found on the ocean floor during a dive." "Golden ingots," Chopper repeated in surprise as Luffy cried out happily that the city of gold was real. "It's still not proof though," Shuju said sadly as he sat up from where he fell over from drinking too much. "You can find golden relics like that lying around any old ruin in this part of the world." "Maybe so," Robin agreed, "but that does suggest there was some civilization here sometime in the past. Ingots are made to divide gold into standard unit of weight, and that would indicate an advantaged trading society." "Right," Cricket spoke up to what Robin had said, "and you remember that peculiar bird call he said they heard when they arrived?" He looked to Masira and told them to show it to them. He opened the bag and revealed the enormous chunk of gold that was carved into the shape of a strange-looking bird holding a bell. As they all gasped in wonder at it, Cricket told them that was the last of it as Nami swooned over it, reminding them all of how Sanji did the same whenever he saw a cute girl. "Golden bells and birds, huh?" Sanji smiled. "Do you think that these are symbols of some ancient, giant civilization?" Cricket shrugged at Sanji's question, but said that he was sure they had all come from the same casting. He then began to talk about the golden statue being a south bird and that they could still find some on the island today. Masira began to talk more about them, about how sailors had used them on their ships, but before he even finished, he and his brother both stared at each other and Cricket gasped. "Oh no," they yelled out so suddenly that it startled them all. "What's wrong?" they cried out in surprise. "This is really bad," Cricket said, his face no longer holding any trace of the party and was deadly serious. "You guys gotta get to the forest on the south side of the island quick." When Luffy tried to ask what was going on, Cricket pointed to the gold bird and added that they had to go and catch one of the south birds and fast. The crew asked why they needed the bird. "Now listen carefully," Cricket said crossly, "tomorrow you're gonna sail for the Knock upstream. It lies directly south of here. How are you gonna get there?" "We just sailed a ship due south, of course," Luffy said obviously. "Have you forgotten this is the Grand Line?" Cricket yelled at him. "You're heading for open sea. You won't be able to get your bearings." Nami gasped at that, realizing that he was right. That since they were in the Grand Line, the Straw Hats would not know where to go south since normal compasses would not work. Also, since the place that they were headed to was a location in the sea and not an island, the log pose would not help either. Cricket told them that they could still make it if they could capture a south bird and follow its direction. These strange-looking birds have an odd habit of always pointing their head south, no matter where they are. Because of this, they were used in ancient times to navigate. With it, they could get the direction and just follow it. "You see," Cricket finished explaining, "if you don't get going to that forest and catch one of those birds right now, you'll have to kiss your only chance of going to Sky Island goodbye. And you're just telling us this now." They yelled at him, looking panic-stricken as they all jumped up and ran to the door, bursting outside and headed for the trees as Cricket threw them several nets, letting them know that they would get started on the repairs to their ship in the meantime before he reminded them that they had until morning to find one of those birds or to forget about the whole thing. Luffy took several steps forward before he halted mid-stride and you could practically hear the cogs turning in his head. Then, it was like a light bulb went off in his mind. Turning to his still-running crew, the Chimera captain called out, "Hey, hold up guys." The Straw Hats stopped, if somewhat reluctantly, before turning back towards Luffy. "What is it now, Luffy? In case you didn't get it, we're kinda on a time frame here." Nami snapped out, silently swearing she'd kill the kid if it was some sort of stupid question or other pointless distraction her captain wanted to mention. With a quickly forming smile, Luffy declared, "I just realized, we don't need to find a southern bird, cause we already have one." With that, Luffy changed his shape. When he was done, the straw hat-wearing pirate was a large, rather chubby-looking bird with a body of purple and bright green feathers. He had a large toucan-like beak that was an assortment of colors, while his head looked a bit like a fish. Grinning at the gobsmacked looks on both the crew's and the Alliance's face, Southern Bird Luffy let off a cry. Jayu. While the Alliance members continued to gawk, having no previous knowledge on Luffy's powers, some of the other Straw Hats face-palmed. "I don't know what's worse," Zoro muttered with his face still in his hand, "that we missed such an obvious solution to the problem, or that it was Luffy of all people who figured it out first." To be fair, Usopp pointed out while trying to find the silver lining, we just found out about the southern birds, and that we had to find them ASAP made us all act before thinking. Now though, we don't have to go through a creepy-looking forest for a bird. He seemed cheerful about this at first, before his face fell as he realized that now there was nothing holding the crew back from the possible suicide adventure. After explaining Luffy's powers to the Alliance, Cricket coughed into his fist and said, "While that's impressive, do you still possess the southern bird's directional ability? Are you sure you're facing south at all times?" Luffy cocked his avian head for a moment while contemplating Cricket's question. He then turned his head to the right and held it there for a little bit before a look of extreme discomfort came over him and his head snapped back into its previous position. That felt weird. It was like, no matter what position my head was in, it only felt like it was supposed to be facing that direction, Luffy commented as he went back to his human form, giving his neck a crack for good measure. Looks like Luffy's sense of direction is spot on, Robin commented in amusement as the rest of the crew agreed. Then, the senior members of the crew all looked over to Zoro, who looked confused at the stares he was getting. "What?" he asked irritably. "Maybe you should keep Luffy with you at all times. Maybe then you'd know which way south is at the least," Sanji suggested with a barely contained smirk. The rest of the crew snickered at that as a vein pulsed on Zoro's forehead. "Oh screw you guys," he shot out before walking away in a huff. Cricket cleared his throat and said, "Now that that's all settled, you all should probably head in for the night while me and the brothers get to work on your ship. After all, you'll need your wits about you tomorrow to make sure everything goes according to plan. You should probably set up camp a little ways away from here so the sounds of us working on your ship don't disturb you. We'll come to get you at first light." The crew agreed, knowing the former pirate had a point. After saying their goodnights, the Straw Hats went a short distance down the beach and set up some of the tents Nami had brought from Alabasta. One by one, they fell asleep to the sounds of hammers pounding and other sounds of construction echoing down the beach. A few hours later though, they were awakened by the sound of an almighty crash that was followed by cries of pain and, curiously enough, cheering. Going to maximum awareness in a split second, the crew barged out of their tents and ran down the beach towards Cricket's house to find out what was going on, and what they saw enraged them. Parts of the house and the ground around them was torn up. The house itself had 2 giant holes as if someone had shot a cannonball through them, but the 3 were in worse shape. Masiro was lying on his face with a deep bleeding gash down his back, Shuju was floating unconscious in the sea, and Cricket was dripping blood all over as he lay there. Usopp gasped when he saw the Mary, the front half almost broken in half, now lying sadly on the ground and the mast snapped off like a twig. And there, standing over Cricket's form was the same man from earlier that day, Bellamy the hyena. Standing a short ways from him was Big Knife, Sarkis, wiping blood from one of his oversized knives. Standing around them was Bellamy's crew from earlier, cheering and laughing at the display of brutality. No longer thinking about not fighting back, the Straw Hats leapt into action. As the other members of the Straw Hats went to both make sure the brothers and the Mary were okay, Luffy, with a burst of speed that momentarily surprised the enemy pirates, was now looking over Cricket, who had woken up. "Sorry kid," he gasped, when he saw him. "You're alive," Luffy said in surprise, trying to help him, "don't try to move around." The whole time, Cricket was mumbling an apology about letting this happen even as he tried to push himself up. Sarkis suddenly let out a laugh, causing the crew to look at him. "Hey, if it isn't the pathetic rabble from earlier. And look, they even brought along more of their trashy friends. Why'd you come, hoping to steal the gold from this old coot too? Well forget it, we were here first, and if you want it back you'd best be ready to receive worse than you did earlier." It was then they noticed that by some of the gathered pirates the wrapped gold Cricket had shown them earlier lay at their feet, further enraging the Straw Hats as what happened all came together. Bellamy and his crew must have heard of Cricket's gold and decided to come and steal it for themselves. The Alliance had obviously tried to fight back, but had fallen to their assault. And from the look of the damaged area, the fight hadn't been pretty. With a hard look on his face, Luffy called out, "Everyone." The rest of the crew looked at him and he said in a dead serious voice few have heard him use, "Keep the old man and the monkeys safe, I'll take care of these creeps." Zoro looked at him calmly, already knowing what he was going to do and asked, in a tone that clearly said that he already knew the answer to, "You want any help?" "I'll handle this one alone," he said firmly, moving his hat back to hide his eyes. This was answered by the others with mixed expressions. Most of the crew didn't say anything, already knowing what he was doing as well and fully supported his decision on it. Nami was telling him that they only had 3 hours left before they had to set sail. But he didn't answer her, merely turning to face his opponent, who grinned at him cockily. "Bellamy," he shouted, "I'm gonna take you down." "Ha, you're going to take me out? You've gotta be joking," Bellamy called, sounding just as conceited as he did from before. "You've got something to say to me kid." "I do," Luffy yelled back. "Gives back Pop's gold, every bit of it, right now." "What gold?" Bellamy asked, though he clearly knew what he was talking about before he burst out laughing. "You mean the junk we got from Old Man Cricket?" Rather than answer, he hunched over, crouching low before he was able to jump, almost fly, though the air before he was able to spin around and landed gracefully behind Luffy. Bellamy's legs had changed, becoming all twisted around to show he ate a spring-based devil's fruit. "Maybe it's news to you, but that's what pirates do. Ever heard of looting?" Bellamy taunted him. "But what am I saying? You're just a pathetic dreamer who can't open his eyes long enough to get a good look at the real world." Luffy glared at him, speaking in such a way that Bellamy looked taken aback by his tone. "Well, then. If stealing is what we pirates do, I guess I should just steal the gold back then." Bellamy roared with laughter at what Luffy said. "That's cute, but be serious," he yelled. "Can you really fight? I mean, do you even know how to throw a punch? I saw your fighting skills earlier." Bellamy sneered at him when Luffy didn't say anything. "You're very good at just standing there." Luffy's eyes narrowed dangerous as Bellamy mocked him, telling him that standing still wasn't going to get the gold back. "What, you're freezing up like this afternoon? Admit it, you're too scared to fight me." This afternoon was different. I'm not scared, Luffy said neutrally, the moon at his back making him look like some kind of demon of the night. But Bellamy just laughed, saying that was a good bluff, but he was now sick of listening to him, and decided to shut him up for good. The spectators watched as Bellamy's spring-like legs kicked off, destroying the ground right under his feet as he shrieked out with laughter, "Don't worry, this won't take long." And when he landed on one of the trees in the area that cracked under the pressure, he finished his attack, spring sniper. He shot towards Luffy like a torpedo, who didn't look impressed as Bellamy came flying at him. At the last second he jumped off the destroyed roof of Cricket's house, soaring through the sky just as gracefully as Bellamy had, and some of the people on the ground started talking about it, some impressed, others not so much. The Straw Hats, meanwhile, watched in silence as they all knew there was really only one outcome for this match. Luffy landed awkwardly on another tree before he got back up and glared around at Bellamy, who was still undergoing his relentless attack. Once, he almost ended up falling right over the edge to the ground below, and was forced to grab onto a branch to keep himself from dropping. The whole time Bellamy bragged and laughed at Luffy, taunting him at how weak he was and that he was never going to get the gold back. He darted from tree to tree in the clearing, each one cracking like a toothpick when he jumped off, looking like a demented pinball. The fight went on, Bellamy making them all angry as he kept yelling things out like he was pathetic for believing in dreams or that he was a disgrace to real pirates. Finally, Luffy was knocked from the trees and landed on the ground, and Bellamy continued to jump around him, laughing insanely that he couldn't beat him no matter what thanks to his devil fruit. Big Knife, Sarkis laughed, egging his captain on as the other crew members mocked Luffy as well. The Straw Hats, meanwhile, resisted rolling their eyes as they could feel this sham of a fight was ending soon. Luffy stood up from where he fell to the ground, completely unharmed, his expression cold as the rest of Bellamy's crew seemed shocked that he was getting up. But Bellamy's face was smiling at the thought of crushing Luffy as he then launched himself at Cricket's house again. Using the building and the trees in the area, he bounced from one spot to the next, increasing in speed with each successive spring. Luffy just stared ahead of him as Bellamy continued to rant on. "So, you want the gold back, huh?" he yelled, his voice seemed to come from all around them. "Because old man Cricket is your friend. Wake up, he's nothing but a decrepit fool who spends all his time chasing after a 400-year-old lie. But that's probably what you like about him, right?" Bellamy went on as Luffy's eyes turned into slits, filled with anger, and his face darkened even more so that he looked like some kind of beast ready to kill. "You like to call yourselves pirates, but you know nothing. There's no city of gold. No island in the sky. Just oceans and ships and the men who sail them." Meanwhile, Luffy's anger had grown to such a point that they could almost feel it radiating in the air around them. He held his fist up, they could hear the cracking of his knuckles even through the noise that Bellamy was making. "You asked if I know how to throw a punch," he called out even as Sarkis laughed, asking that he hurry up and beat him so that he could go back to town for a drink. Bellamy was finally tired of playing around, screaming out, "So long, Straw Hat." It all happened so quickly that most of them missed it. With a single punch, Luffy slammed Bellamy right into the ground, his head breaking through the wooden walkway, leaving a large crater all around them. Bellamy's eyes rolled into the back of his head, blood spurting from his mouth and the imprint of Luffy's fist embedded into his face. Bellamy was out cold before his head cracked the wood beneath him. Luffy's knuckles were covered in blood. He didn't respond at all, however, as he slowly put his hat back on his head, his eyes still darkened so that they couldn't see anything. He hadn't even needed to use his powers to defeat the man. No one said anything as they heard Bellamy croak a little from where he lay, showing that he was still alive, but the crowd around them were suddenly as silent as the grave. Sarkis stepped forward, stuttering out in a shocked tone, but sure that this had to be some kind of bad joke. "Hey, quit messing around, Bellamy, and get up, the joke's over. We know that runt couldn't beat you. Come on, get up." Most of them looked ready to turn tail and run when Bellamy just continued to lay there. Sarkis seemed to grow angrier with every second that his captain remained on the ground, and soon he was shouting, "This really isn't funny anymore, now snap out of it. You have to get up and show that kid who you are. You're a real pirate, not like him." Sarkis continued to scream out that his bounty was up to 55 million and that he couldn't lose. Luffy turned towards Bellamy's crew and gave them a cold glare. "And now, Cricket's gold. Give it back," he demanded, in a tone that showed that he wasn't kidding around here anymore. Almost everyone turned and ran away, scattering around them into the forest as if hoping that it would protect them from Luffy's wrath. But Luffy no longer had any reason to go after them as he stood there, waiting for an answer. The main part of Bellamy's crew, the ones who had been there that afternoon, were so startled that some of them pointed fearfully to the bag behind them and Luffy marched over. As he went inside, they went over to Bellamy, trying to get him up and on his feet again. Luffy came back, the large sack on his back, smiling as he calmly went towards a stunned Cricket as if he had just done some grocery shopping. He was even chuckling a little to himself as he walked. "That wasn't too hard to find," he said as the remaining Bellamy pirates were with Bellamy, who only continued to lay there helpless. Sarkis was on his knees, shaking as he looked after him. Suddenly he got to his feet and began to yell, "Hey, you come back here. You hear me, you stupid runt, I'm talking to you. I'll get him. We won't be beaten by some pretend pirate. I'll show you a real punch." Sarkis continued to yell after Luffy, "Where are you going?" When Luffy did stop, his words died on his tongue and they froze, looking ready to run back if they had to. Luffy merely held up the bloody fist as he asked, "Where am I going?" Sarkis fell back, looking ready to wet his pants. Luffy didn't threaten him, or say anything else to show that he won. It was as if the fight never happened, but instead, he slowly looked back before he held up his finger to the sky. Up there, now, Luffy's face took on a bestial quality and you could swear that the entire animal kingdom was now glaring at the rapidly sweating pirates. "Get lost," he roared, and in a puff of dust, the enemy crew had fled at near supersonic speeds, taking their out-cold captain with them. He then turned back to the crew in the Alliance, the former who were all warmly congratulating him or asking why he took so long while the later could only stare with their jaws hitting the sand. The next day with the sun already high in the sky, Luffy was there with the rest of the crew and staring at the Mary. Though the ship looked to have proper patches and work done to her, she still looked a bit worse for the wear. But also, she was now looking more like a rooster than a sheep. The Mary was now sporting wings attached to her sides, and a curved tail at the back, as well as even sporting a wattle and a comb. Luffy however was looking at it with glowing eyes as Usopp walked proudly over to it. Introducing the Going Merry, Flying Edition. He cried out. It can fly, he cried out. Usopp pointed happily to the Saruyama Alliance and told him that they built it just for them, and Nami was whispering that she had a bad feeling about it. Zoro seemed to be thinking along the same thing as he agreed, stating that chickens couldn't fly and that a pigeon would have been a better choice. What's that got to do with anything? You dope, Nami snapped at him. It's time to set sail. Usopp cried out. Come on, if you're with me let me hear it. They all cheered and were all quickly getting on their ships and raising anchor, with Luffy being last on board, giving a final look to the Alliance. Though heavily bandaged and bruised, the Alliance looked 100 times better than they had last night. Cricket didn't say anything, didn't say thank you or asked if he was alright, he didn't even acknowledge what he did after the fight last night. But Luffy didn't seem to have been looking for a thank you. After breathing out the smoke from his cigarette, Cricket said, well, what are you waiting for? Get on board, unless you wanna miss your chance at the sky. Like a fool. Luffy just smiled. That was probably the closest he was going to get to a thank you from the old man. Thanks for the ship, he said gratefully. Cricket just put out his cigarette and jerked his thumb at the Saruyama Alliance, telling him that he should be thanking them for doing all the work. Luffy did just that, and even gave them a Hercules beetle he found last night when going back to the camp as a way to say thanks. Shuju looked thrilled at the gift and ordered his crew to get a cage for their new pet. Shuju and Masira were both calling out that they would lead the way to where the knock upstream was going to erupt. And as they followed Luffy, they heard Cricket's voice calling out behind them, calling to the Saruyama crews. When they all glanced back at him, he was standing tall as he gave them his orders. I'm counting on you men, he called. I don't care what happens. You give our friends everything you've got. They all cheered on in agreement, soon pushing off from the shore and giving Cricket their goodbyes. With both ships on either side of the Merry Light Guards, taking them out to sea, Cricket appeared at the shoreline, calling to the Straw Hats, well, kid, looks like this is where we part ways. Luffy looked over the tail end as he went on, there's only one thing you gotta remember, above everything else. Not one person, in history, has ever disproved the existence of Sky Island. Cricket declared with a smile and they all nodded in understanding. People may say I'm crazy and even laugh at me, but I don't care. Cricket declared to them all, I'm a romantic. Like you. As they drew further away from shore, they heard Cricket's voice calling out, oh yeah, thanks for the gold. And hey, don't be falling from the sky you hear. As they left Jaya behind them, Luffy returned to his southern bird form and the ships followed the direction his head was pointing. Soon they could see dark clouds in the distance and Nami was calling for everyone to come out at once. Nami screamed to the others. The cumuloregulus cloud appeared a lot sooner than expected and now everyone's scrambling to find a current. Shuju let out another loud wailing with his voice to use for sonar and after a few minutes, the divers came up, finding the place where the whirlpool was sure to form. Masira then called that they were to head right for that spot. The waves around them were growing higher and more violent as they struggled to get through. Robin called to Nami as to where the log pose was pointing. Nami did a quick check and answered, it's pointing right at those clouds. She was staring above them at it as Usopp gasped, the Sky Island is right above that. Just then, Masira's ship threw a few hooks behind them and hooked onto the Mary as they began towing it. What's this? Luffy asked while trying to turn his head to get a better look, only for Usopp to bonk him on the head saying he was their compass and compasses don't look around for the fun of it. We'll lead you to the inner edge. He answered as Nami asked what they were supposed to do once they got there. Position yourself on the flow and head to the center. Then you'll be fine. But that was when they spotted the whirlpool, and several of the crew screamed at that. To say it was huge would be the usual understatement. It looked like a large, dark drain, one large enough to have easily swallowed a fleet of marine ships. He wants us to go to the center. Nami screamed as they headed straight for it, the ship sticking just on the outer rim, just far enough away to avoid the current and getting sucked into the dark pit. But I don't want to get sucked in. Usopp screamed in fear, all of them clinging to the ship as the ropes connecting them to Masira's ship let go and they were set adrift. I don't remember signing up for all this. Nami screamed out, looking like she was about to have a heart attack. Sanji proclaimed that he'll make sure nothing happened to her. The Straw Hats were all staring at the whirlpool, and even Robin sounded uneasy as she commented on how she had never seen a whirlpool as big as this one before. Chopper however had his face shining with excitement at the thought of flying while Usopp screamed, tears falling from his eyes, that he changed his mind and wanted to go back. Sorry, Usopp, too late for that, Zoro told him in his usual bored tones as he jerked his thumb to Luffy, who was already looking like he was about to fall over from happiness. You know who is already excited. Luffy screamed out that they were going to the sky. But just then, something burst out through the water in front of them. It was a sea king, a large and bright yellow one that looked like a giant, fat salamander. It apparently got too close to the whirlpool's edge and was now being pulled in, down into the darkness until it disappeared. The Straw Hats all froze at that, staring at it with a mixture of expressions from calm all the way to freaking out. The Mary was now drifting on the current, slowly being pulled to the center. It's time for us to go. Masira called to them. The rest is up to you now. Good luck. Bye guys, Luffy called, as he transformed back waving happily, and thanks a lot for everything. But not everyone agreed with that. 3 members broke down completely and began to scream at them. Usopp especially freaked out. Don't go, I don't wanna die. Please take me with you. Give me a break, I'm scared. Oh, please don't make me, and he ended by breaking down with Chopper wailing by his side. Nami was just as freaked out as she finished for Usopp. No one said anything about diving head first into a giant whirlpool. Plus it's getting dark, Usopp said tearfully. Oh, cry as a river, Zoro yawned out. Just hang on and hope for the best. Well, excuse us for being scared. The weakling trio screamed at him as Chopper screamed that they were being sucked in. Don't be so unreasonable, Luffy. Let's go back while we still have time. Usopp hollered at him, now looking close to passing out. Don't you understand that this Sky Island stuff is just a bunch of make-believe? It's not worth getting us killed. It's all make-believe. Is that what you think? Luffy asked him, his voice almost annoyed, and he didn't bother looking at him. But Nami was on Usopp's side, also crying and looked ready to start begging if she had to as she cried out, Usopp's right. I think this is a really bad idea. It may be a stupid dream, but I have to try, Luffy said, still staring ahead before he looked back at them all with his eyes glowing with excitement. It could be our greatest adventure. Chopper seemed to have been put at ease at his words, but Usopp and Nami were both still crying as they realized that it was too late. Meanwhile, the Mary was continuing to get pulled closer to the center, something that Zoro seemed to have noticed as well. Instead of wasting your time bickering, you all may want to take a look, he said, not even looking at Usopp, who was asking what he was talking about. Zoro merely pointed and told them that they were now being sucked in. That was all it took for them all to start screaming as the Mary suddenly took off and fell towards the darkness below them. It seemed to fly for just a moment above the hole and began to fall. Straw Hats screamed out in shock just as the Mary fell, but as quickly as the whirlpool appeared, it was gone. For the moment, where the whirlpool had been, it was now calm and smooth as glass. They were directly underneath the cumuloregulus cloud, waiting. Nami gasped as she cried out that it was starting. When they looked to her, she cried out in fear that the whirlpool had sunk beneath the surface. Hold it right there. All the Straw Hats turned to look behind them at once to see what could be described more as a giant raft than an actual ship, coming towards them. It looked as if someone had just stuck several large tree trunks together with some rope. The only signs of it being a pirate ship was the black sail which bore 3 sinister-looking skulls on it. On the crudely made ship was the man from yesterday and there were others with him. The old man and his horse with the exploding apples, the large man who wanted to be the fighting champion from earlier, and another man who they hadn't seen before. A rather tall and thin guy with a very sad, calm expression. He wore glasses, but one of the lenses looked to be some kind of crosshair. Over his shoulder, he was carrying a large rifle, and he seemed to be sighing forlornly, as if thinking of something sad. The man, who seemed to be the group's captain, was laughing, looking at Luffy with a great deal more interest than he had when they first met him. Well, if it isn't Straw Hat Luffy. Nami recognized him at once, telling the others that it was that Mock Town guy from before. As Sanji asked what she was talking about, the man declared that he had come all this way to collect Luffy's 100 million bounty. 100 million, Luffy shouted back in confusion. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me, kid, he called as he held up 2 bounty posters. Luffy's bounty had gone up more than 3 times, now up to the 100 million that he had said. He also held up another poster that showed Zoro with his starting bounty of 60 million. It's true, Usopp called, looking at the posters through binoculars at them. He's got a different poster for each of you. Hey, Zoro, congratulations on your new bounty. Sanji went running over to Usopp and asked if he could see one for him as well, which Usopp denied, causing an aura of despair to cover the cook. Luffy and Zoro, however, were celebrating the news of their bounties. This is great, Luffy yelled out, practically jumping for joy. Hear that? My bounty went up big time. 60 million's not too bad either. Zoro laughed proudly. It's not a good thing. Nami snapped at them. It was here that they all finally noticed that the water around them was slowly bubbling and rising up. The Mary was sitting right on top as the water was continuing to go up like how a cake would start to rise. Usopp screamed out, oh no. The ship, it's being lifted up. Everything seemed to freeze in time for just a brief moment, and then, with an almighty explosion beneath them, with the force of an exploding volcano, they were sent flying as a great canal of water suddenly rose up into the air. It was a giant pillar of water that shook them all, almost shattering the ship on impact as they were sent flying up, sailing right up its side. They were now standing on the wall of the cabin as the Straw Hats hung on for dear life as they were shot up. Chopper was crying as he hung to the mast. Luffy was ecstatic as he hung onto the Mary's new comb, screaming out to make his voice heard over the noise, all right. I can't believe this is actually happening. Let's go to Skypia. Sanji pointed it out. The hull was starting to float. In other words, it was slowly tipping back away from the stream of water. And unless they did something about it, they were going to fall back to the ocean below them. Well, what do you expect us to do about it? Usopp screamed, hanging on to the railing like a flag flapping in the wind. We're having a hard enough time holding on as it is. Or haven't you noticed? Bits of old ships and even the Sea King from before fell from the sky and passed them all, the crew yelling in shock at what they were seeing. See, Sanji screamed as they watched the monster fall to the ocean below them. It's only a matter of time until the same thing happens to the Mary. I know, but what can we do? Zoro called. He and Robin were standing quite calmly on the wall of the cabin with them. We don't have a lot of options when it comes to Mother Nature. We're at her mercy. Usopp lost it completely and began to yell, we're gonna take a nosedive to the bottom of the ocean all because Luffy had to follow some stupid dream. But Nami seemed to pull herself together, suddenly yelling at them to spread the sail. When they looked to her, she called what they had to do. Though a pillar of water, it was still part of the sea, and they could ride it. Since the wind from below was created from geothermal heat, though packaged differently, it was still wind and water. Everyone suddenly broke into smiles, knowing that their navigator had never led them astray before when it came to where to go. All right, gang, Nami's leading the way, Sanji called, and they were able to spread the sail, and thanks to Nami's orders, they were able to align the ship with its current. The hull continued to rise higher and higher, and finally, the back end lifted up. That was when something miraculous happened. They were flying. We're flying, Luffy screamed joyfully, punching the air. Yeah, we're heading to the sky. We made it, Usopp croaked out, his eyes almost bulging out of his head. Everyone was cheering. They had actually conquered the knock upstream and the terror around them had turned into excitement. Everyone was laughing and enjoying the ride, as if they had left behind all their fear. If this keeps up we can sail as high as we want. Nami called over the noise. Hey Nami, are we almost to Skypia? Luffy yelled back, and they shared a grin as she pointed up to the black clouds above them. If it exists, it's past those clouds. She called as Luffy turned his full attention back above them. Past those clouds, he repeated in joy. I can't wait to find out what's up in the sky. Let's punch through them and find out.